Imagine biting into a piece of bread, the food that for centuries was considered the very foundation of survival, only to realize that what promised life might also deliver death. Picture a medieval peasant, thin and tired from endless days of labor, clutching a hunk of bread as if it were a blessing. On the surface, it looked simple enough. A golden crust, a smell faintly sweet from grain, the comfort of something warm in the hand. But hidden in its core could be something sinister. That loaf might not be bread at all in the sense we imagine it today. Often it was stretched with sawdust, shredded bark, or even ground up straw, anything that could bulk up the flour and make it look like more than it really was. In other words, medieval bread was often half food, half trickery, and the poor man eating it might never know until his stomach began to betray him. Sawdust in bread sounds absurd now, like a cruel joke, but to a desperate baker facing famine it was simple economics. Grain was expensive and rare, demand was constant, and hungry mouths did not care what exactly filled their bellies as long as they felt heavy afterward. If you were a baker who wanted to stay in business, you might cut your flour with something that looked close enough when baked. And who would notice? After all, the texture of medieval bread was already rough and dense, nothing like the airy loaves we know today. Imagine chewing something that tasted more like a lump of mud than food, with splinters scratching your gums and still thanking God for it, because the alternative was to starve. That was reality. If this story touched you, don't let it fade away. Subscribe now and be part of our journey through history's forgotten truths. But this wasn't just a matter of uncomfortable chewing. Wood is not meant to be digested. It irritated the stomach, it blocked intestines, and slowly it weakened the body. People often spoke of stomach cramps as if they were a daily ritual. Imagine entire villages bent over with the same pain and shrugging it off as if it were normal. In a way, bread was both the great equalizer and the great betrayer. Everyone ate it, but only the wealthy ate it without fear. If that sounds horrifying, think about how quickly trust breaks when you realize your food is working against you. In a society where bread was not just food, but a symbol of life itself, every loaf represented hope, sustenance, even faith. To find serrated splinters in it was more than physical pain. It was betrayal. Bread was sacred. It was mentioned in prayers, offered at altars, and broken at tables as a gesture of unity. Yet, in the kitchens of struggling bakers, it became corrupted, stuffed with worthless fillers that mocked the very idea of nourishment. The tragedy was not just that people ate poison, but that they didn't have another choice. And here is where the story becomes almost ironic. We live in an age of food regulations, health inspections, and nutritional labels. We laugh about expiration dates when milk smells fine a day after the printed date, or roll our eyes at people obsessing over organic flour. But imagine explaining those rules to a medieval villager who had just finished chewing a loaf bulked with tree bark. He might laugh too, but not because he thought it was silly. He would laugh at the absurd luxury of having enough food to throw away for being slightly past date. In his world, a man might eat bread that had been baked weeks earlier, rock hard, mold carefully scraped off, and still call it dinner. Our world of abundance would sound like a fairy tale. The real cruelty was how silent the damage could be. You didn't fall dead after one slice. The bread carried its punishment slowly, meal by meal, tightening its grip inside your body. It was a slow erosion of health, and in a time when medicine was crude and superstition rampant, nobody thought to blame the bread. Illness was blamed on the air, on demons, or on God's punishment. Bread was untouchable in people's minds, so even when it was the very culprit, it remained on the table, eaten with gratitude and fear in equal measure. There's also a dark comedy in imagining the marketplace where this bread was sold. Picture a baker with a guilty conscience, dusting the top of his loaves with flour to cover the gray streaks of sawdust within. He knows what he has done. The customers might complain that his bread feels heavier, but isn't that a good thing? More weight for the same coin. And if someone dared to protest, the baker could shrug and say the flour was coarse this year, or the oven too smoky. Nobody had the tools to prove otherwise. Fraud baked itself right into the daily bread, and people swallowed it along with their doubts. It makes you wonder how much of human history is built not just on survival, but on a quiet tolerance for suffering. People didn't riot over splinters in their teeth or cramps in their stomachs. They carried on because bread, no matter how corrupted, was still bread. And in that silence lay a truth more haunting than any famine. Survival doesn't always mean living well. It often just means not dying today. The bread was cruel, but so was hunger, and people chose the lesser evil in hopes of seeing another dawn. And if you think this was the worst of it, remember this was only the beginning. Bread's betrayals ran deeper than splinters of wood. Behind every crust hid other dangers waiting quietly, unseen, ready to remind its eaters that even the simplest food could turn into a killer. The loaf in your hand could offer comfort, but it could just as easily carry something far more insidious, something you couldn't scrape away or spit out, something that struck long after the crumbs were gone. It is almost amusing how bread, the very symbol of simplicity and purity, could turn into a stage for hidden corruption. On the surface, a loaf looked harmless enough, a rustic crust, a comforting smell of baked grain, the warmth of something just out of the oven. Yet inside, invisible to the eye, lived another danger, mold woven into the very structure of the bread. And this was not the fluffy green or blue mold you scrape off your fridge leftovers with a grimace. This was silent, colorless at first, almost undetectable, threading its way through the dough long before anyone took their first bite. By the time it revealed itself, it had already done its damage. Imagine being a peasant in a damp medieval village, storing what little flour you could afford in a sack tucked into the corner of a hut. The roof leaks, the air is humid, the rats have been nibbling at the edges. And by the time you mix that flour into dough, spores are already part of the mixture. Baking did not kill everything, because medieval ovens could be uneven, their heat unpredictable. So the loaf you carried home, steaming hot and shared proudly with your family, might have been a silent carrier of poison. One slice fed your hunger, but also seeded your body with illness. What makes this tragic is how normal it all was. People were used to stomach pains, to fever, to vomiting after meals. Bread was never blamed because it was too sacred to suspect. Bread was life, and life could be cruel, so the suffering was accepted as fate. And yet mold was everywhere. It spread quickly, fed on moisture, and clung to the porous surfaces of wood and cloth. In many cases, entire harvests of grain were spoiled before they could even be milled. But in times of famine, nobody dared to throw it away. Waste was unthinkable. Better to risk sickness than to face certain starvation. Every crumb of the past hides a lesson for today. Subscribe and make sure you never miss the stories that still shape our lives. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Hunger forces people to gamble with death. A loaf with faint discoloration, a strange smell, or bitter taste was not discarded. It was eaten with hesitation, followed by prayers. If you have ever looked at a loaf in your kitchen and debated whether the tiny spot of mold meant the whole thing was ruined, then you already understand the dilemma. Now imagine that decision carrying the weight of your family's survival. Cut off the mold, hope for the best, and eat what's left. That was daily life. There's also something almost comical, in a dark way, about how stubborn people were when it came to their bread. You can picture a medieval mother insisting that scraping the green fuzz off the crust meant the rest of the loaf was perfectly fine. You can see a child wrinkling his nose, saying it tastes funny, only to be scolded for being ungrateful. Bread wasn't just food. It was a lesson in humility, obedience, and resilience. The bread could make you sick, but refusing to eat it could get you labeled as spoiled or lazy. The irony is painful. The food that kept you alive could also be the reason you didn't see another season. Science tells us now that mold doesn't just stop where it becomes visible. Invisible roots penetrate deep into the bread, carrying toxins that can damage the liver, poison the blood, and slowly erode the body's defenses. Medieval villagers had no microscope to prove it, but they must have sensed it. Tales of curses, evil spirits, and punishment often followed mysterious illnesses. But beneath the superstition lay very real mycotoxins, nature's cruel joke hidden in every crumb. And still, bread remained untouchable. Priests blessed it, kings demanded it, and peasants prayed over it. To question the bread was to question survival itself. The real cruelty was not only that mold could sicken people, but that it attacked slowly, making it impossible to connect cause and effect. A person could suffer weeks of weakness, headaches, trembling hands, and still return to the same loaf for comfort. Hunger blinded them to the truth, and mold thrived on that blindness. One can't help but reflect on how much has changed and how much has not. Today, supermarkets throw away mountains of bread at the slightest sign of spoilage. Entire shelves are discarded nightly, food that would have been a treasure in the Middle Ages. Some of us complain when our bread isn't perfectly soft, or when it develops a tiny speck of mold before the printed expiration date. Meanwhile, our ancestors gnawed on bread so toxic it could cause hallucinations and death. The gap between our standards and theirs is so wide it borders on absurdity. But perhaps the most disturbing thought is how quickly mold could turn the bread of life into the bread of suffering without anyone noticing. A family could break bread together, share laughs, and fall sick days later, never realizing the connection. Bread unified people at the table, but it also united them in illness and frailty and in resignation to a fate they couldn't control. It is the quiet betrayal of something trusted, and maybe that is why the story still unsettles us today. And this betrayal was not always confined to mold alone. If spores could hide in the dough, so too could other intruders. Grain was rarely clean, and when the millstones ground it, they carried with them everything that clung to the harvest: husks, dirt, even the tiny creatures that nested there. It was not just mold that slipped into the loaf unnoticed, but something far more unsettling, waiting quietly to be chewed with the bread itself. There is a strange kind of poetry in the idea that bread, the most ordinary of foods, could also be the most contaminated. But if mold was a hidden killer, then insects were its noisy little accomplices, though no one wanted to admit it. Every sack of grain in the Middle Ages was a miniature ecosystem. It held not just wheat or rye, but the living things that found those grains as delicious as humans did. Beetles, weevils, mites, tiny invaders burrowed into kernels and laid their eggs there, ensuring that by the time a miller ground the harvest into flour, The insects were ground right along with it. You could say people were eating protein long before it became a fashionable health trend. The difference is that no one chose this diet. Imagine standing in a medieval mill. The air is thick with dust, your lungs already scratchy from breathing in fine particles. You watch the grindstones turn, creaking and rumbling, and you notice the specks tumbling from the hopper are not just grain. There are small wriggling bodies, legs curling in the heat, shells breaking apart. The stones crush them without hesitation, mixing their remains into the flour. To the miller, this is nothing unusual. To the baker, nothing worth worrying about. And to the hungry peasant, certainly nothing worth refusing. Bread was bread, no matter what crawled inside it first. What makes this fascinating, in a grim way, is how normalized it became. People didn't expect food to be pure. Purity was a concept reserved for saints, not for supper. The reality was that nature was everywhere, uninvited, unstoppable, crawling into storage sacks, chewing through wooden barrels, nesting in the shadows of barns. If you wanted grain untouched by insects, you would have needed constant vigilance in perfectly sealed containers, neither of which existed for the average villager. So when flour smelled faintly musty or tasted oddly bitter, no one thought twice. They ate it anyway. And here's where history throws us a dark punchline. The very insects people ignored were sometimes safer than the grain itself. Some insects ate mold, slowing its spread, meaning their accidental presence may have prevented even worse contamination. In a strange twist of irony, those crunchy little bodies may have been the lesser of two evils. But don't let that soften the picture too much. Flour laced with insect eggs and body parts was still a slow-moving health disaster, capable of causing infections, stomach upsets, and the unshakable sense that food itself had turned against you. If you've ever opened a bag of flour in your kitchen and found a writhing family of weevils, you've had a faint taste of this medieval experience. Now imagine that, instead of throwing it away, you shrug, sift it once, and go on baking because there's no other option. That was survival. The idea of discarding food was laughable when winters were long, harvests were uncertain, and starvation was always one bad season away. The stomach did not care if the bread was seasoned with a little extra crunch. There's also an unsettling intimacy in thinking about how often people must have knowingly chewed through insects. You can almost picture the family meal, a child complaining about something hard in the bread, a parent brushing it off with a line like, "That's just the way bread is this year." Complaints gave way to acceptance to habit, and habit to silence. Over time, the crunch of insects became part of the texture of survival itself. And when you think about it, isn't that what humans have always done? Convince themselves that the intolerable is actually tolerable if it means making it through another day? From a modern perspective, it sounds horrifying, but perhaps it also reveals how distant we are from the fragility of life. We turn up our noses at a salad with a speck of dirt, or discard an entire loaf because of a tiny green patch. Yet for most of history, people swallowed far worse without flinching. Their priorities were simple. Will this fill my stomach? Will it give me strength to work? Will it keep me alive until tomorrow? If the answer was yes, then insects were not pests, but silent companions in the ritual of eating. Join our community, subscribe now, and keep these powerful voices alive with us. But sometimes, those companions carried their own hidden dangers. Insects could introduce bacteria into the flour, spreading illness beyond the stomach aches people thought were just part of life. There were outbreaks of disease that left whole villages sick, their origins mysterious, their causes misattributed to curses or sins. In reality, it might have been no more than a sack of grain stored too long in a damp barn, its contents already moving before anyone lit the oven. And it wasn't just about what went into the bread, but also where it was baked. Insects didn't vanish after the mill. They thrived in bakeries too, clinging to walls blackened with soot, scurrying across wooden tables, drawn by the warmth of the ovens. They were everywhere, constant companions in a world where hygiene was not a word, let alone a practice. To bake bread in such conditions was to embrace contamination as part of the process. And so each loaf carried not just the story of grain and hands, but also the quiet legacy of wings and shells and tiny hidden lives. The tragedy, and perhaps the comedy, is that none of this stopped people from calling bread the staff of life. They prayed for it, they blessed it, they thanked God for it, even as it carried with it pieces of the earth they never intended to eat. But the betrayals of bread did not end with insects. For even after grinding, kneading, and baking, there were still dangers waiting at the oven itself. The very place meant to cleanse and purify could instead add another layer of poison, turning bread into a smoky accomplice of death. A medieval oven was not the polished, stainless steel box humming quietly in your kitchen. It was a crude cavern of stone and soot, a gaping mouth that belched more smoke than heat. Imagine stepping into a village bakery. The walls are blackened from years of fire, the air hangs thick with the smell of burning wood, and a haze of gray smoke makes your eyes water before you even taste the bread. For the baker, this was simply part of the job. For the people who ate that bread, it meant swallowing not only wheat and water, but also ash, soot, and the countless toxins released by incomplete combustion. The ovens themselves were rarely cleaned. After all, who had the time to scrape centuries of black resin from the stones when survival demanded speed? Ash piled in the corners, grease from past bakes dripped down, and half-burned logs smoldered in the cracks. Each new fire reignited the old soot, releasing acrid fumes that clung to the dough as it baked. The result was bread with a bitter tang, smoky in a way no artisan recipe today would ever advertise. The crust often carried a dusting of ash, and the interior absorbed the flavor of the oven's filth. People chewed it anyway, calling it food because there was no other option. But smoke is not just a flavor, it is a poison. Modern science tells us that inhaling wood smoke over years can scar the lungs, damage the heart, and shorten life. Medieval bakers lived in that smoke daily, breathing it deep, their lungs coated with particles of carbon and tar. Customers ate it in smaller doses, but dose after dose accumulates. Imagine a family eating smoky bread every day for months, then years. No one connected their wheezing lungs, chronic coughs, or chest pains with the bread. Illness was God's will, not soot's consequence, and yet, quietly, the oven shaped their health as much as their hunger. There's a kind of grim humor in how little control they had over this process. Today, we debate over gas versus electric ovens, convection settings, and artisanal wood-fired crusts. In the Middle Ages, the question was not which oven, but whether the oven was still standing after the last fire. These were communal structures, sometimes shared by entire villages, and everyone's bread was kissed by the same smoke. If you didn't like the taste, too bad. Complaining about it would only mark you as ungrateful. Smoke was part of the recipe, whether you wanted it or not. The unpredictability of these ovens added to the danger. Without thermometers, bakers judged heat by instinct, tossing a bit of flour onto the stone to see how fast it burned. Too hot, and the bread charred into blackened crust, filling the air with even more soot. Too cold, and the bread remained raw in the middle, a dense, damp sponge that invited mold to grow within days. Either way, the bread carried risk. In a strange sense, the oven was not a purifier, but a gambler's dice, deciding whether your loaf would sustain you or slowly harm you. And yet, the oven was also the heart of the community. Villagers gathered there not just for food, but for warmth, gossip, and ritual. The smoke that choked them also drew them together. Perhaps that is why people tolerated it. They associated the scent of smoke with comfort, familiarity, even survival. Bread pulled from the oven was more than calories. It was proof that the community endured. The irony is cruel. What united them also weakened them, one smoky bite at a time. The consequences of smoky ovens extended beyond health. The constant haze darkened walls, blackened ceilings, and coated food storage areas, ensuring contamination spread everywhere. Think of children growing up in homes where bread tasted faintly of ash, where lungs learned to accept smoke as part of breathing. This was not an occasional indulgence in smoked flavor. This was life itself, infused with toxins. And all the while, the symbolism of bread as sacred persisted. They prayed for their daily bread, even as that bread delivered daily harm. What makes this even more unsettling is that the danger did not stop at soot. The ovens themselves could crumble. Stones flaking into the dough, bits of clay or grit embedding in the crust. Bread carried not just the residue of fire, but also the very walls of the oven. Every meal became a silent lesson in endurance. Chew through the grit, swallow the smoke, and keep going. Complaints did not feed you. Bread did, no matter what it carried inside. Reflecting on this, it is hard not to smirk at our own food anxieties. We panic over burnt edges on toast, convinced they might cause cancer. We return loaves at the store because they are not perfectly risen or have a slightly uneven crust. Medieval villagers would laugh at our fragility. To them, bread with ash was normal, even desirable if it meant warmth in the belly. And yet, deep down, the human desire for purity never died. People still longed for bread that was soft, white, and clean. The wealthy, with access to finer ovens and better-built bakeries, enjoyed that luxury. The poor, choking on smoke, were left with the reminder that even bread, the great equalizer, was divided by class. The story of the oven is not just about dirt and smoke. It is about how necessity bends human tolerance. People learn to accept poison as part of life, to chew bitterness without question, to swallow not just bread but compromise. That acceptance is perhaps the most haunting part, the knowledge that people will endure nearly anything if hunger leaves them no other choice. But ovens and soot were not the only threats. For beyond the choking air and gritty crusts, another danger awaited at the table, the danger of time itself, when bread grew hard, stale, and cruel, yet still found its way into mouths that could not afford to refuse it. There is something quietly tragic in the sound of a crust so hard it echoes when dropped on a wooden table. In the medieval world, that sound was common. Bread rarely stayed soft for long. Without preservatives, airtight bags, or modern techniques, yesterday's loaf quickly became today's rock. Yet in homes across villages, stale bread remained the central meal. People gnawed on it, soaked it in thin broth, or ground it into crumbs to make porridge. Anything was better than wasting a single crumb, because hunger was always near. Bread was too precious to throw away, no matter how unyielding or tasteless it became. Imagine a child at supper. his small hands struggling to break apart a loaf baked a week ago. His teeth ache as he bites, and he looks at his mother for sympathy. She smiles weakly, softens the bread in warm water, and tells him this is how families survive. There is love in the gesture, but also resignation. The child learns early that food is not about pleasure, but about endurance. The table becomes a place of compromise, where bread no longer tastes like comfort, but like survival itself. Old bread carried risks beyond sore jaws. Stale loaves often absorbed moisture from damp medieval houses, making them fertile ground for mold and bacteria. What looked like a hard, clean crust could be hiding spores inside. People tried to scrape away the worst, cutting off fuzzy patches, convincing themselves the rest was safe. But invisible toxins still remained sinking silently into bodies already weakened by poor nutrition. Each bite carried a gamble. Would it nourish or would it harm? But the gamble was not optional. To refuse stale bread was to embrace starvation. There is a certain dark humor in how resourceful people became. Some recipes were born not out of creativity, but out of desperation. Bread soaked in ale, bread softened in cabbage water, bread boiled until it became something between soup and glue. In many kitchens, stale bread was less an ingredient and more a problem to be solved daily. Even dogs and pigs ate their share of rock-hard crusts, though in truth, humans competed with animals for every bite. Nothing went to waste. In fact, waste itself was considered almost sinful, as though throwing bread away was an insult to God. We often romanticize medieval feasts with their roasted meats and flowing wine, but those were rare spectacles for the wealthy. For the vast majority, meals were built around bread in various states of decay. Sometimes a loaf lasted 2 weeks, growing steadily harder until it could only be eaten when hammered into crumbs and mixed into stews. There are accounts of peasants using axes to split hardened bread, a detail both comical and horrifying. Bread was so central to life that people treated it with reverence, yet so degraded that it sometimes seemed closer to stone than sustenance. The psychological toll of this cannot be ignored. To eat daily and never feel joy, only obligation, changes how one views the world. Imagine waking every morning and knowing your meal would be the same hard, tasteless loaf. Hope itself seemed stale. Bread, which in scripture and ritual symbolized life and divine grace, became instead a reminder of limits. It told peasants, you may live another day, but you will never escape hunger. The bread kept you alive, but it also chained you to a cycle of survival without relief. Ironically, stale bread was not just endured, it was weaponized. Authorities sometimes rationed old bread to control the poor, distributing hard loaves as alms, a gesture of charity that carried little nourishment. In prisons, stale bread became punishment, paired with water to humiliate as much as to sustain. Bread's dual role as sacred and degrading mirrored the contradictions of medieval life itself. Survival mixed with suffering, faith laced with bitterness. And yet, people found ways to endure. They learned to dip bread into whatever liquid they had, to chew slowly until it softened, to trick their bodies into believing they were satisfied. These small acts of resilience kept families alive. But one must wonder at the cost. How many illnesses began with mold hidden in stale bread? How many teeth cracked under its hardness? How many nights ended with stomachs bloated not from feasts, but from bread that should have been discarded? The uncomfortable truth is that people built their strength on a foundation of weakness. They lived long enough to work, to fight, to serve, but rarely long enough to thrive. Bread gave them energy, but it also slowly eroded their health. It was a cruel compromise written into every meal. And perhaps this is why bread carried such symbolic weight in religion and culture. To break bread was to accept suffering alongside sustenance, to recognize that life itself is a blend of nourishment and decay. But the betrayals of bread did not stop with age or mold or hardness. Even when it was fresh, even when it looked pure, it could still carry a hidden curse. Some loaves held not just sustenance and not just insects, but poisons that worked like slow daggers inside the body, illnesses that lingered long after the meal. Bread, the daily companion, could transform into an executioner whose blow was felt not in an instant, but in the slow decline of the flesh. Illness in the Middle Ages was rarely swift. It crept in slowly, disguised as fatigue, aches, or the vague unease people simply accepted as part of living. Bread, the most trusted of foods, was often the culprit. After each meal came stomach cramps, dizziness, or a restless night of feverish dreams. Villagers rarely questioned it. Everyone felt sick at some point, and so they believed it was the air or the water, or perhaps a punishment from God. Few dared to consider that the bread itself, the thing prayed over and blessed, might be quietly betraying them. What made this betrayal so insidious was its subtlety. One slice of bread never killed you. Instead, it chipped away at your health day after day. Mold spores carried toxins into the liver, insects and filth carried bacteria into the gut. Smoke and soot from the oven inflamed the lungs, and the stale hardness of the loaves damaged teeth, leaving mouths vulnerable to infection. Every bite left a small scar, invisible in the moment, but devastating in the long run. People wasted away without ever realizing they were being poisoned not by malice, but by their daily meal. Imagine a farmer rising at dawn, muscles stiff, his head throbbing. He blames the long hours in the field, the cold wind, the sleepless night. But the real reason sits in his stomach. Yesterday's bread, laced with invisible poisons. His wife feels the same, her hands trembling as she kneads another loaf with the very same flour that weakened them both. Their children cry with bellyaches, and the parents pray. It never occurs to them that their prayer is directed toward the very source of their suffering. Bread was sacred, bread was life. To suspect it was unthinkable. And yet, history gives us glimpses of the truth. There were strange outbreaks where whole villages suffered fits of madness, convulsions, or gangrenous limbs. Chroniclers wrote of curses, demons, or divine wrath, but modern science points to ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Eaten in bread, it could cause hallucinations so vivid that people thought they saw angels or devils walking among them. In other cases, it constricted blood vessels, blackening fingers and toes until they fell away. This became known as the fire of St. Anthony. To those who lived through it, the suffering felt like judgment from heaven. To us, it looks like food poisoning on a catastrophic scale. What is most striking is how often people accepted these illnesses as fate. Bread was too central to blame. It would be like blaming air for making you sick. So instead, people invented stories to explain their pain. They spoke of witches cursing the harvest, of spirits lurking in the fields, of saints testing their faith. All the while, they kept eating the bread that made them sick, because what else could they do? Hunger was a harsher enemy than poison. There's a grim comedy in how familiar this logic still feels. We eat processed food today, packed with sugar and chemicals, and shrug off the long-term harm because the short-term hunger is satisfied. Everything causes cancer, we joke, as we pour another soda or microwave another meal. In a way, we are not so different from medieval villagers chewing on tainted bread, hoping the discomfort will pass, convincing ourselves that it is normal to feel bad after eating. Perhaps we have always been experts at denial when it comes to the things we crave. The silent illnesses also created deeper social consequences. Villages lost workers when men became too weak to plow. Mothers miscarried more often. Children died young from infections their bodies could not fight. Bread was not just food. It was the quiet architect of mortality. And yet, it was also the only thing standing between survival and starvation. The paradox is cruel. The very food that sustained communities also hollowed them out from within. Sometimes, these illnesses did not stop at physical suffering. They shaped culture and belief. Hallucinations from ergot may have fueled stories of visions, prophecies, and demonic possession. Entire religious movements could have been sparked by poisoned loaves. A villager seeing saints descend from heaven may simply have been writhing in fever after a bad meal. History itself and its strange turns and myths may owe more to bread than we dare to imagine. And through it all, bread remained on the table. No one abandoned it, no matter how sick it made. Its presence was too powerful, its role too sacred. People carried the weight of silent illnesses because the alternative was immediate death by hunger. Survival demanded compromise, and so the compromises continued. But there was one final cruelty. The betrayal of bread was not only in what it carried, but in who it excluded. While peasants suffered silently from sickness, the wealthy feasted on cleaner, whiter loaves, free from most of the dangers. Bread revealed the great divide of the Middle Ages, the difference between surviving and living. The poor swallowed poison with each meal, while the rich enjoyed purity. And that divide bred not only resentment, but desperation. Desperation that could spark revolt, rebellion, and eventually change. Few chapters in history are as haunting as the outbreaks of ergotism, the sickness born from bread poisoned by a fungus that thrived silently in fields of rye. Ergot, a parasite resembling blackened grains, blended so well with the harvest that millers rarely noticed it. Ground into flour, it became invisible, woven into dough, baked into loaves, and carried to tables with prayers of gratitude. Yet every bite carried the seeds of torment. People called it the fire of St. Anthony, not knowing its true origin, and those who suffered became walking testaments to the cruelty of bread turned weapon. The symptoms began innocently enough: tingling fingers, a restless stomach, a strange heaviness in the limbs. But soon the fire spread through the body, burning nerves from the inside. Blood vessels constricted until fingers blackened, toes fell away, and whole limbs rotted while their owners still lived. Some victims screamed that flames licked their flesh even as their skin froze to the touch. It was not a metaphor. They truly felt consumed by fire. Villages whispered that sinners were being punished, that demons had entered the bread, or that St. Anthony himself had chosen who must be tested. There was another form of the sickness, no less terrifying. Instead of burning, it twisted the mind. Victims convulsed violently, foamed at the mouth, or danced uncontrollably in what seemed like madness. Others saw visions, angels descending in radiant light, or devils dragging them into darkness. Entire groups fell into shared hallucinations, writhing and screaming, their cries echoing through villages. To witnesses, it looked like possession, witchcraft, or the end of days. Imagine an entire town trembling together, not because of war or plague, but because they had eaten the same loaf of bread. Modern science tells us the cause was alkaloids and ergot, chemicals similar to what centuries later became the basis for LSD. Medieval villagers did not know this, of course. They only knew that bread, their lifeline, had become an instrument of terror. Religious orders like the Antonines rose to treat the afflicted, their hospitals filled with sufferers crying for relief. Pilgrimages were made to shrines, offerings left in desperation. Some improved by sheer chance, ergot contamination varied by loaf, but to the people, recovery was credited to saints, not the cruel hand of nature. The irony is that outbreaks often followed years of hardship. Rye was the grain of the poor, hardy enough to grow in cold, damp conditions where wheat failed. But those same damp conditions nurtured ergot, so the poorer and hungrier you were, the more likely your bread carried poison. Wealthy nobles, who ate white bread from wheat, watched peasants convulse and rot, while their own tables remained safe. Bread was not just a divider of classes, it was a divider of fates. Think about how terrifying it must have been to watch your neighbors fall into madness after a meal you shared with them. One day, you break bread together. The next, they are screaming that snakes crawl under their skin or that flames devour their bones. How do you trust food again? How do you sit at the table, tear off a piece of bread and swallow, knowing it might burn you from the inside? And yet, people did. Hunger was stronger than fear. Every loaf was both a blessing and a gamble. There is also something almost absurd in how much of history might trace back to ergot. Some scholars believe outbreaks fueled witchcraft hysteria, as convulsing, hallucinating villagers were accused of sorcery. The infamous Salem witch trials, centuries later, have even been linked by some theories to contaminated rye harvests. Imagine that, a loaf of bread sparking executions, shaping cultural fears and twisting the course of justice. Bread, the symbol of unity, becoming the catalyst for division and death. And then there are the darker questions. How many revolts, pilgrimages, or religious movements were sparked by visions born not of divine inspiration, but of poisoned bread? How many supposed miracles were nothing more than ergot-induced hallucinations? History is written in ink, but perhaps some of its most dramatic chapters were first drafted in moldy rye fields. For medieval people, though, the explanations remained spiritual. Ergotism outbreaks were opportunities for the church to assert power, to frame suffering as a test of faith, to promise salvation in exchange for devotion. The afflicted became symbols of endurance, their twisted limbs and cries used as warnings or lessons. Bread, in this sense, was both the instrument of torment and the stage on which power was reinforced. And still, no one abandoned it. Bread was too essential, too ingrained in the rhythm of life to be questioned. What lingers in this story is not just the horror of ergot, but the silence around it. Year after year, villages returned to their fields, harvested rye, baked bread, and took the same risk again. They lived in a cycle of need and fear, praying for safety, enduring outbreaks, and carrying scars that never healed. And perhaps the greatest betrayal was not the sickness itself, but the inevitability of it. People knew, on some level, that bread could hurt them, and yet they ate, because the alternative was worse. And if bread could carry fire and madness so devastating, what else might it have carried? The dangers were never just in the grain or the mold. They seeped into the very system of food, how it was stored, who controlled it, who profited from it. Beyond sickness, bread became a tool of manipulation, a way to bind people not just to hunger, but to power. Fresh bread in the Middle Ages was not just food, it was a status symbol. For the wealthy, a loaf pulled warm from the oven, soft and fragrant, was proof of privilege. For the poor, it was a rare sight, something glimpsed at the tables of lords or in the stalls of city markets where the price was too high for their calloused hands to pay. The divide was stark. Bread was universal, but fresh bread was exclusive. To most villagers, the bread on their table was days, sometimes weeks old, hard enough to crack a tooth, and yet it was all they had. Meanwhile, the nobility dined on loaves made from fine white flour, baked daily by skilled servants, presented still steaming as a display of abundance. Bread revealed not only hunger, but hierarchy. The reason for this divide was not simply greed, it was economics. Grain was currency, flour was precious, and ovens required wood that was scarce and costly. To bake fresh bread every day was a luxury only those with land, money, or power could afford. Common folk stretched their grain as far as possible, baking in bulk when they could, storing loaves until they hardened, softening them later in broth or ale. The poor did not taste freshness, they tasted survival. For them, bread was not about delight, but endurance. Imagine walking through a medieval town market. On one side, bakers displayed golden loaves for merchants, nobles, and clergy. Their crusts shone with a gloss of egg wash, their shapes neat and inviting. The smell alone could draw a crowd, but the price was far beyond what a laborer could pay. On the other side, scraps of darker bread, dense, coarse, often mixed with barley or oats, were sold cheaply to peasants. These loaves were sometimes days old even at the point of purchase. The very act of buying bread revealed your place in society, branding you as privileged or desperate with each coin you spent. The cultural divide was reinforced at the table. In castles and manor houses, fresh bread was cut and served in thick slices, sometimes used as trenchers, edible plates that absorbed sauces and meat juices before being tossed to the dogs or given to servants. For peasants, even stale crusts were treasured, softened in watery soups or chewed slowly to fill an empty stomach. The contrast was humiliating, and it reminded the poor daily that even the simplest food could become a mark of inequality. Bread was supposed to be universal, yet freshness transformed it into a commodity of the few. There's a kind of bitter comedy in this image. We complain today if our bread isn't soft enough, if the crust feels dry after 2 days. Imagine telling that to a medieval peasant gnawing at a loaf baked last week. They might laugh, or perhaps they wouldn't understand at all. For them, the idea of discarding bread because it wasn't perfect would be sacrilege. To them, the waste of fresh bread would be unthinkable. Our luxury of choice would look like madness to their eyes. The inequality also shaped health. Fresher bread, made from whiter, finer flour, carried fewer risks of mold or ergot than the dark, rough bread of the poor. Nobles ate cleaner, safer loaves, while peasants consumed the leftovers of damp grain, ground with husks and grit. Illness, like privilege, was baked directly into the bread. To be born wealthy meant to live longer, not just because of comfort, but because every meal carried fewer hidden threats. Bread was destiny, and this inequality did not go unnoticed. Bread riots broke out in times of scarcity, when peasants saw nobles eating freshly baked loaves while their own families starved on crumbs. Anger simmered around bakeries, markets, and mills, where the lines between survival and exploitation were clearest. Bread became political, a symbol of oppression, and later in history it would fuel revolutions. The cry for bread was never just about food, it was about justice. Yet, even in those moments of tension, the poor rarely abandoned bread. They clung to it because it was the one food they could rely on, however degraded it became. And perhaps that is the cruelest irony. The very thing that divided society was also the glue that bound it. Bread was the thread connecting lord and peasant, priest and beggar. Everyone ate it, but not everyone ate it fresh. That small difference marked the line between privilege and hardship. If you want to picture this divide, imagine 2 meals served at the same hour. In the great hall of a castle, servants carry in steaming loaves, breaking them open to reveal soft white interiors. Laughter echoes, wine flows, and bread so fresh it melts in the mouth is passed around as casually as if it were endless. Meanwhile, in a peasant's hut, a family huddles around a table, dipping hard crusts into thin cabbage water, chewing slowly, praying the bread will last until the next bake. The same food, 2 realities, separated by wealth and bound together by the same necessity. And still, even among the poor, bread could take many forms. Some stretched it with beans or chestnut flour, others flavored it with herbs to mask staleness, others still ground acorns in desperate years. Adaptation became survival, but no amount of creativity erased the simple truth. Fresh bread was for the few. For everyone else, it was a dream, smelled from afar, longed for, rarely tasted. The cruelty of this hierarchy was not lost on those who lived it. People prayed daily for our daily bread, but the prayer was unequal in its answer. For some, it meant abundance. For others, it meant scraps. The very act of baking became a reflection of class, and while the poor gnawed quietly on their stale loaves, they could not help but wonder what else was being hidden in the bread that reached their table, because inequality was not just about freshness. It was also about what was mixed inside, what was removed, and what was disguised by the hands of those who profited most. The story of bread in the Middle Ages is, in many ways, the story of inequality baked into every crumb. If the wealthy ate golden loaves made from fine white flour, then the poor were left with what remained, the sweepings of the mill floor, the coarsest fragments of grain, the flour that no one else wanted. These leftovers were not simply lower quality. They were often contaminated with husks, dirt, and grit, and yet they were sold at nearly the same price as cleaner flour, because hunger has always been a market where desperation sets the value. Picture the scene inside a mill. The miller finishes grinding a sack of grain for a wealthy client. The choicest flour is set aside, fine and pale, destined for a nobleman's table. What's left behind is the rough stuff, the bran, the broken fragments, the sweepings from the stone floor. It is mixed hastily, packed into sacks, and carried out back where peasants wait with coins clutched in sweaty palms. They know this is the worst of it, but they also know it is the only flour they can afford. In the eyes of the miller, it is trash made profitable. In the eyes of the peasant, it is survival in a sack. The bread made from this flour was darker, denser, and far less digestible. It weighed heavily in the stomach, leaving people sluggish and often sick. The bran and husk, while today we might praise them for fiber, were in these cases not balanced or clean. They came with splinters of wood from barrels, pebbles from storage, even the occasional mouse dropping swept along with the grain. Each bite was a reminder of class, a bitter taste not just on the tongue, but in the soul. Bread was supposed to sustain, yet here it punished, as if poverty itself had been baked into the loaf. And this wasn't just a matter of taste. The poor bread wore down bodies. The grit damaged teeth, which were already fragile from lack of nutrition. The heaviness of the loaves contributed to malnutrition, as stomachs filled but the body absorbed little nourishment. Children especially suffered, their bellies bloated not from abundance but from the emptiness hidden beneath the weight of cheap bread. Imagine a mother handing her child a slice, knowing it might silence hunger for a few hours but not provide the strength to grow or thrive. That is the quiet cruelty of low-quality flour. It fills, but it does not nourish. There is a tragic irony in how modern society views whole grain bread as healthier, while for medieval peasants, it symbolized deprivation. White bread was purity, wealth, luxury. Dark bread was the mark of poverty, of scraping by with what others discarded. It wasn't about nutrition, it was about survival versus indulgence. Today we might pay extra for artisan rustic bread, but back then, rustic meant shame. To chew a coarse loaf was to carry proof of your poverty in your very mouth. And yet, the poor adapted. They learned to disguise the bitterness by soaking bread in soups, by fermenting it into beer, by drying it into crumbs that could be stretched further. They developed rituals and recipes out of necessity, not choice. Some even convinced themselves that this darker bread was a mark of humility, aligning them closer to God's trials. But even the most faithful could not deny the gnawing awareness that someone, somewhere, was eating soft white loaves while they broke their teeth on crumbs swept from the floor. What makes this picture more bitter still is that millers and bakers often took advantage of the poor. Laws were written to punish bakers who cheated by mixing sawdust or clay into flour, but enforcement was rare, and fines were often paid with profits already made from desperate customers. The poor had no power to demand purity. They accepted whatever was sold to them, trusting that their prayers might purify what commerce corrupted. And so the system perpetuated itself, with wealth and hunger feeding off one another in a loop as relentless as the turning of the millstone. Think, too, of the humiliation tied to this. Bread was not just food, it was identity. To be seen buying the coarse flour was to announce your poverty to your neighbors. To serve hard, dark bread at your table was to show your children their place in the world. It wasn't just that the poor were denied quality, they were reminded of it daily in a ritual that played out in their hands and mouths. In every bite, inequality was tasted, swallowed, and carried into the body. And yet, the cruel joke is that even this cheap bread was not truly cheap. The poor sometimes paid proportionally more for bad flour than the wealthy did for good. Hunger inflated the price. Desperation stripped away bargaining power. Bread was a commodity controlled by those with grain, mills, and ovens, and the poor were forever at their mercy. In this sense, bread was more than food, it was leverage. To control bread was to control people, to profit from their hunger, to dictate their strength or their weakness. But the danger of this poor quality flour went beyond economics and pride. It also carried hidden health risks. Contamination was not only from grit and dirt, but also from storage itself. Grain sacks and damp barns bred insects and mold, which ended up ground into the flour without a second thought. For the poor, who had no choice but to buy it, every loaf carried not just the weight of survival, but also the seeds of sickness. Bread was the one thing they needed most, and the one thing most likely to harm them. And this is where the betrayal deepens. Because bread was not only corrupted in its ingredients, it was corrupted in its environment. If the flour handed to the poor was already dirty, then the places where their loaves were baked made matters worse. For while nobles had private ovens and clean kitchens, peasants often relied on communal ovens, filthy and smoke-choked, where contamination layered itself onto bread that was already degraded before it ever touched the fire. The medieval mill was the heartbeat of the village. Its wheels turned with the power of rivers or the wind, grinding grain into flour that would feed every family, rich and poor alike. But for all its importance, the mill was not the clean, orderly image we might imagine. Step inside and you would be greeted not by the warm smell of fresh flour, but by a choking haze of dust, the scurrying of rats, and the unmistakable stench of animal waste. These mills were not sterile machines. They were living ecosystems, and not the kind you wanted near your food. The same stone that ground wheat was often coated with droppings from rodents, birds, and even livestock that wandered in from the fields. And those droppings, mixed with the flour, inevitably found their way into bread. Imagine watching a miller at work. His clothes are coated in flour, his face streaked with sweat and dust. The stones groan as they crush the grain, and clouds of powder fill the air. But in the corners, rats dart in and out of the sacks, gnawing holes through the cloth, leaving trails of droppings behind. Birds fly through open windows, perching on beams overhead, their waste falling unnoticed into piles of grain. Cats roam the mill, chasing vermin, but even they leave behind their own mess. Every movement in the mill, every flutter, every scurry, leaves its trace in the flour. The villagers waiting outside don't see this. They only see sacks being filled, tied, and carried home. To them it is food. To us, it is contamination in every scoop. And yet, no one questioned it. The presence of animals in mills was as natural as the turning of the wheel. Rats were everywhere in medieval life, and people had no understanding of disease transmission as we do today. Droppings were seen as unpleasant, but not as deadly. The miller might shake his head and curse the vermin, but he didn't throw away the grain. Waste was too valuable to discard. Hunger always outweighed disgust, and so flour ground with traces of filth became bread baked with hidden sickness. The irony is that these very contaminants often gave bread its gritty texture. When peasants complained of stones in their loaves or strange flavors, they thought it was simply bad milling. In truth, some of that grit was not stone at all, but the remnants of animals that lived alongside their food supply. It was bread flavored by the uninvited guests of the mill. And though no one would have admitted it, everyone knew, on some level, that what they were eating was not entirely grain. The health consequences were enormous. Animal droppings carried parasites, bacteria, and diseases that flour alone could never explain. Villagers, who suffered fevers, stomach cramps, or wasting sickness, often traced it to curses, bad air, or the wrath of God. They never blamed the mill, the heart of their survival, yet each loaf carried with it invisible remnants of the creatures that thrived in its shadow. And because mills served entire communities, one contaminated batch of flour could sicken an entire village. Bread became a shared risk, as dangerous as it was necessary. There is a certain grim humor in imagining a medieval feast where nobles dined on white bread, declaring its superiority over the coarse bread of peasants. What they did not realize was that both loaves likely passed through the same filthy stones, touched the same droppings, carried the same hidden threats. Class may have divided texture and freshness, but filth was the one equalizer. Bread united rich and poor in invisible contamination, though only the poor suffered more deeply from its consequences. And mills were not just vulnerable to animals. They were part of a larger cycle of contamination. Grain was stored in barns before milling, often in piles on dirt floors. Rats burrowed through them, leaving more than just droppings behind. Dead rodents sometimes ended up ground with the grain. Stories survive of millers finding tails or bones mixed in with flour, though most villagers never heard about it. By the time the flour reached their homes, any trace of what it carried was invisible, its presence revealed only later in mysterious sickness. We laugh today at conspiracy theories about food being dirty or tampered with, yet medieval bread truly was. No one needed to poison it deliberately. It was poisoned by the very conditions of its creation. The line between sustenance and sickness was razor thin, and yet people kept eating because they had no alternative. Bread was their lifeline, even when it carried the shadow of death. But the story does not end in the mill. Once the flour left those stones, it began another journey through sacks, carts, and storage rooms that were no less infested. Rats followed the grain, gnawing through sacks at night, leaving more contamination behind. And when finally it reached homes, it was baked in ovens thick with smoke and soot. By the time a loaf reached the table, it was less a product of grain than a tapestry of filth, fire, and desperation. The real tragedy is how normalized it all became. Children grew up thinking bread was supposed to taste this way, earthy, bitter, smoky, sometimes with an odd crunch. They learned to ignore the stomach pains, the fevers, the weakness, because that was life. Bread gave them strength enough to work, but also carved years off their lives. It was not just food, it was the slow poison everyone accepted. And if mills filled bread with the filth of animals, storage barns added another silent danger, the rats themselves. For wherever grain was stored, rats multiplied, carrying not only droppings but plagues. The next betrayal of bread lay not in the stones of the mill, but in the dark, gnawed corners of the granaries where life and death shared the same grain pile. Grain storage was supposed to be the safety net of medieval life, the guarantee that a family or a village could survive the lean months of winter. Yet the barns and granaries where those precious sacks of wheat and rye were kept were anything but safe. These structures were dark, damp, and full of holes that welcomed the most unwelcome of tenants, rats. Once inside, the rodents treated the grain stores like their personal kingdom. They nested in the sacks, gnawed through the cloth, and left trails of droppings and urine wherever they went. The people who depended on that grain rarely saw the full extent of this infestation, but they tasted it in every loaf of bread baked from those sacks. Imagine walking into a medieval barn. The smell hits you first, a pungent mix of damp straw, animal musk, and grain dust heavy in the air. In the dim light, you can see sacks stacked high against the wall, their fabric chewed through in jagged holes. If you listen closely, you can hear the scratching, the constant scurrying of dozens of tiny claws. Rats dart across the rafters, leap between piles, vanish into the shadows. To them, this is paradise. Warmth, food, shelter, all in abundance. To the villagers who depend on the grain, it is silent theft. By the time they come to collect their share, much of it has already been eaten, fouled, or spoiled by the rats. The consequences went far beyond lost food. Rats carried filth with them, their droppings mixed with the grain, and their urine soaked into the sacks. Worse still, dead rats sometimes ended up buried in the piles, their decaying bodies hidden until the grain was milled into flour. Bread made from such stores was not just unhealthy, it was actively dangerous. Stomach illnesses, fevers, and even outbreaks of plague found their roots in barns like these. People had no knowledge of germs, but they knew sickness followed spoiled grain. Yet what choice did they have? Throwing it away meant certain starvation. Eating it meant gambling with invisible risks. Hunger always tipped the scales toward risk. What makes this even more haunting is how helpless villagers were against these invaders. Cats were common, but few cats could never match the endless tide of rats. Traps were crude and unreliable. Granaries were built with raised floors and stone bases to slow infestations. But rats always found a way in. They were as inevitable as the seasons. People cursed them, prayed against them, but lived alongside them. The rat became the eternal companion of the medieval diet, gnawing its presence into every meal. There's a bitter humor in how normalized it all became. A bit of rat-chewed grain wasn't shocking, it was expected. Villagers sifted what they could, shook the sacks to scatter droppings, and hoped that baking would cleanse what remained. Bread that carried a faint tang of musk or bitterness was eaten anyway. Complaining was pointless. In a world where hunger loomed over every season, survival meant swallowing disgust along with your daily crust. And the scale of rat infestations made them more than just a nuisance. They were a threat to entire economies. Grain was wealth, grain was power, and when rats consumed or spoiled large stores, prices soared. Families already on the edge of starvation were pushed into famine. Bread riots often began not in the bakery but in the barns, when people realized their grain stores had been consumed by creatures no bigger than a hand. The image is almost absurd. Great lords and kings controlling armies, yet powerless against swarms of rats that undermined the food supply from the shadows. Of course, rats brought with them more than hunger. They carried fleas, and those fleas carried the plague. Though medieval people did not yet understand the connection, the link between rats and the grain barns and waves of death across Europe is undeniable. In this way, bread and plague were tied together. The same sacks of grain that promised survival could become vehicles of mass death, spreading disease from one household to the next with each loaf that was baked. Think of the psychological toll this must have taken. A family would bake bread from their precious stores, eat together by the fire, and within days someone might fall violently ill. Was it God's punishment? Was it bad air, as they believed? Or was it, unknowingly, the rats that had shared their meal before them? Bread was both blessing and curse, comfort and terror, never fully trustworthy. And still, it remained the only option. In a way, rats were the invisible bakers of the Middle Ages. Every loaf bore their touch, whether through lost grain, contamination, or the diseases they carried. People lived at their mercy, rarely seeing them, but always suffering the consequences. And yet, for all the horror, villagers continued to pray for their daily bread, knowing full well that daily bread carried the fingerprints of vermin. But rats were not the only danger lurking in the process. Even when the grain survived the barns, and even when the flour was milled and taken home, another threat still awaited it: the oven. Because if rodents fouled the grain before baking, then the fire itself had its own way of poisoning the bread after. The next betrayal of bread came not from what was hidden in the sacks, but from the very flames that were supposed to purify it. Bread was supposed to be purified by fire, cleansed in the heart of the oven until it was safe to eat. But in the Middle Ages, even fire betrayed the eater. The wood that fueled village ovens was often not seasoned and dry, but freshly cut, what we call greenwood. And greenwood does not burn clean. It smolders, coughing out thick plumes of smoke, releasing chemicals that cling to the dough like a second skin. The result was bread infused not with the warmth of fire, but with the acrid taste of tar and resin, a loaf steeped in poison before it ever reached the table. Step into a medieval bakery, and the first thing that hits you is the haze. The oven is roaring, but instead of a clear flame, there's a choking fog that curls around the baker's head, stinging his eyes and clogging his lungs. The loaves inside absorb it all. When they emerge, the crusts are not golden, but nearly black, coated with soot that flakes onto fingers and lips. To the poor, this was still bread, still survival. But each bite carried smoke deep into the body, laying invisible scars on the lungs and the heart. We now know that burning greenwood releases creosote, carbon monoxide, and fine particulates. These are the same toxins linked today to lung disease and cancer. Medieval villagers didn't have the language for this, but they had the coughs, the wheezing, the shortened lives to prove it. Bakers especially were victims of their trade, breathing in smoke day after day until their lungs failed. Customers ate the residue, and while they may not have died instantly, the slow poisoning gnawed at them meal after meal. Bread was supposed to sustain, but here it suffocated silently and relentlessly. The irony is that people often preferred the smoky loaves. Smoke gave bread a certain bitterness, a heaviness that felt filling. In an age of scarcity, flavor wasn't judged by delight, but by how much it could trick the body into feeling satisfied. A smoky crust was a sign of a full stomach, even if the price was years off one's life. It's a dark comedy to think about. In modern times, restaurants advertise wood-fired flavor as luxury, but in medieval kitchens, wood-fired meant coughs, soot, and lungs scarred before their time. And there was no easy solution. Dry wood was valuable and hard to come by, often reserved for heating noble houses or forging weapons. The poor had to make do with whatever they could gather: branches freshly cut, damp logs dragged from rivers, even bundles of straw. These fuels smoked fiercely, and their fumes coated the bread. A family might save their grain for weeks, carry it to the communal oven, and return home with loaves blackened by smoke, their hard-earned meal tainted before they even tasted it. Imagine the bitterness, not just on the tongue, but in the soul. The ovens themselves made things worse. Layers of soot built up inside, never cleaned away, so that every new batch of loaves carried the residue of fires past. Smoke seeped not only into the bread, but into the walls of the bakery, into the air villagers breathed as they waited for their turn. Children grew up knowing that the smell of smoke was the smell of food. They associated survival with choking air, with stinging eyes, with lungs that never felt quite clear. The line between nourishment and harm blurred until no one could separate them. And still, bread remained the center of life. Families broke smoky loaves together with gratitude. Priests raised them as symbols of the sacred. Lords demanded them as tribute. The very loaf that scarred their insides was also the one they prayed for each morning. Survival demanded a blindness to danger. To question the bread was to question life itself. And so they chewed, swallowed, and endured, never knowing that each smoky bite carried them one step closer to decline. It's tempting to see this as just another example of medieval hardship, but there's a larger truth here. Bread wasn't merely food, it was a reflection of the world around it. If the air was dirty, the bread carried the smoke. If the barns were filthy, the bread carried the rats. If the grain was poisoned, the bread carried the fungus. Bread mirrored life itself, fragile, tainted, and yet desperately clung to. And smoke was only one of many betrayals. If a family was unlucky, their bread might not even last long enough to go stale. Stored in damp huts, carried in baskets through muddy streets, loaves grew harder and harder until they became nearly inedible. The choice then was simple: throw it away and starve, or chew through stone and call it supper. The next danger of bread was not hidden in fire or smoke, but in time itself. The cruelty of stale loaves that could break teeth as easily as they broke hunger. There's a peculiar cruelty in the way bread betrays time. Fresh from the oven, it was a symbol of comfort, steaming and fragrant with a crust that crackled under the touch. But in the medieval world, that moment of softness lasted barely a day. Without preservatives, without careful storage, a loaf began to harden almost immediately. Within 2 or 3 days, it could already challenge your teeth. Within a week, it could feel closer to stone than to food. Yet for peasants, who baked infrequently to conserve fuel and grain, this was the bread they lived on. Loaves so hard they could ring against the table like wood when dropped. Imagine the sound of such bread striking a wooden board, a hollow thud that reminds you more of carpentry than cooking. In some households, knives were useless against it. Men took axes to their loaves, splitting them as though they were chopping firewood. Women soaked hunks in broth for hours before they could be chewed. Children gnawed them slowly, their gums sore, their small teeth sometimes breaking. And still, the bread was eaten with gratitude because hunger demanded it. A loaf could be a stone in your hand, but it was better than nothing at all. We tend to laugh at stale bread today, tossing it out when it loses its softness. But in medieval kitchens, stale bread was the norm, not the exception. In fact, recipes evolved to cope with it. Bread soups and porridges, what we might call peasant dishes, were ways to soften rock-hard loaves in liquid so they could still be swallowed. Panzanella in Italy, SOP in England, or even the ancestor of French toast were born from desperation, not culinary creativity. These meals were not delicacies, they were survival strategies, designed to wring every last bit of usefulness from bread long past its prime. The hardness of bread also left its mark on the body. Dental remains from medieval cemeteries show teeth ground down, cracked, or missing entirely. Bread was often mixed with grit from the millstones, and once hardened, that gritty texture became even more brutal. Eating stale bread was like chewing sandpaper. Over time, this constant assault left mouths in ruin. Toothaches were common, abscesses could be fatal, and for many the simple act of eating was an agony. Bread may have kept them alive, but it exacted a toll with every bite, and yet, for all its cruelty, stale bread had its uses. Its density made it last longer, and it could serve as more than food. In wealthier households, thick slabs of stale bread became trenchers, edible plates that soaked up meat juices and sauces during a meal. When the feast ended, these soaked hunks were handed to servants or the poor. To the lords, trenchers were disposable. To the poor, they were a meal richer than anything they could afford themselves. In this way, even stale bread revealed the chasm between classes. What nobles threw away as scraps was a rare delicacy for peasants. There was a strange comedy in imagining a villager trying to eat one of these stone-like loaves. Perhaps they joked that if bandits attacked, they could defend themselves with bread as weapons. Perhaps they teased children, daring them to break their teeth on it. Humor was often a way to cope with hunger's cruelty, to turn misery into something laughable, even if only for a moment. Because deep down everyone knew the truth. Stale bread wasn't funny at all. It was a reminder of scarcity, of fragility, of the thin line between survival and starvation. But stale bread carried dangers beyond broken teeth. Left in damp huts, it became a breeding ground for mold, invisible at first, then creeping in with green or black fuzz. Families often cut away the worst spots, convincing themselves the rest was safe, but the toxins had already spread. A loaf could be both stone and sponge at once, hard to bite, yet porous enough to harbor illness. It was another cruel paradox of medieval life. The food that promised endurance often delivered weakness. And yet, no matter how hard or dangerous it became, bread remained the cornerstone of daily life. Villagers broke stale loaves together, dipped them in broth, and gave thanks. Priests still blessed them at altars. Children still learned to chew their way through them. Bread, even when cruel, was sacred. To throw it away was not just wasteful, but sinful. Better to risk broken teeth or sickness than to dishonor the gift of grain. That belief carried people through winters, through famines, through centuries of hunger. But the betrayal of bread did not stop with time. Beyond hardness, beyond mold, beyond soot, there were poisons hidden deeper still. Some loaves carried threats that were invisible, inescapable, and devastating. Bread could burn the body from within, not just through disease, but through fire itself, fire that required no flame. And when villagers felt their skin burn and their minds twist after eating, they believed it was not bread at all, but God, demons, or fate. The next danger lay in the mysteries of poisoned grain, where each meal became not just nourishment, but a gamble with madness and death. Fermentation is a quiet kind of magic, the invisible process that transforms a lump of wet flour into something alive, airy, and nourishing. Today, we understand the science. Yeasts consume sugars, gases expand the dough, and gluten traps it all in a delicate web, giving bread its soft texture. But in the Middle Ages, this was a mystery. People didn't know about microorganisms or chemistry. To them, dough rising was as much superstition as skill, and when it failed, the results could be deadly. A poorly fermented loaf was not just unpleasant. It could be heavy, damp, indigestible, and crawling with hidden dangers. Imagine a medieval baker in a small village. He mixes flour and water in a wooden trough, perhaps adds a lump of old dough from yesterday to start the new batch. He leaves it covered with cloth, hoping it will swell with bubbles by the next morning. But the air in his cottage is damp. The grain he used is coarse, and the lump barely grows. He bakes it anyway. The result is not the springy bread we picture, but a dense brick that traps moisture deep inside. When eaten, it sits in the stomach like a stone impossible to digest. Over time, such loaves caused chronic stomach ailments, malnutrition, and sometimes even sickness from bacteria thriving in the undercooked interior. Bread was meant to give strength, but bad fermentation stole it instead. The truth is that fermentation was as much luck as skill. Without controlled conditions, bakers relied on the whims of the air. Wild yeasts floated unpredictably, influenced by the weather, the cleanliness of tools, even the time of year. A batch of dough that rose beautifully one day could collapse the next with no clear reason. Villagers often explained this in spiritual terms. Perhaps God had blessed or cursed the loaf. Perhaps a witch had spoiled it. Perhaps the baker himself carried sin in his hands. When bread failed to rise, it was never just a culinary disaster. It was an omen. There's something darkly comic in imagining a medieval family sitting around a table with a flat, damp loaf, chewing in silence, trying to convince themselves it still counted as bread. The father might joke that at least it would last longer since no one could eat much of it. The mother might sigh that maybe the saints would send better luck next time, and the children, with bellies growling, would gnaw anyway, because hunger mocked their disappointment. Humor softened the edges of despair, but the despair was always there, baked into every heavy, tasteless bite. Poor fermentation carried more than discomfort. Damp bread spoiled quickly. Moist crumbs became perfect homes for mold, invisible at first, but soon blooming with toxins. Families would scrape away the green fuzz, insisting the rest was fine, but invisible threads remained, poisoning slowly. Worse still, partially fermented dough sometimes contained harmful bacteria, leading to food poisoning. Fevers, vomiting, and cramps followed meals, but because everyone ate the same bread, no one suspected it. It was just the way life was, and so the cycle continued. The wealthy, of course, had advantages. They had access to finer flour that fermented more easily, ovens that retained heat better, and servants who could spend time perfecting dough. Their loaves rose higher, baked more evenly, and carried fewer risks. For the poor, bad fermentation was inevitable. Their flour was coarse, their ovens smoky and uneven, their knowledge limited. The very science that could have saved them was centuries away from discovery. Bread became a mirror of inequality again, light and nourishing for the few, heavy and punishing for the many. And yet, even without science, people learned patterns. They noticed that dough left near the fire fared better, or that using the same trough day after day seemed to help. What they didn't know was that they were cultivating natural sourdough starters, colonies of yeast and bacteria that lingered in wood and cloth. These accidental traditions carried knowledge without explanation. Bread was a teacher, even as it was a betrayer, but its lessons came at the cost of countless failures, countless sick stomachs, countless superstitions that spread faster than understanding. It is easy to laugh at their ignorance, but how different are we, really? We still cling to rituals in kitchens, sourdough cultures passed down like family members, bread recipes guarded as secrets, bakers swearing by habits they cannot scientifically explain. Perhaps the mystery is part of the appeal. Bread feels alive because, in a way, it is. But for medieval villagers, that life was fickle, often cruel, and sometimes deadly. And when fermentation went wrong, when loaves grew heavy and bitter, people had no choice but to eat them anyway. Hunger demanded obedience. Bread was bread, no matter how poorly made, no matter what it did to the body. To throw it away was unthinkable. Better to suffer cramps or sickness than to let a crumb go unused. That resignation carved itself into generations, shaping not only how people ate, but how they endured. But fermentation was only one betrayal. Even when a loaf rose properly, even when it seemed airy and fresh, other dangers lurked. The flour itself could be corrupted, stretched by dishonest hands mixed with fillers that had nothing to do with grain. And once again, the poorest were the ones who bore the brunt of this deceit, paying with their coins and their health for bread that was less food and more fraud. The medieval kitchen was not a place of sterile counters and neatly labeled containers. It was dark, smoky, and alive with the sounds of animals, insects, and constant activity. In that environment, bread dough was often left sitting for hours, or even days, before it reached the oven. Wooden troughs held the damp mixture of flour and water, covered loosely with cloth or left exposed to the air. What grew inside was unpredictable. Sometimes, if fortune favored, wild yeasts worked their quiet magic, and the dough rose into something airy and edible. Other times, when conditions were poor, bacteria flourished instead, turning the dough into a breeding ground for sickness. Without refrigeration, without knowledge of hygiene, every batch was a gamble. Imagine a peasant woman kneeling over her dough, her hands calloused from work in the fields. She mixes by instinct, not by measurement. The flour is coarse, speckled with husk and dust, the water pulled from a wooden bucket that has not been scrubbed in months. She sets the dough aside, hoping it will swell overnight. But her hut is damp, and the air heavy with smoke and animals. By morning, the dough smells faintly sour, not in the pleasant way we now associate with sourdough, but rancid, almost rotten. She bakes it anyway. When her family eats, they grimace at the taste but swallow. Hours later, their stomachs cramp and fevers follow. They pray, curse, endure, and return to the same bread the next day. Hunger left them no other choice. The problem was not laziness or ignorance. People had no way to see the invisible armies of bacteria colonizing their food. Germ theory was centuries away. To them, sickness was a mystery, the result of foul air, bad spirits, or divine punishment. A foul-smelling loaf was not understood as contaminated. It was seen as unlucky, perhaps cursed. And yet, they ate. To throw it away was to invite starvation. Bread that made you ill was still better than no bread at all. In many ways, this silent bacterial war shaped medieval health more than famine or plague. Chronic diarrhea, fevers, and stomach pain were part of daily life. Villagers rarely enjoyed the feeling of eating without consequence. They assumed discomfort was normal, not realizing that their very food supply was conspiring against them. Bread did not kill quickly, it wore people down. It sapped their strength for work, weakened children, and left entire communities vulnerable to harsher diseases when they came. The betrayal was not in one meal, but in the slow grind of a lifetime spent consuming tainted dough. And yet, out of this misery came adaptations. People learned, without science, that baking dough quickly after mixing seemed safer, that leaving it too long risked disaster. They noticed that dough kept near the fire smelled better than dough left in the shadows. Some even carried scraps of older dough into new batches, unknowingly cultivating sourdough cultures that helped suppress harmful bacteria. These scraps were treasured, passed down like heirlooms, symbols of survival written in yeast and time. Tradition became their shield, though they never fully understood why it worked. The irony is that what they saw as superstition often had a basis in biology. Dough mixed in certain wooden troughs always seemed to rise better, because the wood held colonies of wild yeast that kept the bacteria at bay. Loaves baked more safely in hotter ovens, because higher heat killed more contaminants. But the line between success and failure was so thin that one misstep could doom a family. A loaf left too long, a fire not hot enough, and sickness was already baked into the crust. Think of the psychological toll this created. Every meal was an act of trust in something unseen. Families broke bread together not knowing whether it would nourish or poison them. Mothers fed their children with hope, but also with dread, aware that dinner might bring illness before dawn. Bread was both a comfort and a source of anxiety. a daily reminder that survival hung on forces they could not control. And if bacteria in dough was an invisible threat, it was not the only form of deceit hiding in the bread. Because, while nature played its cruel tricks, human hands often added to the danger. Bakers and millers, under pressure to stretch their supplies and profits, mixed their flour with things that were never meant to be eaten. Sawdust, sand, ground-up beans, even chalk found their way into the dough. These adulterations did not just cheat the poor, they harmed them, transforming bread from a gamble of nature into a betrayal of trust. Bread was never just food in the Middle Ages, it was also business. And business, as it so often does, created opportunities for dishonesty. Grain was precious, flour was currency, and bakers and millers stood at the very center of survival. They held the power to stretch, to dilute, and to cheat. And cheat they often did. One of the most insidious tricks was the mixing of flour with substances that looked harmless enough to the eye but carried hidden dangers. Clay, chalk, sand, and even powdered stone. These materials added weight to the sacks, bulked up the dough, and allowed merchants to sell less grain for more profit. To the hungry villager, the bread looked like bread. To the dishonest baker, it looked like silver in his pocket. Picture a poor family buying a loaf. They hand over their hard-earned coins and receive what appears to be a heavy, hearty bread. It feels satisfying in the hand, as though it will feed them longer. But when they slice into it, the crumb is gritty, the taste faintly bitter, the texture unnatural. The children chew and spit out tiny grains of sand. Father shakes his head, but eats anyway. They cannot afford to complain. Hunger silences outrage. By the time the family realizes they have been tricked, it is too late. The bread is gone, swallowed, sitting in their stomachs like pebbles. Authorities were not blind to this deceit. Records survive of medieval laws designed to punish bakers who adulterated bread. Fines, public shaming, even the threat of the pillory awaited those caught mixing foreign matter into flour. In some towns, dishonest bakers were paraded through the streets with loaves hanging around their necks, symbols of their betrayal. But these punishments, when they came, were rare. The temptation was too great, the hunger too constant, and the poor too powerless to resist. For every baker punished, many more slipped quietly through, feeding communities with loaves laced with earth. And the dangers were more than moral. Eating bread filled with sand or clay wore down teeth with every bite. Dental remains from medieval cemeteries show mouths ground to nubs, enamel destroyed long before old age. Bread was not just sustenance, it was sandpaper disguised as food. Worse still, clay and chalk carried contaminants of their own. Some clays contained heavy metals, and in damp dough they fostered bacteria. Illness followed meals in ways no one could trace. Bread filled bellies, yes, but it carved health away grain by grain, crumb by crumb. There's a kind of bleak humor in the idea of bread as both nourishment and gravel. Imagine villagers joking that their baker must have mixed half the road into their loaf, only to discover that the joke was true. Complaints may have been whispered, but complaints did not fill empty stomachs. Better to eat bread that crunched like stone than to have no bread at all. Hunger bends morality, and it bends tolerance. The very act of chewing became an exercise in endurance. But not all adulteration was malicious. Sometimes bakers stretched flour with beans, peas, or chestnut meal, especially in times of famine. These substitutions, though still deceptive, at least offered some nutrition. It was when flour was cut with earth, sand, or ash that the betrayal deepened. Those substances had no purpose but profit, and they turned bread into a symbol of exploitation. To eat such a loaf was to taste not just hunger, but the corruption of the system itself. And still, bread retained its sacred status. Even adulterated, it was blessed in churches, broken at tables, and carried into the fields as a meal. The faithful prayed over loaves that were more dirt than grain, asking God to protect them from the harm within. Bread was so central to survival that people convinced themselves it must be good, no matter how it tasted. Faith disguised the fraud, or at least softened the despair. The cruelest truth was that those who suffered most were always the poor. The wealthy bought pure white bread, soft and clean, while peasants chewed loaves filled with grit. Inequality was not hidden. It was baked into every bite. And yet, for all their suffering, the poor had no choice but to return to the same bakers, the same mills, the same loaves. Their dependence made them complicit in their own exploitation, tied to bread by hunger's unbreakable chain. And if deception in the flour was not enough, the very baking of these loaves added yet another betrayal. For even when the dough was free of sand and clay, the ovens that baked it were filled with soot, ash, and smoke. The fire that was supposed to cleanse instead layered on its own poisons, coating bread with bitterness and filling homes with choking fumes. The next danger was not hidden in the flour, but in the very air that surrounded the bread as it baked. The bread of the medieval peasant was not the golden, crusty loaf we imagine today, glowing warmly on a wooden table. It was gray, heavy, and bitter, a reminder that poverty could be tasted as surely as it could be seen. The color alone spoke of its quality, or rather, its lack of it. While nobles enjoyed fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat, the poor baked loaves from the remnants, coarse flour full of bran, husks, and sometimes other unwanted additions swept from the mill floor. When water and fire transformed this mixture into bread, the result was a dull, ashen gray. To eat it was not just to eat food, it was to swallow a visible mark of inequality. Imagine breaking such a loaf. Instead of a soft, airy interior, you'd find a dense, compact mass, closer to clay than to bread. The crust might be dark and uneven, the inside streaked with patches of discoloration. The smell was earthy, sometimes sour, sometimes faintly moldy, depending on how long the flour had been stored before baking. And then there was the taste, bitter, rough, with a grit that scratched the teeth and clung to the tongue. For peasants, this flavor was life itself. They chewed it daily, grimacing at the bitterness, but also thanking heaven for it, because the alternative was to starve. The bitterness was not only in the grain. Sometimes it came from the baking process itself, as loaves absorbed soot and smoke from green wood fires. Sometimes it came from additives, chestnut flour, acorn meal, even ground beans, that made the bread darker, heavier, and harsher. Hunger made these substitutions necessary, but the result was a loaf that seemed more punishment than reward. To the poor, bread was both a blessing and a curse. It silenced the cries of an empty stomach, but it left behind a taste that never let them forget their place in society. We might laugh at the obsession with color, but in the Middle Ages, color meant everything. White bread was associated with purity, refinement, and wealth. Gray bread was associated with poverty, struggle, and hardship. To eat white bread was to display status. To eat gray bread was to accept one's station in life. Bread was not just nourishment, it was social identity baked into every crumb. The very sight of a gray loaf on the table told the world who you were and what you lacked. And yet, despite its bitterness, gray bread was often the only thing that stood between survival and death. Families baked large loaves once a week, eating them day after day as they grew staler, harder, and less appetizing. They softened slices in broth or ale, shredded them into soups, or fed them to children with milk when they could afford it. The bitterness was never fully disguised, but necessity dulled the tongue. Hunger has a way of making even the harshest food acceptable, and the peasants learned to swallow bitterness with stoicism. There is a kind of bleak humor in how this bread shaped culture. In some villages, sayings emerged to describe life's hardships with references to bitter bread. To eat gray bread was more than literal. It meant enduring suffering, living with less, accepting injustice. The flavor became metaphor. Bread was not just on the table, it was in the language, in the very way people understood their lives. Even hope tasted bitter when it came wrapped in crusts of gray. The health consequences of this bread were as harsh as its taste. Coarse flour was difficult to digest, and the lack of proper fermentation made it even heavier on the stomach. The constant chewing of gritty bread wore down teeth, leaving many peasants in pain long before old age. And the bitterness often masked contamination, mold, ash, or even ergot, so that what tasted foul might also be dangerous. Every meal was an act of faith that the bread would harm no more than it had to. Meanwhile, the rich dined on loaves so white and delicate they were compared to clouds. These loaves, called manchés in England or pain de bouche in France, were reserved for lords, merchants, and clergy. They melted on the tongue, requiring no effort, leaving no bitterness behind. The contrast was not lost on peasants, who sometimes glimpsed these loaves at markets or during service in noble households. To see bread so pure while chewing on bitterness was to taste inequality twice, once in the mouth and once in the heart. And yet, gray bread endured because it had to. It filled the belly, provided energy for work, and could be stretched further than finer loaves. It became part of the rhythm of peasant life, as familiar as the fields they tilled and the taxes they paid. But if bitterness was the everyday reality, it also left people yearning for sweetness, for something better. Bread became both a chain and a dream, the chain of poverty, the dream of abundance. But the betrayal of bread did not stop at its bitterness. For even as peasants choked down their gray loaves, they knew that those loaves were sometimes stretched further with tricks from dishonest bakers. Flour was not only coarse and bitter, it was often mixed with fillers that had nothing to do with food at all. And so, the gray bread of poverty often carried not just the taste of hardship, but the taste of deception baked deep inside. The contrast between white bread and dark bread in the Middle Ages was more than a matter of taste. It was a map of society itself. To the wealthy, bread was an expression of refinement, purity, and power. To the poor, it was a burden, dense and bitter, swallowed with resignation. The loaf on a table spoke as loudly as a title or a cloak of velvet. It told the world who you were, what you had, and perhaps most painfully, what you would never have. White bread, made from the innermost part of finely sifted wheat, required labor, technology, and expense. The bran and germ were carefully removed, leaving behind a flour that was pale, soft, and almost luxurious. The process consumed time and resources, meaning that only the wealthy could afford it. Nobles, clergy, and merchants sat at tables graced with golden loaves that tore apart easily and melted in the mouth. Their bread was a pleasure to eat, a delicacy that mirrored their comfort and privilege. By contrast, the dark bread of the poor was made from what remained, coarse flour full of bran, husks, dust, and sometimes adulterants like sand or beans. It was heavy, gray, and hard to digest. It scratched teeth, filled bellies without nourishing, and carried the bitter taste of poverty. For peasants, bread was not joy but endurance. A meal of dark bread and water was common, and for many it was the only thing that stood between life and starvation. Eating dark bread was not just eating, it was accepting one's place in the world. The symbolism of this divide ran deep. In many cultures, whiteness became associated with purity, light, and even holiness. White bread was given to guests of honor, used in religious ceremonies, and reserved for the most important tables. Dark bread was considered unrefined, even animal-like. In some places, it was fed to servants, soldiers, or prisoners, a constant reminder of their lower rank. Bread was never just bread, it was status disguised as sustenance. Imagine the humiliation of a peasant working in a noble household, serving soft white loaves to his master's table while knowing that at home his family gnawed on gray, stale crusts. The contrast would not only sting the stomach, but also the soul. Bread itself became a daily lesson in inequality, teaching people to know their place, to accept the hierarchy as natural. When even the simplest food was divided so sharply, what hope was there for fairness in greater things? The irony is that modern nutritionists would praise much of the dark bread eaten by peasants for its fiber and minerals. The bran and germ, stripped away from white flour, carry nutrients lost in refinement. But in the medieval world, this was not a health advantage, it was a curse. Coarse bread spoiled faster, carried more mold and grit, and was far harder to chew with fragile teeth. The very thing that seems healthy to us was misery to them. Meanwhile, the refined white bread that we now call empty calories was, in their eyes, the purest and most desirable of foods. There is a certain comedy in imagining a medieval feast where nobles praised the softness of their loaves, boasting of how clean and white their flour was, while peasants outside looked on enviously. Today, the situation almost reverses. Rustic dark loaves are sold at high prices in artisanal bakeries, while soft white bread is dismissed as cheap and inferior. History loves its ironies, and bread has always been at the center of them. Yet for medieval peasants, there was nothing ironic about it. The division was brutal, and it carried consequences beyond taste. White bread was safer, less likely to harbor toxins like ergot or mold. It was baked more often, consumed fresher, and stored in cleaner places. Dark bread, by contrast, was older, riskier, and baked under harsher conditions. The poor not only suffered more discomfort, they suffered more sickness. Bread widened the gap between classes not only in dignity but in health and survival. And still, the poor clung to their dark bread because they had no other choice. They soaked it in broth, boiled it into gruel, disguised its bitterness however they could. They prayed over it, thanking God for what little they had, even as they knew others prayed over loaves far better. The injustice was written into every meal, every crumb. Bread was both a blessing and a curse, a reminder of survival and of inequality. But even beyond this division of white and dark loaves, bread carried more than social meaning. It was not just about what grain went into it, but how it was used. For while nobles and peasants alike relied on bread to fill their stomachs, they also relied on it to serve other purposes. Sometimes bread was not eaten at all, but pressed into service as something else entirely, an edible plate, a weapon against hunger, or even a tool of ritual. The story of bread was never limited to the table. It extended into every corner of medieval life, shaping not only how people ate, but how they lived. In the Middle Ages, bread was more than food. It was currency. In times of hunger, when coins held little weight against the gnawing emptiness of the stomach, loaves of bread became the measure of survival. A single loaf could be traded for labor, for favors, even for a place to sleep. To peasants who lived hand to mouth, bread was not just sustenance, it was wealth you could hold in your hand, warm or stale, soft or stone hard. Its value was both practical and symbolic, a reflection of the fact that in a world always on the edge of famine, nothing carried more power than something that could silence hunger, if only for a day. Imagine a village struck by a bad harvest. The grain stores are thin, the rats bolder, the winter approaching faster than anyone can prepare. Money exists, yes, but what use is silver when there is no food to buy with it? What use is gold if it cannot be chewed? In these moments, bread itself became the coin of the realm. A farmer might offer a loaf to a neighbor in exchange for help repairing his roof. A servant might be paid, not with money, but with rations of bread. Even debts could be settled with bread, though the poor often found themselves trapped in cycles where today's loaf borrowed meant tomorrow's hunger deepened. This system blurred the line between economy and survival. Bread had an immediacy that coins lacked. A coin could promise food, but bread was food. To hold it in your hands was to hold life, however temporary. And because it spoiled, it could not be hoarded like money. Bread demanded constant exchange, constant movement. It was a currency that expired quickly, keeping people in a state of dependency, forever seeking the next loaf. The cruelty of this system was most visible during famines. In years when harvests failed, the price of bread soared beyond the reach of common people. Loaves became rarities, traded like jewels, hoarded by those with power, fought over by those without. Records tell of bread riots in towns where bakers and millers were attacked, their shops raided by mobs desperate to feed their families. Bread was both treasure and target, proof that when hunger sharpened its teeth, even the sacred became violent. And yet, bread's role as currency was not always tied to desperation. In some towns, bakers were required by law to sell bread at regulated prices, and those loaves became the standard by which daily life was measured. A worker's wage might be calculated in loaves worth rather than in coins. This practical approach shows how deeply bread was embedded in the fabric of medieval existence. It was not just food, it was the scale against which life itself was weighed. There is also something deeply symbolic in bread's role as payment. To be given bread was to be given dignity, a recognition that your labor or presence had value. To be denied bread was to be pushed closer to the edge of survival. Families who could not bake their own relied on these exchanges, stretching their networks of neighbors, friends, and even strangers, all bound by the shared knowledge that hunger spared no one for long. In that sense, bread acted as a form of social glue, linking people in webs of obligation and gratitude. But the darker side was never far away. Bread as currency could just as easily become bread as leverage. Landlords who controlled ovens could demand rents in loaves rather than coins. Lords who hoarded grain could command obedience by doling out bread to the desperate. The church, too, used bread in its rituals of power, both as literal sustenance for the poor and as spiritual symbolism in the Eucharist. Bread fed bodies and souls alike, but in both cases, it reinforced authority. To break bread was not always to share. It was often to remind people who controlled life itself. It's hard not to see the irony in this. Bread, the humblest of foods, the simplest mixture of flour, water, and fire, became the most powerful object in society. It was at once ordinary and extraordinary, eaten daily, yet treasured like gold. People dreamed of it, fought for it, killed for it. Whole families were defined by how much bread they could put on the table. It is no wonder that in prayers, in laws, and in rebellions, bread was always at the center, and perhaps, most chillingly, bread's role as currency made it a weapon. By controlling the ovens, by setting the prices, by hoarding the grain, those in power could bend the poor to their will. A loaf could be mercy, but it could also be punishment. Bread gave and bread withheld, shaping destinies with every rise and fall of the oven fire. Hunger made people pliable, and bread was the key that unlocked obedience. But if bread could act as payment, punishment, and even a weapon, then its story was not only economic, it was also legal. Societies recognized that bread was too important to leave unregulated. Laws were written, punishments handed down, and entire systems of control built around it. The next betrayal of bread lay not in the hunger of the people, but in the hands of those who were supposed to guarantee its fairness, and often failed. Bread was not only the cornerstone of medieval survival, it was also the foundation of medieval justice. Few commodities carried as much symbolic and practical weight as a loaf. To cheat someone of bread was not seen as a minor dishonesty, but as a sin against life itself. That is why bakers were among the most regulated professionals of the Middle Ages, their work closely watched by towns, guilds, and kings. The punishment for cheating, whether by short weight, adulteration, or inflated prices, could be severe, and it reflected the deep moral and social importance of bread in daily life. Picture a medieval market square on a busy morning. Villagers shuffle between stalls, coins clinking softly, stomachs already growling at the scent of fresh bread. A baker stands proudly behind his counter, loaves stacked high, each one supposedly measured and weighed according to the law. But suspicion is in the air. People whisper that his bread feels too light, that his scales tip too conveniently in his favor. If enough voices rise, officials may be called, and the baker's fate could shift in an instant. To be caught selling underweight bread was to risk not only fines, but humiliation, imprisonment, and sometimes brutal public punishment. One of the most notorious of these punishments was the pillory. Bakers found guilty of cheating could be locked into wooden stocks in the center of town, their crime announced to all. Sometimes loaves were hung around their necks as symbols of their deceit. Crowds gathered, jeering, throwing rotten vegetables, sometimes even stones. It was a performance of justice as much as a deterrent, a way of reminding every other baker that bread was sacred and not to be tampered with. The shame was often worse than the penalty itself, marking the guilty long after their time in the stocks was done. In some places, punishments took on an even darker humor. English records describe a punishment known as the baker's ducking stool, where a fraudulent baker might be strapped to a chair and dunked into a river, sputtering before the laughter of the crowd. Elsewhere, dishonest bakers were forced to carry heavy loaves or wear collars studded with bread, paraded like fools for betraying their community. The message was clear. bread was too central to survival for its integrity to be left to chance. But why such harshness? Because bread was more than food. It was justice in tangible form. A coin could be clipped, diluted, or devalued, but a loaf of bread was immediate and personal. Everyone felt its weight in their hands, its substance in their stomachs. To cheat a man of bread was to cheat him of his life. The law recognized this, and societies built entire systems to guarantee the just weight of loaves. In England, the assize of bread and ale, first written in the 13th century, regulated prices and weights, linking the cost of bread directly to the price of grain. Bakers who broke this law risked not just fines, but the wrath of both rulers and the hungry poor. And yet, despite these rules, cheating persisted. The temptation was too great. Grain prices fluctuated wildly with the seasons, and bakers were caught between angry customers and millers demanding high prices for flour. Some tried to recoup losses by cutting corners, adding fillers, or shaving ounces from each loaf. Others simply hoped they wouldn't be caught. It was a dangerous gamble. For every baker who escaped notice, another was dragged through the streets as an example, his shame becoming a spectacle for the very people he had hoped to deceive. There's a grim comedy in the image of a baker, flour still dusting his clothes, stumbling through the market with loaves tied around his neck as children laugh and chase him. Bread, once his livelihood, becomes his punishment. But beneath the laughter was fear. Ordinary people depended on bakers as much as they feared their dishonesty. They needed the bread, but could not always trust it. Regulation and punishment were society's attempt to bridge that gap, to ensure fairness in the most essential of trades. Still, punishment was not only about justice, it was about power. By controlling bread and its bakers, rulers demonstrated their authority over the most intimate aspect of daily life, what people ate. Kings and councils who enforced bread laws gained legitimacy. The church, too, weighed in, equating dishonest bakers with sinners who tampered with the sacred. Bread connected body and soul, so to corrupt it was both crime and heresy. This is why the baker's punishment carried such theatrical weight. It reminded everyone that bread belonged not just to the market, but to morality itself. And yet, as harsh as punishments could be, they did not solve the problem. Hunger always found ways to bend rules. When grain was scarce, when ovens burned low, when mouths demanded more than the harvest could provide, bakers still found themselves tempted to cheat. Society could punish individuals, but it could not punish scarcity. And so the cycle repeated. Deceit, discovery, disgrace, punishment, and return. The bread that was supposed to sustain life became a stage on which the dramas of justice and survival played out, again and again. But punishment did not always fall on bakers alone. Sometimes it was entire communities who bore the cost of corruption and scarcity. Bread riots erupted, not just against one baker, but against the whole system that left the poor with crumbs while the wealthy feasted. In those moments, bread was no longer only food or currency. It was a spark, capable of igniting anger, rebellion, and even revolution. The church in the Middle Ages did not merely occupy the pulpit. It stood at the very heart of daily life, dictating how people lived, worked, and even ate. And because bread was both food and symbol, the church's role in regulating it, or failing to, shaped communities as much as the turning of the seasons. Bread was not just sustenance, it was sacrament. Every mass revolved around it, every prayer invoked it, every blessing sanctified it. "Give us this day our daily bread," was whispered in huts and cathedrals alike. But while the holy bread on the altar represented Christ's body, the loaves in peasant huts represented survival. And between those two loaves lay a chasm of power, inequality, and control. The church often tried to position itself as protector of the poor, condemning bakers who cheated on weight or adulterated flour. Monastic orders sometimes distributed bread freely to beggars at the gates of their abbeys. In moments of famine, priests might open church granaries to provide grain for their flock, presenting the act as divine generosity. These gestures reinforced the church's role as both spiritual and physical savior, the guardian not only of souls, but of stomachs. Bread became a tool of mercy, a way for clergy to bind communities in gratitude and loyalty. But mercy had its limits. More often, the church acted as landowner in authority, collecting tithes and grain, controlling mills, and sometimes owning the communal ovens themselves. Villagers paid not only in coin, but in wheat, and the church determined how much of that wheat was ground, baked, and redistributed. In this way, it became both shepherd and wolf, feeding the hungry with one hand while taking their grain with the other. For peasants, the priest's blessing over bread might feel hollow when that same priest had demanded a share of their harvest to begin with. There is a certain irony here. The bread consecrated at Mass was the purest, finest white bread, reserved for clergy and ritual. The poor watched this miracle unfold with reverence, receiving only a small fragment as part of communion. Meanwhile, the bread they took home was dark, bitter, sometimes laced with mold or grit. They believed both loaves carried divine meaning, yet one was holy perfection, while the other was barely edible. This contrast was not lost on them, and it reinforced the idea that spiritual purity and earthly privilege often walked hand in hand. At times, the church intervened directly in bread markets. In towns where bread prices soared, bishops issued decrees to stabilize costs, reminding bakers of their moral duty. Sermons thundered against fraud, equating dishonest bread with sin. Some monasteries even became famous for their baking, producing loaves that symbolized both physical and spiritual care. And yet, these efforts were uneven, more dependent on local clergy than on universal policy. In many cases, the church turned a blind eye to corruption, as long as tithes and rents flowed steadily. One of the most striking examples of the church's power over bread was the role of feast days and fasts. By dictating when people could eat meat, dairy, or eggs, the church indirectly dictated when bread became the primary staple. During Lent and other fasting seasons, bread carried nearly all the weight of the diet. Monks carefully recorded bread consumption in their rules: how many loaves a day, how large, and what kind of grain. The faithful followed, reshaping their relationship with food according to the calendar of saints. Bread was not only survival, it was obedience, but there was also hypocrisy. While peasants fasted on coarse bread and water, monasteries and cathedrals feasted on fish, pastries, and white loaves baked in clean ovens. Religious rules bent easily when wealth supported them. A nobleman in holy orders might claim to be fasting, but his fasting bread would still be soft, fresh, and sweetened with honey. For the poor, fasting was not a choice or a ritual, it was daily life. The church's role in this system was both to sanctify suffering and to excuse abundance. The most haunting truth is that the church's involvement in bread often blurred the line between compassion and control. To receive bread at the monastery gate was to feel relief, but also to feel dependence. To eat blessed bread at Mass was to taste the divine, but also to be reminded that salvation flowed through clerical hands. Bread bound the people to the altar, as surely as it bound them to the soil. It was grace and leverage at once. And yet, for all its contradictions, the church kept bread sacred in people's imaginations. No matter how bitter, no matter how adulterated, bread was still prayed over, still blessed, still tied to the idea of divine providence. Perhaps this faith softened the blow of hunger, perhaps it blinded people to exploitation. But it also gave them strength. To believe that even the coarsest loaf carried God's grace was to endure when endurance seemed impossible. Still, faith could not disguise the truth forever. When famine struck, when bread prices soared beyond reason, when priests and lords dined on white loaves while peasants starved, resentment boiled over. Bread, once a symbol of unity, became a symbol of betrayal. And when the cry for justice rang through the streets, it was not abstract theology people demanded. It was bread. Bread honest in weight, fair in price, free from corruption. Bread that belonged to them, not only to the church, not only to the lords, but to all who prayed for it daily. Bread riots were among the most visceral expressions of popular rage in the Middle Ages. Unlike disputes over taxes or politics, which could feel abstract or distant, the cry for bread was immediate, tangible, and desperate. Hunger sharpens the voice like no other grievance, and when people reached the point of fury over bread, it meant that survival itself had been threatened. These uprisings were not organized revolutions with lofty manifestos. They were eruptions of stomachs turned into fists. The people rose because their children were crying, because the ovens were empty, because the loaves in the marketplace had become unaffordable or adulterated. Bread was not merely food, it was life. To deny it was to ignite rebellion. Imagine the scene in a small town during a harsh winter. Grain stores are dwindling, prices are rising, and bakers, caught between scarcity and profit, begin to cut corners. Loaves shrink in size even as their prices grow. The poor, who spend most of their earnings on bread, now find themselves unable to feed their families. Anger builds quietly in the marketplace, in taverns, in hushed whispers on the streets. And one day, it explodes. A crowd gathers outside a bakery. Someone accuses the baker of fraud. Another points to his scales. Stones are thrown, doors are broken, and within hours, what began as grumbling has turned into a riot. Flour dust fills the air, loaves are seized and distributed, and the baker's reputation lies in ruins. These bread riots were not rare. From Paris to Florence, from London to Cologne, records describe waves of unrest tied directly to food scarcity. In France, they were called émeutes de subsistance, subsistence riots, where women, often at the forefront, stormed bakeries and grain carts to demand fair prices. In England, the assize of bread was supposed to protect the poor by regulating weight and price, but when it failed, mobs enforced justice with their own hands. They looted bakeries, overturned carts, and sometimes lynched millers or bakers they believed guilty of hoarding. Justice was not written in courts, but shouted in the streets. What is striking is how moral these riots often were. They were not about greed, but about fairness. Rioters rarely tried to enrich themselves. Instead, they seized bread to distribute among the hungry or forced bakers to sell loaves at just prices. There was an almost communal sense of righteousness in these actions, as though the people were restoring balance in a world tilted against them. To the authorities, these riots were dangerous threats to order. To the people, They were survival clothed in anger. The church, too, could become a target during bread riots. Monasteries and granaries, seen as hoarding grain, were attacked by mobs demanding release of their stores. Priests who preached patience sometimes found their words drowned out by the roar of hunger. And yet, religious imagery often accompanied these uprisings. Banners of saints were carried alongside fists of fury, as though the people were demanding not only earthly justice, but divine recognition of their plight. Hunger blurred the line between sacred and profane. One of the most famous examples came centuries later during the French Revolution, when the cry for bread merged with the cry for liberty. Women marched on Versailles, shouting, "Give us bread," as much as "Down with the king." But this spirit had long roots in medieval Europe, where bread riots prefigured larger revolts. They showed that hunger could topple not just bakers, but systems of power. Bread was never just a crust. It was a spark. There's also a kind of grim humor in these events. Chronicles describe bakers fleeing for their lives while crowds pelted them with their own loaves. Grain carts overturned spilled flour into the streets, where children played in it as if it were snow. What to us might seem like chaos carried a twisted form of carnival, a moment where the poor could laugh in the face of authority, if only briefly. Hunger was deadly serious, but rebellion brought with it a fleeting taste of freedom, of reversal, of justice, snatched from the jaws of despair. But bread riots rarely ended well. Authorities responded with harsh crackdowns, sending soldiers to restore order, punishing ringleaders with execution or exile. The system always reasserted itself, the poor always returned to their dark loaves, and hunger continued to gnaw at the edges of society. And yet, these riots left echoes. They proved that bread was more than an economic good. It was a political weapon, a bargaining chip, a symbol of dignity. To push people beyond the point of bread was to invite consequences rulers could not ignore. The lesson of these riots is simple. Bread defined the boundary between obedience and rebellion. As long as people had enough to eat, they endured hardship, injustice, even oppression. But take away their bread, and the very fabric of order unraveled. Bread was the cornerstone not only of diet, but of peace. And that truth made it a tool of power as much as of survival. But if bread riots revealed the fury of the people, they also revealed something else: how vulnerable bread itself was to manipulation. It was not only hunger or scarcity that drove people to revolt, it was also the sense that bread had been tampered with, corrupted, made false. And while riots were one answer, another answer grew quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. The cultural memory of bread as betrayal, a memory that shaped laws, prayers, and even superstitions for centuries to come. Bread was not only food in the medieval imagination, it was a vessel of mystery, a canvas for blessings and curses alike. To eat bread was to take in more than flour and water. It was to swallow the unseen forces of God, nature, and sometimes the devil. When bread made people sick, when it grew moldy too fast, or when it tasted inexplicably bitter, villagers did not blame bacteria or fungi, concepts centuries away from discovery. Instead, they whispered of curses, enchantments, or divine punishment. In the medieval world, a loaf could be more than stale. It could be cursed. Superstitions around bread began with its sacred role. The church had made bread the centerpiece of faith through the Eucharist, teaching that bread could become the very body of Christ. If bread could transform into divinity in the hands of a priest, then it could also transform into danger in the hands of a witch. People believed loaves could be bewitched to cause illness, sterility, or madness. A cracked crust might be read as an omen. A loaf that fell while baking could signal death in the household. Something so ordinary carried extraordinary weight in the medieval imagination. Stories circulated of bread that would not bake, dough that refused to rise no matter how long it rested. Housewives muttered that someone must have cursed their trough, or that a jealous neighbor had bewitched their flour. If bread burned too quickly or came out black, it was seen as a sign of evil at work. And when whole families grew sick after eating the same loaf, villagers sometimes accused bakers or neighbors of witchcraft, claiming the bread had been enchanted to harm them. Bread was both sacred and vulnerable, caught between blessing and curse. In some regions, bread was used as a protective charm. Travelers carried small pieces in their pockets to ward off demons or bad luck on the road. Mothers tucked crumbs into children's clothes to protect them from the evil eye. In other cases, bread was laid on the chest of the sick, not to feed them, but to draw out the illness like a sponge. These practices reveal how deeply people trusted bread as a mediator between the human and the supernatural. It could nourish, but it could also heal or harm. There is a curious comedy in some of these beliefs. Chronicles describe villagers spinning elaborate stories about loaves that refused to mold, claiming they were haunted, or about bread that cracked into shapes resembling devils, treated as a warning to repent. Imagine a family staring at a loaf with a crooked split across the crust, whispering that Satan had left his mark in the oven. In reality, it was no more than uneven heat, but in their minds, it was proof that bread itself carried messages from beyond. At the same time, bread was also used in rituals of justice. In some trials, accused persons were made to swallow consecrated bread to prove their innocence. If they choked, it meant guilt. If they swallowed, it meant God had spared them. Bread thus became a lie detector, a divine judge in edible form. But such rituals also fed superstition. A guilty man might claim that the bread itself had been cursed by enemies, turning even the act of swallowing into a contest of magical forces. The darker side of these beliefs came during times of famine and sickness. When whole villages suffered from contaminated bread, often from ergot fungus on rye, it was easier to blame curses than to face the randomness of nature. Victims who convulsed or hallucinated after eating were said to be possessed or punished. Loaves of rye bread were thrown into rivers to break the spell, as if water could wash away evil. Witches were accused of poisoning grain, and some were executed on nothing more than the claim that their bread had sickened neighbors. The tragedy was that superstition often punished the innocent while the real culprits, fungus, filth, and hunger, remained unchallenged. And yet, these beliefs gave people a sense of control in a world where so much was uncertain. If bread spoiled, they could blame an enemy or a spirit. If bread blessed them, they could thank God or a saint. To view bread as cursed or blessed was to make sense of survival in a landscape where chance and scarcity ruled. Faith and fear intertwined at every meal. Each crumb carried not just calories but meaning, and to eat was to take part in mysteries larger than oneself. But these superstitions had another consequence. They deepened the distrust between neighbors and classes. The poor often suspected the rich of hoarding the good bread and sending cursed loaves to the poor. Villagers accused millers and bakers of tampering with flour through witchcraft, not greed. Suspicion festered around the ovens, around the mills, around the granaries. Bread, instead of uniting, often divided, its curses driving wedges through already fragile communities. And if people feared curses hidden in their loaves, they also feared the hands that baked them. To eat bread was to trust the baker, and that trust was often thin. Which leads to the next betrayal of bread, not the invisible curse whispered about in superstition, but the very real manipulations of those who controlled ovens and scales, turning bread into a weapon of profit and power. Bread in the Middle Ages was never just bread. It was leverage. Those who controlled its production, sale, and distribution held the power to shape not only the market, but the daily lives of entire communities. And, among these figures, bakers stood in a strange position, simultaneously essential and mistrusted. To the people, bakers were providers of life's most necessary food. To the authorities, they were potential deceivers whose every scale and loaf had to be monitored. To themselves, they were businessmen balancing survival against the razor edge of hunger and profit. This fragile balance often tipped into manipulation, and when it did, bread became a weapon. Consider the assize of bread and ale in 13th century England, one of the earliest attempts to regulate food. It fixed the price of bread according to the price of wheat, ensuring loaves would remain affordable for the poor. But in practice, enforcement was uneven. Bakers could bake loaves slightly lighter than required, mix flour with cheaper substitutes like beans or acorns, or raise prices under the excuse of scarcity. For the hungry villager clutching his last coin, there was no bargaining power. To question the baker was to risk starvation, because even a dishonest loaf was better than no loaf at all. In this way, bakers wielded power not with swords, but with scales and ovens. And manipulation was not always subtle. Some bakers hoarded flour during lean harvests, waiting until prices rose, before releasing loaves to desperate buyers. Others colluded with millers, adjusting weights and measures to cheat customers who had no way of verifying the fraud. The poor saw their loaves shrink before their eyes, lighter in hand, smaller on the table, while the price remained the same. Resentment simmered, but dependence silenced revolt, until hunger grew too sharp and riots erupted. Bread, the symbol of survival, became the spark of fury precisely because people knew how easily it could be abused. But power was not only economic, it was symbolic. To hand someone bread was to assert control. Lords distributed loaves as part of charity rituals, reinforcing their role as protectors. The church gave bread at feast days or during famine, binding the faithful to its authority. Bakers themselves sometimes acted as arbiters of mercy or cruelty, deciding which families received their bread first when supplies ran thin. In these moments, bread was no longer food. It was favor, it was punishment, it was obedience demanded in edible form. There is a dark humor in this arrangement. Imagine a baker shaving ounces from his loaves, then donating a few charitable crusts to the poor, earning a reputation for generosity while lining his own pockets. The same act of baking could be cast as crime or as virtue, depending on who controlled the narrative. Bread, in the medieval imagination, was both holy and profane, sacred in church, yet suspect in the marketplace. The same loaf that symbolized Christ's body on the altar could symbolize corruption when weighed too lightly on a scale. The manipulation of bread also deepened social divides. Nobles and clergy had access to soft white loaves, while the poor gnawed on bitter dark ones. Bakers, under pressure to satisfy both markets, often diverted the best flour to the wealthy, leaving scraps for everyone else. This was not just business, it was a reinforcement of hierarchy. Each bite reminded the poor of their station, while each golden crust reminded the rich of their privilege. Bread was a daily reenactment of inequality written in flour and fire. And yet, bakers were not always villains. They too lived precariously, caught between the wrath of the people and the punishments of the law. A baker accused of cheating could face the pillory, prison, or worse. To survive, many walked a dangerous line, manipulating just enough to profit but not enough to be caught. Their ovens became battlegrounds where trust and suspicion clashed with every rising loaf. Bread may have fed bodies, but it also fueled tension, mistrust, and fear. Still, manipulation stretched beyond bakers. Kings and councils recognized bread's power and used it to control populations. By setting prices, rationing supplies, or opening granaries in times of famine, rulers turned bread into a tool of politics. A loaf could calm unrest, but it could also ignite revolt if denied. The phrase bread and circuses may belong to Rome, but the principle lived on in the medieval world. Feed the people and they obey, starve them and they rise. The cruelest irony was that those most manipulated by bread could never escape it. They depended on it too deeply. Peasants who suspected fraud still returned to the same bakers, the same markets, because what choice did they have? Grain was controlled by mills and ovens beyond their reach. Hunger chained them to the very system that exploited them. Bread was not only food, but fate, and those who controlled it controlled lives. And if manipulation in the marketplace was not enough, bread carried dangers even at the table. Beyond deceit, beyond politics, beyond profit, bread still carried silent poisons, molds, fungi, and toxins that no baker or lord could fully prevent. The greatest betrayal of bread was that even when it was bought fairly, baked honestly, and shared with gratitude, it could still kill quietly from within. Bread was trusted because it was daily, familiar, and sacred. Yet that trust made its betrayals all the more cruel. Hidden inside many medieval loaves were enemies no eye could see. Molds, spores, and toxins that thrived in the cracks of storage barns, in the dampness of dough left too long, in the very grains themselves. To the villagers who ate it, bread looked solid and safe. To us, with hindsight, it was a delivery system for invisible diseases. Every bite was a roll of the dice, and the body often lost. One of the most infamous culprits was ergot, the fungus that grew on rye and blended seamlessly into the harvest. Once baked into bread, its toxins unleashed nightmares on entire communities. Hallucinations, convulsions, burning sensations, and gangrenous limbs. Victims thought they were cursed, punished by saints, or possessed by demons. They were not wrong to see the hand of something invisible at work, only they lacked the knowledge to name it. In truth, it was chemistry, not sorcery, that twisted their bodies and minds. Ergotism became so notorious, it earned a chilling nickname, the fire of St. Anthony. To those who suffered, it felt like burning from the inside out. But ergot was only one danger. Mold that thrived in damp huts produced mycotoxins, poisons that attacked the liver and weakened the immune system. Families often cut away green or black patches, convinced they had removed the danger. But the toxins spread invisibly through the loaf, clinging to crumbs long after the fuzz was gone. People ate what they thought was safe, only to find themselves sick for reasons no one could explain. The result was a slow, creeping illness, the kind that drained strength without ever revealing its source. Bread became both healer and executioner, giving energy while planting seeds of decay. Imagine a child chewing on a piece of bread, his lips stained with soot from the oven, his eyes bright with hunger. Hours later he is doubled over in pain, his parents helpless to soothe him. They do not blame the bread. It is too sacred, too central to survival. Instead, they whisper about bad air, evil spirits, or sins that must be confessed. The true culprit sits unnoticed on the table, waiting to be eaten again tomorrow. In this way, bread's poisons were doubly cruel. They harmed the body and masked themselves beneath faith and superstition. Even when bread was not moldy, it could still betray. Poorly baked loaves, left damp in the center, allowed bacteria to thrive. What looked like fresh bread could turn into a breeding ground for sickness within hours. Villagers who devoured such loaves often fell ill together, whole families writhing from the same meal. Without understanding microbes, people imagined curses or witchcraft, but the truth was simpler and harsher. Their food was making them sick, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. There is an almost comic irony in how people rationalize these illnesses. Chronicles describe villagers who believed that bread that cracked strangely in the oven carried omens of death. Others feared loaves that grew mold too quickly were bewitched. Instead of recognizing natural decay, they turned bread into a mirror of their fears. In a way, they were right. Bread did carry messages, but not from demons or saints. The messages came from fungi and toxins, speaking a language no one could yet understand. The most terrifying part of these invisible diseases was their slowness. Unlike famine, which struck brutally and visibly, toxins eroded life quietly. They weakened bodies so that fevers struck harder, wounds healed slower, pregnancies failed more often. Bread kept people alive just enough to work, while undermining their strength year after year. Survival was never clean. It was compromised, always shadowed by decline. Bread promised life, but the fine print was written in sickness, and still no one abandoned it. Bread was too necessary, too ingrained in culture and faith. People continued to eat, continued to pray over loaves, continued to believe that their ailments came from fate, not from food. To question bread was to question existence itself. And so the cycle continued, each meal both a blessing and a risk, each crumb both salvation and poison. This paradox, bread as both sustenance and sickness, left deep marks on medieval society. It fueled superstitions, justified punishments, and deepened inequalities. The wealthy, with access to finer grains and fresher loaves, escaped much of the danger, while the poor bore the brunt of invisible toxins. Health itself became a matter of class, measured not in doctors or medicines, but in the color and texture of daily bread. But if fungi and toxins hid within loaves, so too did something else, a reflection of power, because the dangers of bread were not only natural, they were also man-made, tied to greed, neglect, and manipulation. The next betrayal of bread lay not in the spores hiding in the grain, but in the deliberate hands of those who controlled ovens and scales, twisting hunger into profit while leaving poison in every bite. Bread in the Middle Ages carried enough dangers from nature, mold, ergot, smoke, filth, but perhaps the cruelest betrayal was when human hands deliberately turned it into poison. Greed had a way of seeping into the flour as surely as water and yeast. In times when grain was scarce or prices high, some bakers and millers found it easier to cheat than to starve alongside their customers. They stretched flour with whatever was at hand, ground up beans or peas if they were honest, powdered chalk, clay, sand, or even plaster if they were not. These adulterations increased the weight, made the loaves look fuller, and padded the profits of those who dealt them. For the hungry villager, clutching a single coin, it meant paying for bread that was more stone than grain. Imagine the anger of biting into a loaf and feeling it crunch, not from crust, but from sand hidden in the dough. Teeth chipped, stomachs ached, and still people ate, because hunger demanded obedience. Bread adulterated with earth and grit wore down mouths, filled bellies without nourishing, and caused sickness that no one could trace. Yet complaints rarely mattered. The poor lacked the power to confront bakers, and even when regulations existed, enforcement was rare or corrupt. A baker caught cheating might be fined or humiliated in the pillory, but the damage was already done. The cheated loaves had been eaten, the profits pocketed, and the cycle of deceit prepared to start again. The fraud went deeper than just fillers. Some bakers used spoiled flour mixed with fresher stock, disguising moldy grain with spices, ashes, or soot to hide the smell. Others baked loaves with saltier crusts to mask bitterness, or brushed them with water to make them appear heavier when weighed. In some cities, inspectors tested bread in the marketplace, breaking loaves apart to check their weight and texture. But dishonest bakers often found ways to outwit even these checks, baking some loaves to standard while secretly selling lighter or adulterated ones to the desperate poor. Bread was survival, but it was also deception baked daily, disguised beneath its sacred crust. The cruelty of this practice becomes clearer when we realize who suffered most. The wealthy rarely bought bread directly from markets. They had private ovens, access to pure white flour, and servants who baked at home. It was the poor, the laborers and peasants, who bore the brunt of fraudulent bread. They were the ones forced to buy loaves of uncertain weight, to chew through grit and clay, to swallow sickness disguised as food. Bread, which was supposed to bind communities together, instead became the blade that cut them apart. There is a bitter humor in imagining a baker carefully measuring sand into his flour, muttering that he is feeding his customers more generously. In truth, he was feeding them deception. Villagers sometimes joked that their loaves could break a wall or that they were eating the earth itself, but laughter was only a mask. They knew they were being cheated, and they knew there was nothing they could do. Hunger silenced outrage, and the daily need for bread turned every villager into a captive customer of fraud. Authorities knew the temptation was strong, which is why bread laws were often stricter than laws about other foods. In England, the assize of bread fixed prices and weights, and in France, inspectors patrolled markets. Still, enforcement was uneven, and corruption meant many bakers escaped punishment. Some historians suggest that repeated bread riots were as much about fraud as about famine. People could endure hunger, but not the sense that they were being deliberately cheated out of their survival. To find stones in your loaf was to find stones in your stomach and fury in your heart. And this manipulation was not confined to bread alone. Ale, the other staple of medieval life, was equally subject to dilution and fraud. Together, bread and ale formed the backbone of diet, and together they were exploited by those who profited from scarcity. To control them was to control life, to corrupt them was to corrupt survival itself. Bread thus became not only a symbol of greed, but a weapon of power, wielded at the expense of the weak. The greatest tragedy is that such fraud often killed silently. Sand and clay destroyed teeth and guts. Spoiled grain carried sickness. Toxins disguised by spices or smoke weakened whole families. But because these deaths were slow, diffuse, and indistinguishable from the general misery of peasant life, they rarely provoked lasting justice. The baker might be mocked or shamed, but the system remained. Fraud became as much a part of bread as flour and water, and the poor paid the price in broken bodies and shortened lives. And yet, despite everything, people prayed over their bread, blessed it, and broke it together at the table. They clung to it not only as food, but as a ritual, a reminder of faith, a fragile hope that God's blessing could cleanse what greed had spoiled. In this way, bread remained both sacred and profane, a symbol of life, even when it carried death. But if fraud revealed the greed of men, another danger revealed the fragility of bread itself. Because even when bakers were honest, even when flour was pure, the elements conspired against the poor. Fire, water, and time all worked their own betrayals. The next peril of medieval bread lay not in deliberate fraud, but in the air itself, smoke, soot, and filth that clung to every loaf before it reached the table. The oven was supposed to be the purifier, the final safeguard that turned damp dough into safe, sustaining bread. In the medieval world, however, even fire itself could not always be trusted. Many communal ovens, especially those used by peasants, were filthy, smoke-choked chambers lined with soot from countless firings. Instead of cleansing, the fire carried its own poisons, embedding smoke, ash, and bitter residues into every crust. For people who had spent their last coin on a loaf, it was a cruel irony. The very flames meant to save them betrayed them with every bite. Step inside a medieval bakehouse in your imagination. The walls are blackened from years of smoke, and the ceiling drips tar like residue from green wood fires. The baker, drenched in sweat, feeds the oven with damp logs that hiss and spit instead of burning cleanly. Clouds of acrid smoke roll out, filling the room and seeping into the dough waiting nearby. When the loaves are finally shoved into the chamber, they do not emerge golden but nearly charred, their crusts bitter and blackened. What should have been the warmth of bread becomes a reminder of smoke inhaled and poison absorbed. We now know what villagers could only taste. That incomplete combustion of green wood releases creosote, tar, and fine particulates. These compounds coat food, damage lungs, and slowly poison the body. Bakers, exposed daily, coughed through their lives, their lungs lined with soot. Customers consumed the residue, swallowing invisible toxins with each mouthful. Bread filled stomachs, yes, but it also layered illness into the very people it was meant to strengthen. The betrayal was slow, insidious, and entirely hidden in the most ordinary of meals. There is an odd comedy in this, though it is dark. Imagine children joking that their bread was half wood, half smoke, gnawing on blackened crusts as though it were normal. Families learned to soak their loaves in broth or ale, not only to soften them, but to wash away the bitterness of soot. The smoky flavor that we now pay extra for in wood-fired restaurants was, to them, not luxury, but misery. Where we savor, they coughed. Where we seek novelty, they endured necessity. Bread that carried smoke was not gourmet, it was a burden. And ovens themselves were rarely cleaned. Layers of soot built up over years, flaking onto loaves or falling as ash into the fire. Rats sometimes nested in unused ovens, leaving droppings that baked into the next batch. The communal nature of peasant ovens made matters worse. Dozens of families used the same furnace, carrying in dough in dirty baskets, leaving behind crumbs, grease, and grime. Each firing added another layer of contamination. Bread became a sponge for the environment around it, soaking up every trace of filth long before it reached the table. The wealthy, as always, fared better. Noble households had private ovens, better fuel, and servants to clean and tend the fire. Their bread was lighter, cleaner, less smoky. The poor, meanwhile, trudged to communal ovens with their coarse dough, waiting in line for space in the choking haze, watching their meager loaves emerge as blackened as coal. The difference between the classes was baked directly into the crust, soft whiteness for the few, bitter darkness for the many. Inequality was not just tasted, it was inhaled with every smoky bite. This imbalance fed suspicion and resentment. Villagers whispered that bakers deliberately scorched bread to disguise adulterated flour, or that lords kept the best ovens for themselves, while peasants were forced to choke on soot. Bread became both sustenance and accusation, its blackened crusts a reminder of both poverty and deceit. The oven, meant to unite the community through shared baking, often deepened the divides that already marked medieval life. Yet, even in these grim conditions, bread retained its sacred place. Families broke their smoky loaves at the table, blessed them, and fed them to their children. Priests still raised them at altars, symbols of purity despite the filth. This tension between the sacred image of bread and the bitter reality of what it was defined medieval life. Faith demanded gratitude, even when the crust tasted of ashes. And gratitude was survival, because bitterness mattered less than hunger. Still, the dangers of smoky ovens were not only about health or taste, They shaped how people thought about bread itself. A loaf could never be trusted entirely, never taken at face value. It might carry soot, ash, or sickness along with sustenance, and this constant uncertainty gave bread a double edge. It was both life and threat, blessing and curse, sacred and profane. But ovens were only one stage in this endless cycle of betrayal. Once baked, bread still had to be stored, carried, and consumed. And in that journey from oven to table, it faced new dangers, mold creeping in, vermin gnawing through, time hardening it into stone. The story of bread did not end in the oven's fire. It continued into the shadows of storage huts and cellars where new perils waited to claim what hunger had barely won. Bread, once pulled from the oven, was never safe for long. In the medieval world, storage was not a matter of neat cupboards and sealed jars, but of dark huts, damp cellars, and wooden chests that offered little protection from time or nature. A loaf that left the oven steaming and fragrant could, within days, become the perfect playground for mold, insects, and vermin. Hunger may have been a constant, but so too was the steady march of decay, and families, who had sacrificed coin and labor for each loaf, were forced to fight a losing battle against spoilage they could neither understand nor control. Picture the home of a poor family. Their bread, baked once a week in the communal oven, sits stacked in a corner on wooden shelves. The air is damp from the thatched roof leaking during rain, and the smell of smoke lingers from the fire used for heat. Within a few days, green spots creep across the crust. By the week's end, the loaves are rock hard, their centers damp and sour-smelling, speckled with mold that blooms silently in the dark. Families did not throw such bread away. They couldn't afford to. They cut off the worst parts, scraped the fuzz, and carried on. But invisible toxins had already spread deep inside. To eat was to gamble, and to gamble was to survive. Rats were constant companions of bread. Drawn to the smell of grain and dough, they gnawed through sacks, nibbled loaves, and left droppings scattered in their wake. A family might wake to find half a loaf chewed hollow, its crust still intact, but its interior stolen by sharp little teeth. Sometimes they ate the bread anyway, shaking their heads in resignation. Hunger silenced disgust. Bread had to fill stomachs even when it had already filled bellies of rats the night before. The same loaf could feed both vermin and man, a grotesque kind of sharing forced by poverty. Insects, too, made their mark. Grain weevils often survived milling, their larvae hatching within stored loaves. Families cut into their bread to find wriggling infestations inside, or discovered that flour already carried the eggs before baking. To us, it sounds revolting. To them, it was life. Some villagers even joked that insects added protein to their meals, a bleak humor masking their lack of choice. Bread, once pure symbol of God's blessing, often became a reminder that humans were not the only creatures depending on it for survival. Mold carried dangers far beyond appearance. While green fuzz or black spots could be scraped away, the poison seeped invisibly through the loaf. Mycotoxins attacked the liver, weakened immune systems, and brought on chronic sickness. Yet no one could trace their ailments back to the bread. They blamed bad air, curses, or divine judgment. Bread was sacred, and to accuse it was unthinkable. So the cycle repeated. Moldy loaves were eaten, sickness followed, and faith bore the blame instead of fungi. Even wealthier households struggled with storage, though their loaves lasted longer. They kept bread in larger pantries or stone cellars, which were cooler and drier, but even there, pests found a way. Cats prowled kitchens not for comfort, but as guardians against rodents. Servants sifted flour daily to chase out insects. And yet, no one could entirely escape the creeping advance of spoilage. Bread was universal in its betrayal, even if the poor suffered it more deeply. The irony is that medieval people often treated bread as indestructible. Hardened loaves were not discarded but repurposed, soaked in broth, turned into sops to thicken stews, or crumbled into animal feed. Even when mold spotted its crust, people cut carefully and ate the rest. Bread was too sacred, too expensive to waste. The refusal to throw it away, while practical, also deepened exposure to toxins. What we would discard without hesitation, they consumed with prayers. Survival demanded it, even as survival slowly eroded health. There's a dark humor in imagining a medieval mother scolding her children. Don't waste the bread, scrape the mold, as though fungi were no more serious than dirt on boots. For them, waste was the greater sin. Better to eat mold than to face starvation. Bread was not just food, it was a moral object, bound to faith and necessity. Throwing it away felt like throwing away God's gift, even when that gift hid sickness beneath its crust. But bread did not only rot in homes. It rotted in granaries, markets, and storehouses, where entire stocks spoiled at once. In famine years, when every crumb mattered, discovering that sacks of grain or stacks of loaves had molded was catastrophic. Villages faced not just hunger but despair, knowing their lifeline had been eaten by forces they could not fight. Mold became as much an enemy as rats, famine, or war. And in those moments, bread revealed its most bitter truth. It could vanish not only through consumption but through decay. Still, people clung to it. They prayed over moldy loaves, blessed them, trusted that God would neutralize what their knives could not. Bread remained the cornerstone of diet, the focus of ritual, the measure of life itself. Its betrayals were constant, but so was its necessity. People accepted its dangers because to reject bread was to reject survival. And so they endured, breaking loaves that smelled sour, chewing crusts that carried filth, swallowing faith along with fungus. Yet bread's journey was not finished in the home. After baking, after storage, after mold and vermin, it was still carried into the wider world, into taverns, into monasteries, into battlefields. And in those places, bread took on meanings beyond nourishment. It became a tool of politics, of charity, of war itself. The story of bread was never confined to kitchens or ovens. It stretched into every sphere of medieval life, where its presence or its absence could shape the destiny of nations. Bread has always been political, but in the Middle Ages it was the very heartbeat of power. Kings, lords, councils, and bishops knew that controlling the supply of bread meant controlling the people themselves. It was not simply food, it was leverage, obedience baked into a crust, dependence measured by the loaf. When people had bread, they endured heavy taxes, endless wars, and social inequality. When bread disappeared, patience snapped, markets erupted, and rebellion flared. In this sense, bread was more powerful than swords or sermons. It was the quiet dictator of medieval society, and those in charge understood that its absence could topple them faster than any foreign army. Rulers often used bread to display their generosity, feeding the poor during famine years, opening granaries with a flourish, or distributing loaves during festivals. These acts were not pure kindness, they were political theater. To hand out bread was to remind the people that survival flowed through the ruler's hands. The king who fed his people was loved, the lord who hoarded grain was hated. Bread was the stage upon which legitimacy was won or lost. Even the church joined in, doling out bread at monastery gates to strengthen its moral authority. Each loaf was a sermon, each crust a covenant of loyalty. But bread was also manipulated through regulation. Councils set laws fixing the price and weight of loaves, tying them directly to the market price of grain. These laws were meant to protect the poor, but they also served as tools of control. A baker who sold underweight loaves was punished not just for dishonesty, but for destabilizing the social order. Bread was too important to be left to market chaos. It had to be policed, measured, and enforced, because people would riot over bread long before they rioted over taxes. Authorities understood this and kept one eye on the ovens at all times. The irony, of course, is that manipulation often deepened suffering. In years of bad harvests, rulers sometimes forced bakers to maintain low prices to prevent unrest. On the surface, this looked like justice. In practice, it bankrupted bakers and drove bread underground, where it was hoarded, smuggled, or sold at inflated prices in secret. The poor, once again, bore the brunt. Bread was supposed to unite, but political meddling often fractured society even more. There is a strange humor in how openly bread was used as a bargaining chip. Chronicles tell of lords who promised loaves in exchange for loyalty, or mayors who calmed riots by ordering bakers to distribute free bread in the market square. Imagine the scene. An angry mob ready to storm the town hall suddenly pacified by a rain of loaves tossed from carts. The bread itself became a weapon, not swung, but handed over. Hunger was a chain, and rulers tightened or loosened it as suited their needs. This manipulation was not limited to famine years. Bread shaped everyday politics too. In some cities, the right to use communal ovens was tied to loyalty to the local lord or abbey. Villagers who resisted authority might find themselves barred from baking, a punishment harsher than prison because without access to ovens, families starved. Bread was not only sustenance, it was a leash. Those who controlled the fire controlled obedience. And yet, bread could also be a weapon against power. When authorities failed, people took bread into their own hands. Bread riots erupted when prices rose unfairly or when bakers were caught hoarding flour. These riots were not about greed, but about justice, about reclaiming bread that had been stolen by manipulation. Women often led them, storming bakeries and granaries, demanding loaves at honest prices. Bread was the people's line in the sand, the point at which endurance broke and fury spilled into the streets. The symbolism of bread as politics even reached into religion. The Eucharist taught that bread was sacred, divine, untouchable, but at the marketplace, bread was manipulated, shrunk, and adulterated. This contradiction shaped medieval thought. How could bread be holy in the church and corrupt in the streets? The answer, for many, was that holiness depended on who controlled it. Priests blessed loaves as Christ's body, while rulers used loaves to buy loyalty. In both cases, bread was power. And the ultimate lesson was clear. Hunger makes people pliable. A ruler who could guarantee bread kept his throne secure. A baker who cheated risked public wrath. A priest who blessed bread reinforced faith. Bread was never neutral. It was always political, always manipulative, always caught between survival and control. To eat it was not only to feed the body, but to submit, willingly or unwillingly, to the structures of power. But if bread was a weapon in politics, it was also a battlefield in war. Armies marched not only on courage, but on bread, and entire campaigns depended on whether soldiers were fed or starved. Bread decided victories as surely as swords, and its absence often spelled disaster. The next betrayal of bread lay not in the market or the monastery, but on the battlefield, where loaves became as critical as armor and arrows. On the battlefield, bread was as important as the sword. Wars might be won with steel, but they were sustained with crusts. Soldiers did not march on glory alone, they marched on rations, and the most crucial ration of all was bread. In castles, in encampments, in muddy fields far from home, loaves or hard biscuits determined whether an army stood strong or collapsed into weakness. Bread was the fuel of conquest, and the silent ally or betrayer of every campaign. A soldier's ration was often meager. Instead of fresh, soft loaves, armies carried hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit baked until nearly indestructible. It could last months, even years, without rotting, but eating it was another matter. Hardtack was so tough that soldiers joked it could stop an arrow better than a shield. Many softened it by soaking in ale or stew. Others smashed it with rocks before attempting to chew. Yet, despite its cruelty to teeth and jaws, hard bread kept men alive in places where nothing else could. Its very hardness was its value. It endured as long as the march required. But even these rations betrayed. Hardtack often crawled with weevils, small insects that hatched inside the flour before baking. Soldiers learned to dunk their biscuits in water to drive the creatures out, shaking them free before swallowing. Others simply ate them whole, reasoning that a little extra meat was better than nothing. Hunger blurred disgust. In moments of desperation, bread and insect became indistinguishable, swallowed together under the shadow of war. Sieges made the role of bread even more dramatic. In a besieged city, grain was hoarded, and ovens became sites of both hope and despair. At first, citizens ate loaves rationed carefully, but as weeks stretched into months, bread grew darker, harder, more adulterated. Chronicles described flour mixed with sawdust, bark, or ground bones, baked into loaves that barely resembled food. People ate them anyway, because to refuse meant death. In some cases, when grain ran out entirely, bread disappeared altogether, replaced by roots, rats, or worse. To lose bread in a siege was to lose humanity itself, and surrender often followed. There was also a political dimension to military bread. Commanders who ensured steady rations earned loyalty. Those who failed faced mutiny. Armies could forgive hardship, mud, or bloodshed, but they could not forgive empty stomachs. Bread was not only survival, but discipline. A well-fed army was obedient. A starving one turned restless and dangerous. In this way, loaves and biscuits became tools of command as much as whips or banners. Ironically, bread sometimes doubled as a weapon. During sieges, attackers cut off supplies of grain, knowing hunger would do what swords could not. Breadless defenders grew weak, their morale collapsing as surely as their bodies. To starve an enemy was to conquer him without striking a blow. Bread became a siege engine in its own right. Absence turned into a weapon sharper than steel. There's a grim humor in imagining weary soldiers gnawing on biscuits so hard they joked about sharpening them into arrowheads. War had already stripped life of its comforts, and bread added insult to injury. Yet those same loaves, despised in the moment, were the thin line that kept men marching, fighting, and bleeding on foreign soil. Bread was the most hated friend of the medieval soldier, cursed and blessed in equal measure. And yet, the soldier's relationship with bread was not only about survival, it was also about memory. Veterans returning from campaigns carried home tales of loaves eaten in mud, biscuits gnawed in rain, crusts shared in desperation. Bread became a symbol of endurance, a story retold in taverns and by firesides. For them, bread was war incarnate, dry, bitter, unforgiving, but enduring all the same. But bread in war had another consequence. It blurred the lines between classes. On the battlefield, noble and peasant alike often ate the same ration. The lord who once dined on white loaves at his manor found himself chewing the same rock-hard biscuit as the man-at-arms beside him. Hunger was the great equalizer, and in the smoke of battle, bread revealed that war made all men humble, at least at the table. Still, the betrayal of bread on the battlefield did not end with soldiers. War also shaped the bread of those left behind. The wives, children, and elders who waited in villages stripped of grain. Armies consumed harvests, left fields bare, and requisitioned ovens. For the people at home, war meant eating crusts thinner, loaves smaller, and hunger sharper. Bread in war was never confined to the front lines. It reached deep into the hearths of those who never raised a sword. And that is the cruelest truth. Bread was not just a soldier's ration, but a weapon of war against civilians. Armies starved their enemies by stealing grain, burning fields, or blocking trade routes. Entire populations became pawns in the struggle for loaves. Bread was no longer just survival, it was strategy, and its absence carved scars across generations. Yet even in this bleak picture, bread endured as a symbol of hope. When peace returned, when ovens lit again, when families broke fresh loaves together, Bread became the sign that life could begin anew. The memory of bitter biscuits made the softness of a new loaf sweeter still. War proved again and again that bread was not only food but fate. And if war revealed bread's role as both savior and betrayer, peace revealed yet another side. Because beyond hunger, beyond politics, beyond the battlefield, bread carried meaning that reached into the spiritual. It was not only survival for the body, but sustenance for the soul, and nowhere was that more evident than in the sacred rituals, where bread ceased to be bread at all and became something divine. Bread was not just nourishment in the Middle Ages, it was the most sacred symbol of all. In the eyes of the faithful, bread was never merely crust and crumb, it was mystery, ritual, and divine presence. The very act of baking, breaking, and eating bread carried layers of meaning that blurred the line between survival and salvation. To eat bread was to feed the body, but in church, it was to feed the soul. This duality gave bread a power no other food possessed. It was humble and holy, ordinary and transcendent, a symbol that bound heaven to earth. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Eucharist. When the priest raised the host above the altar, the congregation believed they were witnessing a miracle, bread transformed into the body of Christ. This was not metaphor but reality, taught with solemnity by the Church. The finest, whitest loaves were reserved for this purpose, baked with great care, their purity meant to mirror divine perfection. For peasants who lived on bitter, dark bread at home, the contrast was overwhelming. To receive a fragment of the Holy Host, a sliver of bread lighter and purer than anything they could ever afford, was to taste eternity in their mouths. The symbolism cut both ways. It inspired awe, but it also reminded the poor of the vast gulf between the sacred and their daily hunger. Bread's sacred role extended beyond the altar. Families blessed their loaves at the table before eating, believing that a prayer could protect them from sickness or spoilage. Some placed the sign of the cross over dough before it went into the oven, as if to invite God's blessing to rise with the yeast. Bread was even used in folk rituals, crumbs placed under pillows to ward off nightmares, or loaves carried into fields to ensure a good harvest. The act of breaking bread together was not just a meal, but a ritual of unity, a visible sign of bonds between kin, neighbors, or even strangers. But this sacredness carried a shadow. If bread could embody Christ, then bread could also embody betrayal. A moldy loaf could be read as a sign of sin in the household. Bread that failed to rise might mean a curse. In times of famine, when loaves grew smaller and more bitter, people wondered whether God himself had turned his face away. Bread was not neutral. It was a divine barometer. Its presence meant blessing. Its absence meant punishment. Faith was kneaded into every crust, even when that crust cut the gums and poisoned the stomach. The symbolism of bread also shaped law and justice. Oaths were sworn over bread, disputes settled by breaking and sharing it. In some villages, bread was used in trial rituals, where the accused ate consecrated loaves to prove innocence, believing that God would cause the guilty to choke. Bread thus carried authority beyond the church, binding not only souls, but communities. It was contract, testimony, and judgment, all disguised as food. There is something deeply ironic in this dual role. For the poor, bread at home was often gray, bitter, and full of grit, a daily struggle to chew and digest. Yet in church, bread became spotless, perfect, holy. The same word, bread, carried both extremes. Perhaps it is no wonder that bread dominated their imagination. It was the one thing they could never escape, whether in hunger, in faith, or in ritual. Bread was God's gift, but also man's burden, sacred in symbol, yet dangerous in substance. Even humor found its place in this tension. Medieval jokes survive about monks eating their fill of holy bread while pretending piety, or peasants teasing that their coarse loaves must be half devil since only white bread was divine. Beneath the laughter lay resignation. Bread revealed the truth of society more clearly than sermons. What one man called holy, another called hunger. But the very fact that bread held such symbolic weight meant it could also be manipulated. Priests could reinforce obedience by controlling who received it. Lords could demonstrate mercy by distributing it. Communities could heal divisions by breaking it together. Bread was not just sustenance or symbol, it was power. And power, like hunger, was never evenly shared. If bread as a sacred symbol bound the people to heaven, it also bound them to the structures of earth. It taught them to endure hunger as divine testing, to see spoiled loaves as curses, to trust that salvation was hidden in a crumb of white wafer. Yet even as bread carried their prayers upward, it also carried new dangers downward, because the holiness of bread did not erase its physical betrayals. A loaf could still carry disease, fraud, or fire, even as it carried faith. And that collision between the sacred and the profane made bread the most paradoxical food of the medieval world. For in the end, bread was both miracle and menace, salvation and suffering. And as people clung to it in faith, they also feared it in life. The next chapter in bread's story was not written in churches, but in kitchens and markets where ordinary loaves, dark, coarse, and bitter, continued to reveal just how fragile survival truly was. Famine in the Middle Ages was not simply the absence of food. It was the slow erosion of hope, and bread was always at its center. When harvests failed, when rains drowned the fields or drought cracked the earth, bread was the first thing people thought of, the last thing they begged for. The sight of an empty oven, of shelves bare of loaves, was not only hunger, but despair itself, for bread was more than food. It was the daily promise that life could continue. Without it, survival seemed unthinkable. A missing loaf was not just a gap on the table. It was a wound in the spirit. Chronicles tell us that during the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, people scoured fields for roots, bark, and weeds to grind into their dough. Bread became an imitation of itself, gray lumps of desperation that barely resembled food. Some loaves were mixed with ground-up acorns or straw, which filled the stomach but offered no nourishment. Others were padded with clay or powdered earth, transforming sustenance into slow poison. Families gathered around these loaves, knowing they were harmful, but chewing anyway, because the alternative was starvation. Each bite was both an act of survival and a reminder of their despair. The symbolism of bread during famine was crushing. In ordinary times, breaking bread at the table was an act of unity, a ritual of blessing. In famine years, bread became an accusation. To break a loaf was to ask, who will eat and who will go without? A family with only one small crust had to decide whether to divide it into thin slices for all or give it to the children while parents went hungry. Bread no longer united. It divided, forcing choices no one should face. Hunger gnawed not only at stomachs, but at bonds of trust, loyalty, even love. Markets during famine were places of tension and fear. Prices of loaves soared beyond reason, and people rioted when they could not afford them. Bakers became targets of suspicion, accused of hoarding flour or cheating on weights. Grain convoys were attacked, carts overturned, and loaves seized by mobs. The cry for bread echoed through the streets, louder than the cry for justice or freedom. Hunger made bread the only currency worth fighting for, the only political demand that mattered. And rulers, terrified of revolt, sometimes ordered free bread distributions to calm the fury. Yet such gestures were fleeting. Once the loaves were gone, hunger returned with sharper teeth. There's a cruel irony in how famine revealed bread's sacred place. In churches, priests still raised white wafers in the Eucharist, symbols of Christ's eternal body, while outside, peasants gnawed on crusts of bark and weeds. The contrast was unbearable. For the faithful, famine became a test of belief. Was the absence of bread divine punishment, a curse for sins, or simply proof that God had abandoned them? Bread, once the sign of blessing, became a mirror of despair, showing how fragile faith could be when bellies were empty. Even humor, that fragile defense against misery, turned bitter in famine. Some joked that their bread was so thin it could pass for paper, or so dark it could be mistaken for coal. Others teased that they had eaten so much bark they were half-tree themselves. But behind the laughter was grief. Bread had betrayed them, and jokes were all that remained to soften the truth. The health consequences of famine bread were devastating. Malnourished bodies could not resist disease, and epidemics often followed on famine's heels. Weakened by months of eating loaves that were more filler than food, people succumbed to illnesses that might otherwise have spared them. Bread, even in its corrupted form, kept them alive just long enough to fall victim to plague or fever. In this way, famine was not a single disaster, but a chain reaction, each link tied to the absence of proper bread. And yet, bread and famine also carried strange forms of hope. Chronicles tell of mothers who saved a final crust for weeks, hidden away as a kind of talisman, never eaten but kept as a symbol that life might one day return to normal. Children were promised bread as a story, a dream, something to cling to through hunger's long nights. Bread became more than food. It became imagination, the picture of survival still possible, if only tomorrow would come. But famine also changed how people remembered bread afterward. When good harvest returned, the memory of famine loaves haunted them. Families stored more grain than they needed, hoarded loaves, and prayed longer prayers before eating. The trauma of hunger clung to them, shaping traditions and superstitions for generations. Bread was never taken for granted again. It was handled with reverence, feared for its absence as much as cherished for its presence. And famine revealed one final truth. Bread was never truly safe, never guaranteed. Nature could snatch it away with a storm, a drought, or a swarm of insects. In famine years, bread proved itself not only the symbol of despair, but the measure of human fragility. And when people rose from those years, they carried with them not only scars of hunger, but a sharpened sense that bread, no matter how ordinary, was the true heartbeat of life. Yet even famine was not the last betrayal in bread's long story. For beyond hunger and scarcity, beyond mold and fraud, there remained one final cruelty, that bread, the very foundation of survival, could still be turned against life by the hands of men in ways darker than famine itself. Bread was not only the food of the living, it was also the companion of the dead. In the medieval world, where mortality was never far from sight, loaves accompanied funerals, burials, and rituals of remembrance. To place bread at a table was to affirm life, but to place it at a grave was to confront its end. People believed that bread could nourish not only the body, but also the soul, carrying prayers across the boundary between the living and the departed. And in this way, even bread became a reminder that all who ate would one day be eaten by time. At funerals, bread was often distributed to mourners. Families baked special loaves to hand out to those who attended, both as a gesture of hospitality and as an act of charity for the soul of the deceased. In some regions, it was customary for these loaves to be blessed before being given away, so that each bite carried a prayer for the dead. Eating funeral bread was not indulgence, it was obligation. The living took the loaf into themselves, symbolically sharing the burden of grief, while also easing the passage of the departed. To chew such bread was to participate in mourning with one's teeth and tongue, to turn sorrow into sustenance. In certain traditions, loaves were placed directly on the coffin or even into the grave. These offerings were meant to feed the dead on their journey, to assure that hunger would not follow them into the next world. Archaeological finds confirm that bread or bread-like offerings sometimes accompanied burials, testifying to this ancient belief in its protective power. To us, it may seem like superstition, but to them it was as natural as packing provisions for a long trip. Bread was life on earth, and so it must also be life beyond. There's a strange mixture of reverence and comedy in some of these practices. Chronicles describe mourners jostling for funeral loaves, treating them as valuable gifts rather than solemn tokens. Some poor villagers even attended funerals of people they did not know, just to collect the bread distributed there. In these moments, the line between grief and hunger blurred completely. Bread, even at the threshold of death, was still currency, still survival, still fought over by the living. Superstitions grew around funeral bread. Some believed that to refuse it was bad luck, inviting death to visit your own home. Others thought crumbs from such loaves carried protective power, guarding houses from spirits if scattered on doorsteps. In darker tales, people whispered that if funeral bread was not properly blessed, it could carry misfortune, spreading sorrow instead of easing it. Bread, in these stories, was not only food for the soul, but a vessel of fate, a fragile link between this world and the next. Bread also played a role in rituals of remembrance long after funerals ended. On certain feast days, loaves were baked in honor of the dead, sometimes marked with crosses or symbols, and shared among family and neighbors. To break such bread was to invite the presence of ancestors to the table to ensure they were not forgotten. Each crumb became a memory, each loaf a bond between generations. The taste of bread kept the dead alive in the mouths of the living. The church, of course, sanctified and regulated these practices. Funeral masses often included the blessing of bread, reinforcing its sacred role. But the overlap between folk belief and official ritual was blurry. Some priests condemned superstitions about loaves and graves, while others tolerated them as harmless gestures of comfort. In truth, both the church and the people understood the same thing. Bread was too central to life, not to be included in death. Its presence at funerals was inevitable, whether as holy symbol or humble offering. There's an almost chilling poetry in imagining a medieval table after a funeral, mourners eating loaves baked in memory of the dead, chewing slowly, their mouths filled not only with bread but with grief itself. Every bite reminded them that life and death were inseparable, that bread sustained the body only temporarily. Today's loaf might feed you, but tomorrow's could be offered in your memory. Bread was both comfort and warning, a reminder that hunger was eternal, whether in the belly or in the grave. And famine sharpened this symbolism even further. In years of scarcity, when bread was rare, funeral loaves became even more precious. Families sacrificed part of their dwindling flour to bake them, choosing to honor the dead even as the living starved. It was an act of defiance against despair, a statement that tradition and dignity would not be erased by hunger. But it was also a bitter irony. Bread offered to honor a death could hasten another, when every crumb was needed for survival. Bread, then, was as present in death as it was in life. It stood at the altar and at the grave, on the feast table and in the tomb. It was blessing, burden, sustenance, and symbol. And because it carried all these meanings, it was never free from suspicion. If bread could honor the dead, it could also betray the living. If it could connect heaven and earth, it could also carry hidden curses. Which is why, in the shadow of funeral loaves, darker stories began to spread. Stories of bread not as blessing, but as vessel of malevolence, cursed or bewitched, capable of carrying death long before the grave. Bread had always been sacred, but in the medieval imagination, it could just as easily turn sinister. If it could symbolize Christ's body at the altar, then surely it could also carry the touch of demons or witches in the marketplace. In a world where famine, sickness, and sudden death were constant companions, it was easy to see bread not only as a gift from heaven, but also as a vessel for curses. A loaf that spoiled too quickly, a crust that cracked in strange patterns, or a meal that left a family sick could all be explained the same way. Someone had bewitched the bread. Whispers about cursed loaves circulated from village to village. A jealous neighbor, it was said, could knead malice into dough or sprinkle ashes from a grave into flour to poison a rival's family. Witches were accused of baking charms into bread, using herbs, bones, or animal parts hidden in the dough. Some believed that if an enemy touched your loaf before you ate it, they could transfer misfortune into your household. Suspicion could flare from something as small as a stomachache after a meal, and soon accusations spread like wildfire. In communities already burdened by hunger, bread became both sustenance and scapegoat. Superstitions often turned ordinary accidents into omens. If dough refused to rise, villagers might say a spell had been cast. If bread fell from the table, it was seen as a sign that death would soon visit the home. A loaf with an unusual crack could be read as a curse aimed at the family, its broken crust mirroring a future calamity. Even mold could take on supernatural meaning. Green fuzz on a loaf was not just spoilage, but evidence of evil hands meddling with nature. These beliefs, however irrational, offered explanations in a world without science, where invisible forces ruled daily life. Rituals grew up to counter such fears. Before baking, some women would carve a cross into the dough, believing it would drive away curses and invite God's blessing. Families made the sign of the cross over loaves before cutting them, as though to seal out hidden dangers. In some places, pieces of bread were dipped in holy water and fed to animals, testing whether sickness followed. If the animal fell ill, the loaf was declared cursed, and the blame often fell on the nearest suspected witch. Bread was never neutral. It was either blessing or blight. There's a grim humor in imagining medieval villagers tiptoeing around their loaves, treating them like magical traps rather than food. Children might joke that a loaf was watching them if the crust cracked like a face, or laugh nervously when a neighbor's bread turned black in the oven, whispering that the devil had touched it. But laughter carried unease. Everyone knew that bread, the cornerstone of survival, could just as easily betray them if fate, or malice, willed it. The darker side of these beliefs often led to tragedy. Women, especially widows or healers, were accused of cursing bread simply because their neighbors fell ill after sharing a meal. Trials and executions sometimes followed, based on nothing more than a spoiled loaf. In this way, bread became evidence in witchcraft accusations, its cracks and molds treated as proof of malevolent power. The very food that symbolized unity could divide communities, turning ovens into battlegrounds of fear and suspicion. Even the church both reinforced and complicated these fears. Priests blessed loaves during certain feasts, teaching that sacred bread could protect families from curses. At the same time, they warned that the devil might seek to corrupt bread, turning it into a weapon against the faithful. This tension, between holy bread at the altar and cursed bread in the hut, kept people constantly aware that every meal might be more than it seemed. To eat bread was to trust not only the baker, but the invisible powers hovering around it. The irony is that many so-called curses were likely the result of natural poisons in bread, ergot in rye, mold in damp loaves, or grit from adulteration. But without knowledge of fungi or toxins, people saw only malevolence. When whole families convulsed after a meal, it was easier to imagine witchcraft than to blame invisible fungus. Cursed bread explained the unexplainable, even if it condemned the innocent. And yet, fear of cursed bread also gave rise to customs of reverence. Bread was never to be thrown on the ground, never to be wasted, never to be cut carelessly. To mistreat it risked attracting curses of its own. In this way, superstition reinforced respect. Even in fear, bread was handled with care. The loaf was always more than food. It was destiny wrapped in crust. But if bread was feared as a vessel of curses, it was also invoked in blessings, oaths, and rituals of protection. For every loaf suspected of carrying evil, another was prayed over, consecrated, or broken in the name of unity. Bread's power lay in its duality. It could save or destroy, bind or divide, heal or kill. And in the next chapter of its story, this duality became even sharper, as bread was not only feared for curses, but revered as medicine, believed to hold healing powers far beyond its humble ingredients. In the medieval world, bread was more than food and more than symbol. It was also medicine. At a time when doctors leaned as heavily on prayers as on remedies, people turned to bread not only to fill their stomachs, but to heal their bodies. It absorbed ailments, drew out poisons, soothed fevers, and guarded against nightmares. Loaves and crumbs became part of the medieval pharmacy, where the line between cure and charm blurred into a single ritual act. Bread was the hospital and the chapel baked into one. One common belief was that bread could draw sickness out of the body. A warm loaf, fresh from the oven, might be pressed against a swollen limb or aching joint, the heat thought to pull the pain into the bread. Parents laid pieces of bread on children's chests to ease coughs or placed crumbs on wounds to extract infection. The logic was simple. Bread fed life, so it could also absorb death. And while we now know that warmth can indeed soothe muscles, for them, the act was more mystical, an exchange of life force between bread and body. Bread also entered the realm of charms. In parts of Europe, crumbs were placed beneath pillows to ward off bad dreams or demonic visitations. Sick animals were fed bits of blessed bread to protect herds from disease. Travelers carried crusts in their pockets as talismans against misfortune, believing that as long as bread was near, hunger and danger would keep their distance. Even the act of sharing bread was considered protective, as though the bond of eating together created a shield against illness and betrayal. The church reinforced these practices by blessing bread during feast days and festivals. These loaves, sprinkled with holy water or prayed over by priests, were believed to carry divine healing power. Families carefully saved pieces of blessed bread, crumbling them into broths for the sick or storing them in chests to protect the home. Some even mixed the crumbs with wine as a cure for fevers or stomach ailments. The power of bread as medicine was inseparable from its role as symbol of the sacred. To consume it was to consume a fragment of God's grace. But medicine was not always holy. It could also be practical. Hardened loaves, too tough to eat, were ground into powders and mixed with herbs for poultices. Bread soaked in vinegar was pressed onto the forehead to cool fevers. Crumbs steeped in milk were used as remedies for stomach pain. These treatments often blended observation with superstition. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but the faith placed in them gave comfort regardless. In an age without antibiotics or antiseptics, bread became a kind of universal ingredient, part of almost every remedy. There is a dark comedy in some of these cures. Chronicles describe people swallowing ashes mixed with bread as protection against plague, or eating loaves baked with strange herbs prescribed by local healers. Imagine the taste, bitter, smoky, hardly edible, and yet consumed with hope. Bread, even in its most unappetizing forms, remained the vessel through which healing was expected to arrive. When medicine failed, at least bread carried the illusion of care. And sometimes that illusion mattered more than the cure itself. A sick child given bread dipped in honey and blessed by a priest might not recover, but the family believed they had done all they could. Bread carried their love, their faith, their desperation. It was not just a remedy. It was a ritual of hope. The act of giving bread to the sick was as important as the bread itself. Still, bread as medicine carried risks. Moldy loaves used in poultices sometimes worsened infections instead of healing them. Crumbs kept too long as charms became breeding grounds for insects. Remedies born of desperation could easily backfire, turning medicine into poison. Yet families clung to these practices because bread was all they had. It was accessible, familiar, and infused with meaning. If God had placed bread at the center of life, surely he had hidden cures inside it too. This belief shaped how people saw illness. Sickness was not just a physical problem, but a spiritual one, and bread was the bridge between those worlds. To eat, to press, to bless, to crumble, these were not medical treatments alone, but acts of faith, prayers in edible form. And so bread became the most trusted doctor, even when it failed more often than it healed. But this trust also carried irony. For while bread was used to heal, it was often the very source of illness, carrying fungi, toxins, and adulterations that made people sick in the first place. The same loaf that soothed a fever might have caused it. The same crumb that was blessed as a charm might also harbor poison. Bread's role as medicine was as double-edged as its role as food. Salvation and betrayal kneaded into the same crust. And that duality never disappeared. Because bread, in all its forms, continued to hold one more role beyond food, symbol, or medicine. It was also memory, woven into folklore, superstition, and ritual, shaping how people remembered their struggles and taught future generations about hunger and hope. Bread did not only heal the body, it carried the stories of suffering and survival themselves. Bread was not only sustenance, symbol, and medicine, it was wisdom. Across the medieval world, bread appeared in proverbs, tales, and folklore, shaping how people thought about morality, survival, and community. If scripture and sermons taught one kind of lesson, bread itself taught another. Through the sayings whispered by grandmothers, the warnings muttered in taverns, and the stories told around hearths where loaves cooled on rough wooden boards. Wisdom, it seemed, was baked into every crust. One of the most enduring proverbs was simple. Bread is life. This phrase carried no exaggeration. In a time when bread made up 60-80% of a peasant's diet, it was the literal truth. But the saying was more than nutritional. It was philosophical. To break bread was to affirm existence. To lack bread was to acknowledge despair. In village talk, to say someone had no bread meant not only hunger, but ruin, misfortune, or even moral failure. Bread became shorthand for survival itself, a metaphor that seeped into every layer of speech. Folklore also linked bread to justice. Stories told of greedy bakers who cheated customers only to find their loaves cursed, dough refusing to rise, ovens collapsing, or bread turning to stone. These tales served as moral warnings, teaching that dishonesty in bread was dishonesty against life itself, and that God would not tolerate it. In one tale, a baker shrank the size of his loaves to save money, and when he died, his soul was doomed to carry an enormous loaf on his back through eternity. The lesson was clear. Bread remembered and bread avenged. Superstitions wrapped themselves into everyday sayings. Don't cut bread backwards, or misfortune will follow. Never waste a crumb, or you insult God. If bread falls to the ground, kiss it before eating, or you risk angering the saints. These small rituals and phrases reinforced a worldview where bread carried moral weight. Even the way it was sliced or shared became a reflection of character. Proverbs taught that selfish men tore bread roughly, while generous men cut it evenly. To observe bread was to observe the soul. Bread sayings also revealed social truths. Better dry bread with peace than roast with quarrel was a common expression, reminding listeners that harmony mattered more than luxury. A crust shared in calm was richer than a feast eaten in strife. For peasants, who often had nothing but dry bread, this proverb softened the bitterness of their meals, turning necessity into virtue. It transformed deprivation into moral superiority. Those who lived simply could claim to live wisely. There was humor, too, in bread wisdom. Villagers teased that the baker's child goes hungry, or that the miller's wife eats best. Such sayings poked fun at the inequalities of the trade, where those closest to bread did not always benefit most. Another common phrase was, "Half a loaf is better than none," a line still alive today, born from centuries of hunger where compromise was not just practical but philosophical. Even jokes were survival strategies, turning hunger into a lesson you could laugh at, if only bitterly. Bread also appeared in blessings and curses. To wish someone, "May you never lack bread," was to wish them prosperity, health, and fortune. To accuse someone of stealing another's bread was not merely theft, it was robbery of life itself. In disputes, bread became the measure of justice. Who had enough, who had too little, who had taken what did not belong. Proverbs crystallized these truths, ensuring that each generation learned them not from books, but from the rhythm of daily speech. What makes these sayings powerful is how they compressed entire lifetimes of suffering and survival into single sentences. A proverb about bread was not abstract wisdom. It was lived experience, boiled down into a crust of truth. Every peasant who repeated these lines had chewed their meaning as surely as they chewed their loaves. Each crumb of language was kneaded with hunger, laughter, and endurance. And yet, folklore did not only use bread to teach, it used bread to dream. Tales told of magical loaves that never ran out, of enchanted ovens that baked endlessly, of saints who multiplied bread to feed the starving. These stories gave people hope that beyond the cruelty of famine, there might be abundance. They turned bread into a symbol of miracles, a promise that the world could one day be kinder. And in a society where scarcity was constant, such tales were more than fantasy. They were survival of the spirit. But while bread and folklore carried wisdom, morality, and dreams, it also reminded people of fragility. Every proverb about saving crumbs, every story about cursed bakers, every blessing of loaves spoke to the same truth. Bread was never guaranteed. It could be stolen, spoiled, withheld, or corrupted. Its wisdom was not only about life, but about loss. And as we move deeper into bread's story, we see that this fragile balance between life and loss found its sharpest expression, not in stories or sayings, but in the tables of the rich and poor, where bread became the clearest marker of inequality. Bread, more than any other food, exposed the social fault lines of the medieval world. To look at a man's loaf was to know his place in society. The noble dined on white, fine-textured bread baked from the purest wheat, soft enough to soak up rich stews, and sweet enough to resemble cake by peasant standards. The poor chewed on dark, coarse loaves of rye, barley, or oats, bread so dense it could double as a weapon if thrown across the table. Between these two extremes stretched an entire spectrum of inequality, each crust telling a story of privilege or deprivation. White bread, known in many places as manchit, was the pride of aristocratic households. Its snowy crumb came from carefully sifted wheat flour, a luxury that demanded more grain and more labor to produce. Servants baked it in private ovens, ensuring it was free from soot and ash, while noble families enjoyed it at feasts alongside meats, wines, and delicate pastries. White bread became a marker of refinement and purity, a visible sign of wealth that separated those who could afford it from those condemned to chew the earthier loaves of survival. To be served white bread was to be honored. To eat it daily was to belong to the elite. In contrast, peasants survived on what was called black bread, though its color was more gray or brown, a result of rough milling and the inclusion of husks, bran, and whatever grains were cheapest or most available. Rye dominated in northern Europe, while barley and oats appeared further west. These loaves were heavy, bitter, and often prone to spoilage, carrying the risk of ergot fungus and other invisible poisons. Eating such bread was a daily reminder of poverty, not just in taste, but in health, as it filled bellies while slowly eroding strength. Yet the poor could not refuse. Bread was life, even when it was also slow death. The divide between rich and poor bread was not only culinary, but symbolic. White bread was associated with purity, nobility, and even holiness, echoing the consecrated wafers of the Eucharist. Dark bread, by contrast, was linked to toil, sin, and the earth itself. Peasants joked bitterly that God had reserved the white loaves for heaven, while leaving the black crusts to those still trapped on earth. This symbolism reinforced the hierarchy. Just as society was divided between lord and serf, so too was bread divided between white and black. Each bite reminded people of their station, turning every meal into a lesson in inequality. Markets reflected this division starkly. Bakers sold loaves of varying quality side by side, the fine white bread set apart from the darker, cheaper loaves. A single glance at what a person carried home revealed their class. There was no hiding hunger, no concealing poverty. The bread in your basket exposed you. Even almsgiving carried this weight. When nobles distributed bread to the poor during feast days, they often gave away coarse loaves, keeping the white for themselves. Charity thus reinforced hierarchy. Even in generosity, inequality was baked into the loaf. There is a cruel irony here. The poorest, who labored in the fields to grow the grain, were least likely to taste the finest bread made from it. They produced the harvest but received the scraps, while the nobility, who rarely bent their backs to plow or sow, enjoyed the most refined fruits of the land. Bread embodied this injustice daily, kneaded into every crust, chewed in silence by peasants who had no choice but to endure. And yet, bread could also blur the divide, at least temporarily. In times of famine, even the wealthy found themselves eating coarser loaves, as white flour grew scarce. Chronicles describe nobles gnawing bitter rye bread during crises, complaining bitterly about what peasants had long endured. These moments of shared hardship, though rare, revealed how fragile privilege could be when nature failed. But once abundance returned, so did the divide, as ovens once again baked whiteness for the elite and darkness for the poor. Folklore and proverbs captured this contrast. Better black bread and freedom than white bread and slavery, some said, turning necessity into dignity. Peasants comforted themselves with the idea that coarse loaves, though bitter, made them stronger and more resilient than the soft-bellied nobles who dined on white. Humor and pride softened the inequality, but they did not erase it. Bread remained a visible, edible reminder of social order, one that no sermon or law could disguise. Even in religion, this inequality found expression. The white wafer of communion echoed the manchet loaves of nobility, while the dark bread of peasants rarely appeared on the altar. Spiritual purity was thus symbolically linked with material wealth, a reminder that even the path to salvation seemed paved with finer crumbs for some. And yet, peasants still prayed over their coarse bread with equal fervor, believing that holiness did not depend on whiteness, but on gratitude. What makes this divide so striking is how bread, the most universal of foods, became the sharpest marker of separation. You could change clothes, speak humbly, or disguise wealth in other ways, but bread betrayed you. Its color, its texture, its taste, all revealed your place in the hierarchy. Bread was the edible caste system of medieval Europe, and while this inequality was bitterly resented, it also planted the seeds of revolt. When bread shortages struck, the poor knew that white loaves were still being baked for the wealthy while their own families starved. This fueled anger, riots, and rebellion, as bread became the rallying cry of justice. The very food that divided rich and poor also united the oppressed in fury, proving that bread was not only a symbol of inequality, but also a spark for change. Yet the story does not end with class alone. Bread also revealed divisions between men and women, shaping roles, rituals, and responsibilities around ovens and tables. For if lords and peasants were separated by the color of their bread, so too were men and women divided by who baked it, who served it, and who bore the blame when it failed. Bread was not only a marker of class, it was also a mirror of gender. In medieval life, baking was overwhelmingly a woman's responsibility, and with it came both honor and crushing burden. To manage the household oven, or to walk each week to the communal bakehouse, was not simply domestic duty, it was survival work. A man could plow fields, harvest grain, or fight wars, but if the woman failed at bread, the household starved. This daily pressure gave bread a uniquely feminine weight, binding women to the rhythm of flour, fire, and family expectation. Picture a peasant woman before dawn, kneeling beside a wooden trough, kneading coarse rye dough with calloused hands. Her children stir awake, her husband prepares for the fields, but she's already been working for hours. The dough must be ready when the communal oven is lit, and if it is too wet, too dry, or too late, the family risks going hungry for days. Baking was not only labor, it was judgment. A well-risen loaf meant she was a good wife and mother. A collapsed loaf meant whispers, shame, and sometimes even accusations of laziness or sin. Bread judged women more harshly than men, because bread was seen as their responsibility. In towns, women dominated the baking trade at street level. Many ran small stalls, selling loaves they had baked in rented ovens, while male bakers often controlled larger guilds or commercial bakeries. This division reflected broader gender roles. Women shouldered the grind of daily sustenance, while men claimed authority and profit. Even in guilds, widows of bakers could sometimes inherit the right to sell bread, but they walked a fragile line between independence and suspicion. A woman who baked too much, sold too widely, or prospered too visibly risked being accused of unfair dealing, or worse, of witchcraft. The oven was both opportunity and trap. Communal ovens added another layer to gendered bread. Women gathered with baskets of dough waiting their turn, sharing gossip, stories, and advice. The bakehouse became an extension of the marketplace, a space where women's voices shaped the flow of village life. Yet even here, judgment lingered. A loaf that burned or cracked was not simply bad luck, it was a public embarrassment. Everyone saw whose bread had failed, and everyone had an opinion about why. These spaces reinforced community, but also exposed women to scrutiny, their skill and diligence displayed in every crust that came out of the oven. Superstitions reinforced these pressures. A woman whose bread consistently failed to rise might be whispered about as cursed or cursed herself. Conversely, a woman known for perfect loaves might be suspected of magical help. Bread was so central to survival that success or failure at baking could blur into suspicion of supernatural influence. Women's work, already undervalued, was now also entangled with fear. Their ovens could mark them as virtuous caretakers or dangerous outcasts. There was also a symbolic weight to women and bread. In sermons, priests often compared women's bodies to ovens, vessels for life, heat, and nourishment. The act of kneading dough mirrored the act of conception, the rising loaf compared to the swelling belly of pregnancy. These metaphors reinforced traditional roles, binding women's identity to bread and reproduction alike. To fail at either was to fail as a woman. Bread, in this sense, was not only labor but destiny. And yet, women also wielded quiet power through bread. They controlled who was fed first at the table, how loaves were divided, which neighbors might receive gifts of bread in times of need. A wife could stretch or withhold bread to assert subtle influence in her household. Bread became a language of care, but also of control, spoken daily in crusts and slices. Men might own the fields and the mills, but women governed the hearth, and the hearth governed survival. There's a certain bitter humor in imagining medieval husbands cursing burnt loaves, while never once considering the labor that went into them. For every failure at the oven, there had been hours of kneading, hauling, chopping wood, and enduring smoke. Bread was judged only by the final crust, not by the toil that shaped it. Women bore the blame for every imperfection, while their effort remained invisible. Bread's betrayals were blamed on their hands, never on the mold in the grain, the smoke in the oven, or the cruelty of scarcity. Still, bread offered women a fragile kind of independence. A widow who sold loaves in the market could support herself. A skilled baker's wife could keep a business afloat. Even peasant women found small freedoms in bread, trading loaves for favors, services, or gossip. These exchanges made bread a form of currency in women's hands, a power that existed within the narrow confines of gender roles but mattered profoundly in daily life. And yet, for all this, bread remained a burden as much as a gift. It was heavy to knead, heavy to carry, heavy to bear as judgment. Women carried that weight in silence, their labor forgotten in chronicles written by men, their ovens remembered only when they failed. Bread reveals the sharp inequality of medieval life, not only between rich and poor, but also between man and woman. One could hold the plow, the other held the dough, but both were shackled by survival. And while gender shaped bread in households and villages, it also shaped bread in monasteries and convents. For there, bread was not only women's duty, but men's discipline, baked into rules of prayer and asceticism, transforming loaves into spiritual tools as much as domestic ones. Bread inside monasteries and convents was never just a meal. It was discipline measured in loaves, charity kneaded into dough, and ritual baked into every crust. For monks and nuns, bread was at once sustenance, penance, and symbol, reflecting the strict balance between bodily need and spiritual devotion. If peasants saw bread as survival, and nobles saw it as refinement, religious orders saw it as training for the soul. Every crumb was weighed not only on the scales of hunger, but also on the scales of eternity. Monastic rules, such as those of the Benedictines, were explicit about bread. Meals were simple, structured, and deliberately repetitive to avoid indulgence. Bread often made up the largest portion of a monk's ration, paired with modest servings of vegetables, pulses, or fish. Meat was forbidden in many orders, which made bread even more central. Yet the bread was rarely luxurious. It was coarse, dark, and dense, meant to remind monks of humility. To eat it was to accept discipline, to chew penitence as much as nourishment. Hunger was part of holiness, and bread was the daily tutor in restraint. But bread in monasteries was also a tool of order. Loaves were counted carefully, divided equally, and distributed in silence during meals. No words were spoken at the refectory table, only prayers before and after eating. Monks learned to consume bread without complaint, training themselves to master appetite. To break a loaf carelessly or to show preference for softer crusts was considered weakness. Even in something so ordinary, monks were tested. Bread was not only food, it was a mirror of obedience, showing whether a monk could conquer desire for the sake of God. Yet charity was just as vital as discipline. Monasteries often baked extra bread to distribute to the poor at their gates. This bread was sometimes of even lower quality than what monks ate, made from bran, barley, or other cheap grains. Still, for beggars and travelers, it was a lifeline. To receive bread from a monk was to experience both relief and reminder. Relief in filling the stomach, reminder that survival depended on the mercy of the church. These acts of charity strengthened the moral authority of monasteries, presenting them as guardians of both souls and bellies. There were also ritual loaves, baked specifically for religious ceremonies. On feast days, monasteries sometimes produced finer bread, made of wheat and carefully sifted flour to mark the occasion. Some loaves were stamped with crosses or symbols before baking, transforming them into edible blessings. In convents, nuns prepared small round loaves to distribute to pilgrims, each one prayed over before leaving the oven. Bread in these contexts was no longer just ration or charity, it was sacrament, extending the presence of holiness into the daily act of eating. The symbolism of bread in religious life extended beyond the monastery walls. Villagers often believed that bread baked by monks or nuns carried protective powers. Families treasured these loaves, crumbling them into broths for the sick or storing pieces in their homes to ward off misfortune. In some cases, these loaves became part of local folklore, remembered for miraculous healings or blessings. Bread thus reinforced the aura of monasteries as places where heaven touched earth, even through something as ordinary as flour and fire. But not all monastic bread was austere or miraculous. Some abbeys, especially wealthy ones, became famous for their baking. Records describe monasteries producing soft white loaves and even sweetened breads for abbots or visiting dignitaries. In these moments, bread betrayed the tension between ideal and reality. Ascetic rules called for simplicity, but wealth and power often softened the crust. What was meant to be penitence sometimes became privilege, and the very food meant to train humility turned into another expression of hierarchy, even behind monastery walls. There is a curious humor in this contradiction. Imagine a young novice chewing bitter rye in silence, glancing at the abbot, enjoying a softer wheat loaf with honey, all while being told that bread was a lesson in equality and humility. The lesson, it seems, depended on one's place at the table. Bread revealed hypocrisy as easily as holiness, showing that even monks and nuns struggled to balance faith with appetite. Still, bread remained central to religious life because it embodied both sacrifice and sustenance. Fasting seasons intensified its symbolism as monks and nuns reduced their diets almost entirely to bread and water, using hunger as a spiritual weapon. Feasting seasons restored abundance, with bread once again at the center of celebration. In every season, in every ritual, bread marked the rhythm of devotion, tying the body to the calendar of the church. And yet, for all its sacred role in monasteries and convents, bread was not immune to corruption. Even holy ovens could produce loaves that made people sick, and even blessed bread could become a source of fear when mold appeared or rumors of witchcraft spread. The sacredness of monastic bread only heightened its vulnerability. If it failed, people saw not just physical danger, but spiritual failure, which leads us to the darker side of holy loaves, when bread meant to bless communities instead carried suspicion, curses, or even death. Sacred bread was supposed to be the one form of bread that never failed. Ordinary loaves might mold, sour, or crumble, but bread baked in monasteries, consecrated at the altar, or blessed on feast days was believed to carry divine protection. It was not just food, it was a fragment of heaven, a taste of the eternal. Yet the more sacred its status, the greater the fear when it went wrong. For if holy bread could spoil, if consecrated loaves could sicken, what did that say about God, about the church, about the fragile line between the sacred and the profane? Villagers whispered stories of holy bread that turned black overnight, of consecrated hosts that refused to break, or of loaves distributed as alms that left entire families vomiting. Such events were never dismissed as coincidence. Instead, they became signs of divine judgment or evidence of corruption in the clergy. A spoiled loaf from a monastery oven was more than a physical failure, it was a spiritual scandal. People asked, had the baker sinned? Had the abbot grown greedy? Or worse, had God withdrawn his blessing? The bread that should have reassured communities now sowed suspicion instead. Accusations often followed. If holy bread made people sick, rumors spread that the monks had hoarded the good grain for themselves and given moldy stock to the poor. If a communion wafer cracked strangely or stuck to a villager's throat, whispers of hidden curses or demonic interference filled the air. The very bread meant to unite the faithful could divide them, as fear took root in place of trust. In these moments, bread revealed hypocrisy. Where the church preached purity and charity, the loaves themselves betrayed greed and negligence. The most infamous suspicions centered on the Eucharist. The doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread became Christ's body, made every failure of the host terrifying. If the wafer crumbled too soon, some saw it as proof of a priest's unworthiness. If mold appeared on stored hosts, it was feared as a sign of desecration. Some even claimed to see blood or strange images appear on consecrated bread, interpreting these as miracles or as warnings of corruption. Bread that should have been untouchable was suddenly fragile, forcing people to question whether holiness truly shielded it from the same dangers as ordinary loaves. This tension sometimes spilled into violence. In times of famine, when monasteries distributed black, spoiled bread to the desperate, villagers rioted, accusing monks of hypocrisy. Chronicles describe mobs dragging bakers or cellarers into the streets, shouting that their bread was cursed, unworthy of God's house. The anger was not only about hunger, but about betrayal. Sacred bread was supposed to be the last refuge, the food that never failed. When it did, the wound cut deeper than an empty stomach. It cut into faith itself. There's a dark comedy in some of the recorded anecdotes. One chronicle tells of a priest who dropped a consecrated host into a muddy puddle, only to be accused by his parishioners of desecration so severe that his flock nearly chased him from town. Another tells of nuns whose bread kept collapsing in the oven, and the villagers whispered that it was because their prayers lacked sincerity. Imagine the poor women sweating over their dough, knowing that every failed loaf was read not as bad yeast, but as bad souls. The oven became a trial by fire in more ways than one. The irony is that many of these failures were natural: mold from damp storage, cracked loaves from poor kneading, sickness from contaminated grain. But the sacred aura of bread magnified each mishap into a theological crisis. A spoiled household loaf was unfortunate. A spoiled holy loaf was an omen. The higher the bread's status, the harder its fall when it betrayed. Yet these failures also reinforced bread's symbolic power. Fear of bad holy loaves kept people vigilant, sharpened their reverence, and deepened their awe when bread succeeded. Every perfect white wafer, every cleanly baked monastery loaf stood as proof that the sacred still held. Suspicion was the shadow of faith, and both clung to bread like yeast and dough. But sacred bread's failures pointed to something even larger: the fragility of trust itself. Bread was supposed to embody life, unity, and salvation. When it cracked, spoiled, or poisoned, it revealed the cracks in society, the spoilage in institutions, the poison in human relationships. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that no loaf, however blessed, was safe from corruption. And that realization carried beyond monasteries into the streets, markets, and villages, where bread had long been currency as well as food. For if holy bread could be tainted, what about the loaves traded daily among the living? In the end, bread's story was not only about faith or survival, it was about trust. And nowhere was that trust more fragile than in the marketplace, where every loaf exchange carried not only flour and fire, but the weight of honesty and deceit. In the medieval marketplace, bread was more than food. It was currency. Loaves moved from hand to hand, not only as nourishment, but as units of value, exchanged for labor, services, and favors. Before coins were plentiful and wages were standardized, bread often served as the measure of what a day's work was worth. To say someone earned their bread was no figure of speech. It was literal truth. Bread was wages, wealth, and survival wrapped into the same crust. For peasants and day laborers, payment often came in the form of loaves. A worker who mended fences, harvested grain, or tended animals might receive bread at the end of the day instead of coins. Bread was practical, immediate, edible, and certain, unlike money that might lose value or be difficult to spend in small villages. To take home bread was to take home proof that the family would eat tonight, and in communities where trust was fragile, bread was the safest wage. No one could argue over its usefulness. Markets revolved around bread in other ways too. Loaves were used to barter, traded for vegetables, eggs, or cloth. A woman might carry a basket of coarse rye loaves to the market square and return with onions, firewood, or wool. Each exchange was a negotiation of value, but bread always stood at the center, the yardstick against which other goods were measured. People said a hen was worth so many loaves, or a jug of ale the price of half a manchet. Bread was not only eaten, it was counted. This economic role made bread a source of both stability and tension. In years of good harvest, bread flowed freely, and markets bustled with barter. But in times of scarcity, the loaf became painfully expensive, its value soaring beyond what peasants could afford. Bread riots often erupted, not because people lacked food entirely, but because prices were unfair. To deny someone bread was not just to starve them, but to rob them of dignity, to strip them of their right to exchange labor for life. In this sense, bread was the coin of justice, and when it was withheld, revolt followed. There was also an element of ritual in bread as currency. Lords often distributed loaves to their tenants during feast days, an act both generous and calculated. These gifts reminded villagers of their dependence and bound them in loyalty. Monasteries gave out bread as alms, reinforcing their spiritual authority while also maintaining social order. Bread was charity, but it was also control, a reminder that survival flowed downward from those in power. To receive bread was to be fed, to give bread was to wield influence. The humor of the marketplace often reflected this truth. Sayings poked fun at the baker's scales, always tilted too lightly in his favor, or joked that a worker was paid in crusts when cheated. In some villages, children played games mimicking barter with bits of old bread, pretending to buy and sell as their parents did. Bread was so deeply woven into the economy that even play imitated trade. And in taverns, men laughed that their labor earned them bread by day, ale by night, a cycle of survival wrapped in crumbs and foam. Yet bread's role as currency also exposed its fragility. Unlike coins, loaves could rot, mold, or be eaten too quickly. A worker might receive bread in payment only to find it spoiled within days, his wages turning to poison instead of nourishment. This created constant anxiety, as bread had to be consumed or traded before time betrayed it. The perishability of bread made poverty harsher still, because the poor could not afford to save. Their wealth vanished in days, crumbled between fingers, or eaten before tomorrow came. Still, the system endured because bread was immediate, tangible, and universal. Everyone needed it, everyone valued it, and everyone recognized its worth. A loaf might differ in size, grain, or whiteness, but its meaning was always clear. Bread equaled life, and thus it equaled value. No one questioned the exchange because everyone shared the same hunger. But this universality carried a darker edge. If bread could be wages, it could also be withheld as punishment. Lords sometimes cut rations to discipline workers. Masters withheld loaves to enforce obedience. Families who fell into debt might be denied bread until they paid, trapping them in a cycle of hunger and dependence. Bread became a leash as much as a wage, proof that survival could be controlled by those who owned the ovens and the mills. And here lay bread's greatest irony. The very thing that united people in markets also deepened their inequality. A noble could buy cartloads of fine wheat loaves, while a laborer scraped by on a crust earned through sweat. Bread, the universal wage, revealed the unequal worth assigned to human lives. Each loaf carried not only flour and fire, but the weight of injustice. Yet for all its burdens, bread as currency remained essential, shaping not only trade but imagination. To speak of bread was to speak of value, justice, and survival. And as medieval life evolved, bread's role stretched further still. Not only currency in markets, but symbol in law, oath, and punishment, where the loaf itself became part of trials and sentences. Bread was not only a food to be eaten or a wage to be traded, it was also a tool of justice. In medieval Europe, where law was often inseparable from ritual and religion, bread found its way into courts, punishments, and oaths. To break bread was to seal agreements, to eat it was to prove innocence, and to be denied it was to suffer disgrace. The loaf, so ordinary at the table, became extraordinary in the courtroom, where its crust carried the weight of judgment and its crumb bore the burden of truth. One of the most striking examples was the ordeal of the consecrated bread, used in trials of oath and honesty. A man accused of lying or swearing falsely might be forced to eat a piece of holy bread, known as the corsned. The belief was that God himself would intervene. The innocent could swallow safely, but the guilty would choke, gag, or even die from the act. It was justice by loaf, divine judgment hidden in a crumb. Chronicles record men collapsing during the ordeal, seen as proof of guilt, though today we might suspect nerves and fear did as much as any curse. Still, for medieval minds, the bread revealed truth more surely than any witness. Bread also served as the foundation of oaths and contracts. To swear on a loaf was to bind oneself under divine scrutiny. Villagers settling disputes might share bread as part of the reconciliation, each bite symbolizing restored trust. Lords and vassals sometimes sealed agreements with bread at feasts, embedding loyalty into the very act of eating. The symbolism was clear. Just as bread sustained the body, the oath sustained the bond. To break bread was to build peace. To betray bread was to invite God's wrath. But bread could just as easily condemn. Bakers who cheated customers by selling underweight loaves were punished publicly, often by being placed in the pillory or forced to carry heavy, oversized loaves through the streets as mockery. In some towns, fraudulent bread was hung around the baker's neck, the crust itself becoming the symbol of shame. Imagine the humiliation. A man paraded with his own deceit, the loaf that should have fed others now branding him as untrustworthy. Bread in this way was both crime and punishment, the evidence displayed for all to see. The law also reached into households through bread. Families were warned never to waste it, for to throw away bread was not only sin but social offense, seen as an insult to God's providence. In some communities, disputes over stolen loaves were treated with the same seriousness as theft of coins or livestock. To take another's bread was to steal life itself, and punishments were often harsh. A hungry man might plead necessity, but the law reminded him that bread, no matter how humble, carried value beyond its size. There's a grim humor in these rituals. Picture a man trembling in court, forced to chew dry bread under the gaze of his neighbors, every cough interpreted as guilt. Or a dishonest baker balancing a massive fake loaf on his shoulders, staggering through town as children jeered. Justice, in the medieval world, was not abstract. It was physical, visible, edible. Bread made guilt tangible, turning law into performance. And yet, these practices also reflected deep anxieties about truth and survival. Bread was too important to be left out of law. It symbolized honesty because it symbolized life. If someone could betray bread, they could betray anything. The korsned, the oath loaf, the shame loaf, all were ways of reminding society that trust was as fragile and necessary as the daily crust. Without trust, communities starved just as surely as they did without food. But bread injustice was not only about individuals, it was about communities too. When shortages led to riots, authorities sometimes punished entire villages by restricting access to communal ovens or cutting rations. The message was clear. bread was not just survival, but discipline, a lever of control used to keep people obedient. Law was baked into loaves as surely as flour and water, making bread a constant reminder of the authorities' reach. The irony, of course, is that bread used in justice could be as corrupt as bread in markets. Priests might favor one side by blessing a loaf more fervently, or lords might rig punishments to spare favored bakers. Even in law, bread reflected inequality. A nobleman rarely choked on holy bread, but a peasant accused of theft often found his crust bitter indeed. Justice, like bread, was not distributed equally. Still, bread's role in justice left a lasting impression on culture. The very language of law absorbed it, earning one's bread honestly, breaking bread in peace, eating the bread of deceit. These phrases survive because they carried truth born from centuries of practice, where bread was both witness and weapon. And if bread could embody justice, it could also embody something darker, vengeance. For beyond courts and oaths, bread was sometimes used in curses, in rituals meant not to reveal truth, but to punish enemies. And in that shadowy realm, loaves were no longer symbols of fairness, but instruments of fear. Bread was supposed to bind people together, to turn neighbors into kin and strangers into guests. Yet, in the darker corners of medieval life, bread could be twisted into an instrument of vengeance. What was normally shared in blessing could just as easily be delivered as betrayal. Its crust hiding secrets of anger, jealousy, or spite. Loaves, simple and ordinary, became weapons that struck silently, punishing enemies not with sword or fire, but with a meal that carried misfortune in every bite. Rumors abounded of bread laced with curses. A loaf left at someone's doorstep could be a gift of goodwill, or a hex in disguise. Folk tales told of women who baked ashes from graves into bread to bring illness to rivals, or of men who marked loaves with strange symbols before slipping them into the hands of enemies. Villagers believed that such bread carried not only sickness but spiritual rot, corroding luck, livestock, and lineage. To eat cursed bread was to swallow the hatred of another person, to let their malice invade your body. Fear turned even generosity suspect. Who could trust a loaf freely given when bread itself might carry revenge? Betrayal often wore the disguise of hospitality. To invite someone to share bread at your table was the ultimate symbol of peace, so to use that ritual as a cover for harm was particularly cruel. Chronicles tell of feasts where poisoned or spoiled bread was slipped to guests as punishment for grievances. The symbolism stung as much as the act. The very food that should have sealed friendship became the tool of treachery. To be betrayed through bread was to be betrayed at the deepest level, for it violated both hunger and trust in one stroke. Even without deliberate malice, bread could serve revenge simply through neglect. A wife might serve her husband loaves that were underbaked, tough, or salted beyond taste as a silent protest against mistreatment. A servant might deliver stale bread to a cruel master while keeping the freshest loaves for themselves. These acts were small, nearly invisible rebellions, but in a world where bread carried so much weight, they were felt keenly. Revenge did not always need poison. Sometimes bitterness in the crust was enough to make the point. There's a dark humor in imagining neighbors exchanging loaves with nervous smiles, each secretly wondering whether they had been blessed or cursed. Bread, the symbol of unity, became the ultimate double agent. It could nourish or it could destroy. A child might bite into a gift loaf with delight while parents exchanged anxious glances, unsure whether they had accepted kindness or swallowed vengeance. The church tried to police these fears, condemning the use of bread in curses and reminding people that blessed loaves could only carry grace, not malice. But superstition was stubborn. People whispered about witches who kneaded incantations into dough or who baked bread that caused cows to go dry and fields to fail. In some trials, loaves were even presented as evidence of sorcery, their strange cracks or burns read as marks of demonic influence. Bread that should have represented Christ's body instead became a suspected vessel of the devil's hand. What made these beliefs so powerful was that they fit perfectly into the fabric of everyday life. Everyone needed bread, everyone touched it, everyone ate it. That universality made it the perfect medium for revenge. Unlike poison in a cup of wine, which only the wealthy might encounter, cursed bread could reach the poorest hut or the richest hall. To use bread as vengeance was to strike at the very core of existence. And yet, bread's association with revenge was not always supernatural. Sometimes it was political. In times of revolt, angry villagers stormed bakeries and granaries, seizing loaves not just to eat, but to humiliate the authorities who had withheld them. Bread was both prize and weapon, lifted in triumph or smashed in fury. To deny bread was oppression, to seize it was vengeance. In this way, loaves became banners of revolt, symbols of anger that needed no words. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of bread as vengeance was how easily it blurred into survival. Was the poor woman who stretched her flour with bitter herbs cursing her neighbor, or simply trying to feed her family? Was the baker who sold spoiled loaves punishing customers, or just desperate not to starve? In a world where every crumb was contested, vengeance and necessity often walked side by side. Bread did not need to be poisoned to be cruel. Hunger alone made it a weapon, And so bread, which should have been the language of peace, often became the vocabulary of anger. Each loaf could carry blessing or betrayal, care or contempt, unity or vengeance. The same hands that broke bread in friendship could bake it in spite, leaving eaters to wonder what they had truly consumed. Yet if bread could embody vengeance, it could also embody memory. For loaves carried not only anger in the moment, but the power to remind, to mark betrayals long after the crust had crumbled. In this way, bread was not just a tool of revenge, but also a vessel of remembrance, binding grief, betrayal, and hope into traditions that outlived the meal itself. Bread was never only about feeding the body, it was also about feeding memory. In the medieval world, where literacy was scarce and monuments rare, loaves themselves became markers of remembrance. They carried grief, gratitude, and legacy in their crusts, acting as edible memorials that linked the living to the dead and the present to the past. To bake a loaf for the departed, or to break one in their honor, was to say, "We remember you, we still share with you, we have not forgotten." Funeral traditions often placed bread at the center of mourning. Families baked special loaves to distribute to mourners, each one a silent prayer wrapped in flour. Eating these loaves bound the community together, turning grief into a shared act of nourishment. Some believed that every bite carried the memory of the deceased deeper into the body of those left behind, ensuring that their spirit lived on within their neighbors and kin. Bread thus became more than symbol. It was a literal way of carrying the dead into the living. Charity loaves were another form of remembrance. Wealthier families would endow doles, the regular distribution of bread to the poor in memory of a deceased relative. Each loaf handed out was both a gift of survival and a reminder of the name attached to it. In this way, bread transformed into legacy. The poor who lined up outside church gates might not know the deceased personally, but every crumb they ate reinforced the memory of that soul. It was a way of binding eternity to daily hunger, ensuring that remembrance endured through sustenance. Stories also tied bread to mourning in subtler ways. Some widows kept a final crust from their husband's last meal, treasuring it as a relic of love. Others baked loaves each year on the anniversary of a death, distributing them to neighbors as a ritual of remembrance. In these customs, bread became both relic and ritual, a tangible connection to lives cut short. Unlike stone tombs or carved effigies, these loaves were fragile, perishable, but perhaps precisely for that reason, more intimate. They reminded the living that memory, like bread, had to be renewed constantly or it would crumble away. Folklore even suggested that bread carried traces of the dead. To smell fresh bread after a funeral was sometimes taken as a sign that the spirit lingered, reminding the family of its presence. Some tales described loaves that cracked in strange patterns when baked after a burial, as if the bread itself had been marked by grief. These stories may seem fanciful, but they reveal how deeply people saw bread as woven into the fabric of life and death. Bread bore not only sustenance, but the weight of memory itself. There was also an element of social theater in these practices. Families who gave generously of bread at funerals or feast days displayed both wealth and piety, ensuring that their dead were remembered with honor. Poorer families, unable to provide such loaves, feared their loved ones would be forgotten more quickly. Bread thus became a stage for memory as much as for mourning, a way of broadcasting grief in a language everyone could taste. And yet, there was also humor, even in mourning. Some villages joked about ghost loaves, the bread that always seemed to disappear first at funeral feasts, snatched eagerly by the hungriest mourners. The mingling of grief and appetite revealed a truth too obvious to ignore. Even in death, bread remained life. To honor the dead, the living still had to eat, and bread bridged the two realities, turning sorrow into survival. The fragility of bread also mirrored the fragility of memory. Just as loaves grew stale, so too did recollection fade if not renewed. This parallel haunted people, pushing them to keep baking, keep breaking, keep sharing. The loaf on the table was never only for today, it was also for yesterday, and for those who would never sit at the table again. Bread forced remembrance into the rhythm of daily life, but remembrance was not always gentle. Sometimes, bread carried mourning into accusation, reminding communities not only of the dead, but of the injustices that killed them. Loaves given in memory of famine victims, plague sufferers, or martyrs turned bread into protest, a reminder that death had been preventable, that memory demanded justice. Bread thus became both solace and challenge, comforting the living while refusing to let them forget the cost of survival. And this is what made bread such a profound vessel of memory. It was perishable, fragile, consumed quickly. Yet it returned every day, baked anew, carrying memory forward with it. Each loaf was a chance to remember, a chance to honor, a chance to bind the living to the dead. No monument could be eaten, no stone could sustain, but bread could. It made memory part of the body, part of survival, part of the endless cycle of life. Yet even as bread carried mourning, it also carried hope. For if a loaf could remind people of the dead, it could also remind them of the possibility of renewal. Tomorrow's bread might taste sweeter, not only because hunger demanded it, but because memory gave it meaning. And in that fragile balance between sorrow and hope, Bread revealed itself once more as the most human of foods, always perishable, always reborn, always binding the past to the future in every crumb. Bread, for all its betrayals and burdens, also carried with it the most fragile and necessary of human emotions, hope. In a world where famine, plague, and war stalked every generation, the loaf was more than a tool of survival. It was a promise that tomorrow might be kinder than today. To place dough in the oven was to believe that the fire would rise, that hunger would be stilled, that life would continue. In that simple act of baking, people rehearsed the possibility of renewal, each loaf becoming a small prophecy that despair would not have the final word. Hope was baked into the rhythm of daily life. A mother kneading coarse rye for her family knew that the bread she made would be gone by nightfall, but she baked anyway, trusting that there would be more grain, more dough, more mornings to come. The repetition itself was hopeful, a quiet defiance against the uncertainty of harvests or illness. Bread, unlike meat or wine, demanded constant renewal. It could not be hoarded for long without growing stale or rotten. Its perishability was a curse, but also a lesson. Life must be lived one loaf at a time, each day a fresh chance. Religious traditions deepened this symbolism. In Christian teaching, bread was tied not only to Christ's body, but to resurrection itself. Every communion wafer, every blessed loaf, whispered of renewal beyond death, of salvation that lay just beyond the hunger of the flesh. For peasants who scraped mold from their daily bread, the Eucharist's spotless white wafer was more than sacred. It was a glimpse of a perfected world where loaves never spoiled and hunger never returned. Bread thus carried not only memory of the dead, but hope of eternal life. Folklore wove similar threads. Tales told of miraculous loaves that multiplied endlessly, feeding villages through famine. Saints were said to bless ovens so that bread never ran out, or to appear in disguise as beggars rewarded with crusts, later revealed as divine visitors. These stories were not only entertainment, they were reminders that even in scarcity, abundance was possible. The miracle loaf was hope made edible, a dream that hunger could one day be defeated. Even in times of despair, bread could inspire resilience. Chronicles describe families saving the smallest crusts during famine, not to eat, but to keep as tokens of survival. Those crusts became symbols of endurance, carried in pockets or hidden in chests until better days arrived. Children were promised fresh bread in the future as a way of keeping them alive in spirit, if not in body. Hunger gnawed, but the image of a warm loaf from a future harvest gave people the strength to endure one more day. Hope lived in the imagination of bread long before it lived in the mouth. There's a poignant humor in how peasants spoke about hope through bread. Tomorrow's loaf will be bigger, they joked, even when their fields lay barren. Next year the crust will be soft, they said, while chewing the hardness of famine loaves. These jokes were not delusions, they were strategies of survival. To laugh at bread's absence was to keep faith in its return. Hope was not naive, it was necessary, the yeast of endurance in dough that might otherwise collapse under despair. Hope also shaped social bonds. To share bread in times of plenty was generosity, but to share it in times of scarcity was an act of radical faith. When neighbors divided their loaves, they declared their belief that tomorrow would bring more, that giving away today's bread would not doom them but sustain them both. In this way, bread became a tool of community resilience, binding people together not only by hunger but by the shared hope of survival. And yet, hope in bread was always fragile. Just as loaves could mold or crumble, so too could optimism vanish in the face of prolonged famine or betrayal. The same bread that promised renewal could also mock the hungry when it failed to appear. Hope, like dough, had to be constantly kneaded, shaped, and protected. It was not automatic, it was labor. And the people who carried that labor most often were women, bakers, priests, and those who bore the responsibility of feeding others. Bread's hope was never free. It was always work. Still, the fact that people clung to it, even in the harshest conditions, reveals something profound. Bread taught them that renewal was always possible, because it had to be remade each day. Unlike stone monuments or hoarded treasures, bread reminded them of impermanence and persistence at once. To lose bread was devastating, but to bake it again was a triumph, no matter how small. Hope was fragile, yes, but it was also endlessly renewable as long as there was flour, water, fire, and faith. And if bread symbolized hope in life, it also symbolized salvation in death. Loaves given at funerals or feast days were promises that the dead were not abandoned, that renewal awaited them beyond the grave. To eat bread in memory of the departed was to declare that hope stretched beyond the horizon of mortality. Bread, humble and perishable, carried within it the seed of eternity. But hope, like bread, could be manipulated. Rulers and priests knew how to wield it, distributing loaves to calm unrest or blessing bread to inspire faith. In their hands, bread became not only promise, but propaganda, turning hope into a tool of control. And so, just as bread gave strength, it also revealed how easily hope could be twisted to serve power. Bread was never neutral, it was political. Kings, lords, bishops, and city councils all understood that whoever controlled the loaf controlled the people. Hunger did not just gnaw at the stomach, it gnawed at loyalty, obedience, and order. An army might march on discipline and faith, but the crowd in the marketplace marched on bread alone. To keep it flowing was to keep peace. To withhold it was to invite rebellion. Loaves were not just baked in ovens, they were baked in the crucible of power, where flour, fire, and politics mixed into the most combustible of fuels. Rulers often staged their generosity through bread. Chronicles describe kings ordering vast distributions of loaves during coronations, festivals, or times of famine. To hand out bread in public was to remind the crowd that their survival flowed downward from the throne. These spectacles were not only acts of charity, they were acts of theater. 1,000 peasants eating the king's bread meant 1,000 peasants bound to him in gratitude. The loaf became propaganda, a performance of plenty, even when harvests had failed. City councils understood the same principle. In places like Paris or Florence, authorities regulated the price and weight of loaves with obsessive care, fearing riots if bakers cheated the poor. Laws fixed the size of bread according to the price of grain, and inspectors patrolled ovens to ensure compliance. But these laws were double-edged. When grain grew scarce, councils faced impossible choices: raise prices and starve the poor, or lower them and bankrupt the bakers. Either decision risked unrest. Bread was more volatile than gunpowder, and a shortage could topple regimes faster than an invading army. The famous bread riots of history were rarely about total absence. They were about injustice. The sight of white loaves in noble hands while peasants chewed dark crusts, the knowledge that grain was hoarded in granaries while markets went bare. When rulers failed to maintain the illusion of fairness, bread became the rallying cry of revolt. Crowds stormed bakeries, looted wagons, and shouted the same demand again and again: bread at a just price. In these moments, loaves became banners of protest, lifted high not as food, but as weapons of political fury. Even the church wielded bread as power. Monasteries fed the poor, not only out of compassion, but to reinforce spiritual authority. To kneel at a monastery gate and receive bread was to admit dependence on the institution. Priests blessed loaves to reassure their flocks that divine grace was still flowing through the church. Bread became a sacrament of obedience, tying the faithful to both heaven and hierarchy. To refuse bread from the church was to risk exclusion, not only from the table, but from salvation itself. But power could also corrupt the loaf. Chronicles tell of abbots who ate soft white bread while their monks chewed black rye, or of rulers who filled their tables with fine manchet loaves even in famine years. These displays of excess sharpened resentment, exposing the hypocrisy of those who preached humility while dining on luxury. Bread revealed what words could not hide: who was privileged, who was deprived, and who was willing to let others starve for their own comfort. There's a bitter humor in how openly rulers feared bread more than rebellion. Soldiers could be bribed, enemies defeated, conspiracies crushed, but an empty oven in the marketplace was beyond control. You could not argue with hunger. It did not listen to speeches or heed decrees. It grew louder each day until it burst into chaos. Bread, in its silence, commanded more power than crowns or swords. Rulers also weaponized bread by withholding it. During sieges, armies cut off supply routes, knowing hunger would force surrender faster than bloodshed. Within cities, lords sometimes punished rebellious neighborhoods by restricting access to communal ovens. To deny bread was to deny life, and those in power knew exactly how devastating that denial could be. Loaves were chains, and starvation was the lock. And yet, bread was also the weak point of every authority. Monarchs could survive scandals, wars, even assassinations, but they could not survive bread riots for long. The people might endure taxes, labor, and injustice, but they would not endure hunger. Bread was the one demand rulers had to answer, because it was the one demand that united everyone: rich and poor, saint and sinner, noble and peasant. This fragile balance between ruler and loaf meant that bread shaped politics at every level. It forced kings to open granaries, councils to fix prices, abbots to feed beggars, and bakers to walk the line between profit and punishment. Bread governed governance itself because bread governed life. And if bread was the foundation of power in the marketplace and the throne room, it was just as foundational on the battlefield. For armies marched not only with banners and weapons, but with ovens, mills, and sacks of grain. The politics of bread in war was as decisive as any strategy of steel. On the battlefield, bread was as decisive as swords or banners. Armies did not march on courage alone. They marched on rations, and at the heart of every ration was bread. Without loaves or hard biscuits, no soldier could lift his weapon, no cavalry could charge, no siege could last. Generals might plan strategies, kings might boast of valor, but without bread, all plans collapsed. Logistics, not heroism, often determined the outcome of wars, and bread was always the first and most fragile link in that chain. Medieval campaigns required immense quantities of grain. Chroniclers describe supply wagons trailing behind armies, loaded with sacks of wheat and rye, guarded as carefully as weapons. Grain was safer to transport than bread itself. It could last longer and be milled on the march. But this created another problem: ovens. Armies often carried collapsible field ovens or commandeered village bakehouses along their routes. Soldiers needed fresh loaves every few days, and baking became as important as battle drills. In some sieges, entire detachments of men were assigned solely to the task of grinding grain and keeping fires burning. An army without bakers was an army destined to fail. But fresh bread was not always possible, and so hardtack, or hard biscuits, became the soldier's curse and salvation. These rock-hard discs of flour and water could last months, sometimes years, without rotting. They were nearly indestructible, which was both their blessing and their torment. Soldiers joked that they needed to break hardtack with a sword or soak it nail before daring to chew. More than one chronicle notes men breaking teeth on rations. Yet for all its cruelty to jaws and stomachs, hardtack kept armies alive when nothing else could. It was bread stripped to its barest essence. Survival without pleasure. Sieges tested bread most brutally. Within besieged cities, grain supplies dwindled quickly and loaves grew smaller, darker, and more adulterated with each passing week. Bark, sawdust, or ground beans were mixed into dough to stretch it further, producing loaves that filled the stomach but destroyed health. Starvation haunted the walls more effectively than enemy fire. Many defenders eventually surrendered, not because they lost the fight, but because they lost their bread. Outside the walls, besieging armies faced their own struggles, hauling grain across dangerous supply lines and baking in makeshift ovens exposed to attack. Victory often belonged not to the strongest fighters, but to the side that managed bread longest. There are stories of commanders who understood this truth better than any tactic. Napoleon, centuries later, famously declared that an army marches on its stomach, but medieval lords already knew it. Some rulers made careful arrangements to secure grain before campaigns, ensuring loyalty through steady bread. Others failed, and their armies dissolved into desertion and mutiny. A hungry soldier was not a disciplined one. He might fight for a loaf more fiercely than for a crown. Bread, more than banners or sermons, determined the morale of the ranks. There was irony in how bread blurred the line between rich and poor during war. A noble knight who dined on manchet loaves at home found himself gnawing the same black rye or hard biscuit as the lowliest foot soldier. Hunger was the great equalizer. In the mud of the battlefield, bread stripped away privilege, reminding even the most powerful that survival reduced all men to the same crust. Yet inequality soon returned, for officers and commanders often secured better rations, while common soldiers suffered the worst. Even in hunger, hierarchy persisted. Armies also weaponized bread by destroying their enemy's supply. Raids often targeted mills and ovens, crippling a region's ability to feed its troops. Burning fields of grain was as effective as winning a skirmish. Starvation was a strategy as old as war itself. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War describe villages stripped of grain, leaving civilians to starve while armies pressed onward. Bread became not only the victim of war, but its weapon, wielded through absence more than presence. There's a grim humor in the soldier's relationship with bread. Songs and poems survive where men mocked their rations, cursing the biscuit that cracked their teeth or the moldy loaf crawling with weevils. One verse describes dunking bread in wine until the worms floated to the surface, laughing bitterly that at least it's meat. These jokes were not complaints alone, they were coping mechanisms. To laugh at bad bread was to endure it. Mockery became a form of survival when the loaf itself betrayed. And yet, bread in warfare was also tied to memory. Veterans remembered campaigns not just by battles fought, but by rations eaten. The endless hardtack of sieges, the rare luxury of a fresh loaf after victory, the bitter hunger of failed supply lines. Bread became shorthand for war itself. Hard, bitter, enduring. To tell a story of a campaign was often to tell a story of bread. But bread in war also had a symbolic role. To seize enemy ovens was triumph. To distribute bread after conquest was magnanimity. Victorious commanders sometimes threw loaves to starving civilians to prove their generosity, while defeated armies left behind the bitter crusts of failure. Bread marked not only survival, but authority, proving who controlled life itself. And this was the most powerful truth. Bread was not just a part of war, it was war's fate. Battles might decide who held the field for a day, but bread decided who held it for a season. Hunger toppled cities, dissolved armies, and reshaped kingdoms. Bread, humble and overlooked, was the silent general of every campaign. And if bread was the general of armies, it was no less powerful in peace, where it became the stage for celebration. For when wars ended and famine relented, bread once again filled tables not only as survival, but as joy. Loaves transformed from rations into feasts, reminding the weary that life could be more than endurance. Bread in medieval feasts and celebrations was no longer a story of bare survival, but of joy, spectacle, and excess. Where famine had made loaves shrink and war had turned them into rations, celebrations expanded bread into symbols of abundance. To place a great loaf on a festive table was to declare that hunger had been defeated, if only for a night. Bread became not just food, but performance. golden crusts stacked high, dough sculpted into shapes of animals, castles, or crowns, each one announcing wealth, piety, or power. In noble banquets, bread appeared first not in the mouth, but as part of the theater of dining. Enormous manchet loaves, made from finely sifted wheat, were carried in on silver platters, often still steaming from the oven. The softest slices were reserved for honored guests, while lesser cuts went to retainers or servants. In some courts, bread was even carved into elaborate sculptures, swans with spread wings, towers that echoed the architecture of the hall, or braided loaves painted with saffron for a golden glow. These creations were less about eating and more about display. The mere sight of them was meant to awe, to show that the host could command abundance in a world where most people chewed coarse rye in silence. But bread was not only ornament, it also served a practical role in feasts through the use of trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that doubled as plates. Food was piled on them, sauces soaking into their crusts. And at the end of the meal, the trenchers were either eaten by the diners or, more often, given to the poor waiting outside the hall. This practice was both pragmatic and symbolic. It allowed bread to serve twice, once as vessel, once as food. It also made the feast an act of charity, ensuring that abundance trickled down beyond the hall. Yet it reinforced inequality too. The rich dined on delicacies, while the poor received soggy scraps. Even in celebration, bread reminded everyone of their place. Festive bread was not limited to nobles. In villages, weddings, baptisms, and harvest festivals, all featured special loaves. These were often larger than everyday bread, braided or stamped with symbols to mark the occasion. At weddings, couples sometimes shared a single loaf, breaking it together as a sign of unity. In harvest festivals, the first bread baked from the new grain was celebrated as proof that the community would endure another year. These loaves carried joy, but also gratitude. Gratitude that the harvest had succeeded, that hunger had been held at bay, at least for now. Religious feast days added another layer of symbolism. Monasteries and churches distributed bread to mark holy occasions, from Christmas to saints' days. These loaves were sometimes blessed, believed to carry protective power into the households that received them. To eat such bread was to taste not only celebration, but sanctity, a reminder that divine favor was as essential to abundance as fertile fields. Festivals blurred the line between sacred and secular, turning bread into both prayer and party. There is a comic side to these celebrations, too. Chronicles describe drunken villagers competing to snatch the largest loaf from feast tables, or children daring one another to bite into loaves shaped like animals before anyone else. In some festivals, bread was even thrown to crowds as prizes, sparking chaotic scrambles that looked more like brawls than blessings. Bread, normally guarded so carefully, was suddenly treated with reckless abundance, as though mocking the scarcity that haunted the rest of the year. These moments of extravagance carried deep psychological weight. For peasants who lived on bitter crusts, the chance to eat soft white bread at a feast was a glimpse of another world. It reminded them that life could hold sweetness, however fleeting. The taste lingered in memory long after the feast ended, fueling stories retold by hearth fire for months. In this way, festive bread was not only nourishment for the body, but for the imagination, a symbol of joy that could be recalled during leaner days. Yet abundance also carried its dangers. Too much bread, too freely given, could encourage waste or arrogance. Preachers warned against feasting on bread without gratitude, reminding congregations that famine was never far. In some sermons, bread wasted at banquets was compared to souls wasted in sin, both squandered gifts that God might reclaim in punishment. Even in celebration, bread was never free of moral weight. Its abundance was both blessing and test. But perhaps the greatest irony of feast loaves was how quickly they vanished. Hours of labor produced enormous breads that disappeared in minutes, torn apart by hungry hands. Their destruction was the point. Feasts were not about preservation, but about proving that the community could afford to consume without fear. Every crumb eaten was a defiance of scarcity, a declaration that, for this night at least, survival was secure. And yet, once the feast ended and the ovens cooled, daily hunger returned. The same villagers who cheered and danced with festival loaves in hand would wake the next morning to chew coarse rye once again. The contrast was sharp, even cruel. Abundance one day, austerity the next. Feasts offered joy, but also reminded everyone of how rare joy was. Bread carried both promise and warning, celebration and longing. And so, bread in feasts and celebrations was never just about indulgence. It was about renewal, community, and memory. Each loaf baked for joy was also baked against fear, a fragile shield against the knowledge that famine and death were always near. Bread, in its abundance, celebrated life, but in its impermanence, it whispered that the next loaf might not come, which is why, beyond celebrations, bread continued to shape imagination itself, entering songs, tales, and even dreams. For if feasts made bread a symbol of joy, stories made it a symbol of everything else, hope, despair, power, and mystery, baked into the collective memory of the medieval world. Bread was never confined to ovens and tables. It lived just as vividly in the imagination. Songs, stories, dreams, and visions wove bread into the cultural fabric of the medieval world, transforming a humble loaf into a symbol of hope, despair, and wonder. Where chronicles recorded battles and famines, folklore sang of enchanted loaves, miraculous crumbs, and dream bread that promised fortune or foretold doom. Bread was not only sustenance but metaphor, a language through which people explained the mysteries of life. In village songs, bread appeared as both comfort and complaint. Laborers sang of the black bread of toil to mock their endless grinding work, while lovers teased that a sweetheart's kiss was sweeter than manchet, comparing affection to the finest wheat loaf. Children invented rhymes about stolen crusts, turning hunger into playful chant. Bread was always present because it was always familiar. Every singer, from noble to beggar, knew its taste and could find in it an image for joy or sorrow. Tales expanded bread's role into the magical. Folklore from across Europe imagined loaves that multiplied endlessly, feeding whole villages through famine, or ovens that never cooled, producing bread without ceasing. In some stories, saints disguised as beggars were rewarded with bread, only to reveal themselves in glory and bless the giver's household forever. In others, greedy bakers who hoarded dough found their ovens cursed, spitting out loaves of stone instead of food. These stories were moral lessons wrapped in crusts, teaching generosity, humility, and fear of divine justice through the medium of bread. Dreams carried bread into the realm of prophecy. To dream of fresh, soft bread was taken as a sign of prosperity or reconciliation, while to dream of moldy or broken loaves meant illness, betrayal, or loss. Fortune tellers interpreted dreams of bread as reflections of the dreamer's soul. Was their loaf whole or cracked, abundant or scarce? Even in sleep, people measured life by bread, reading their fate in the shapes of imaginary crusts. Literature, too, made bread central. In sermons and poems, bread was the metaphor of choice for virtue, charity, or divine grace. Preachers spoke of Christ as the bread of life, but also of sin as a loaf of ash that crumbled in the mouth. Medieval poets drew on bread to describe everything from poverty's bitterness to the sweetness of love. Because bread was universal, its imagery was instantly understood. A stanza about dry crusts needed no explanation. It carried the weight of countless hungry nights. There was humor in bread's imaginative life as well. Jesters joked about bakers stretching dough with water until loaves were thinner than parchment, or mocked soldiers for gnawing on hardtack so stiff it could be used as a shield. Popular tales exaggerated bread's hardness, claiming it could break doors or kill rats if thrown. Such jokes allowed people to laugh at their own suffering, to find comic relief in the very food that often failed them. Humor kept despair at bay, turning the loaf into a punchline as well as a prayer. But bread in imagination was not only playful, it was also haunting. Ghost stories told of spirits demanding bread from the living, or of loaves that disappeared mysteriously from ovens, taken by souls trapped in purgatory. Some villagers left a piece of bread on the hearth at night, believing it would appease wandering dead or protect the household from misfortune. In these beliefs, bread became a bridge between worlds, linking the living and the departed in a nightly ritual of offering and fear. Even political imagination found expression in bread. Ballads sang of just rulers as givers of bread and tyrants as stealers of bread. To dream of abundant bread under a king was to hope for fairness. To imagine its absence was to predict rebellion. Bread was shorthand for justice itself, and storytellers used it to remind audiences that hunger was more powerful than crowns. What makes bread's place in literature and imagination so striking is its duality. It could appear as miracle or curse, symbol of abundance or emblem of despair. One tale praised bread as eternal gift, another mocked it as cruel betrayer. It could belong to saints or witches, to kings or beggars, to dreams of heaven or fears of hell. Bread was infinitely flexible as symbol because it was infinitely present as food. Everyone needed it, so everyone understood it. And yet, the stories, songs, and dreams always circled back to the same truth. Bread was life, but it was fragile. Its presence meant hope, its absence meant suffering, and its corruption meant betrayal. The imagination wrapped itself around this fragility, turning bread into the most eloquent metaphor of medieval existence. Still, as much as imagination could elevate bread into miracles or curses, it never forgot its grounding in reality. Tales and songs always hinted at the hunger that inspired them, at the real loaves that were too small, too bitter, or too rare. The imagination did not escape bread. It depended on it, just as bodies did. And perhaps that is why bread's role in imagination feels so powerful, because it was not only dreamed, it was lived. And from those dreams and tales, bread carried forward one last role, perhaps the most enduring of all. Beyond food, beyond famine, beyond metaphor, bread became identity itself. The word that named cultures, defined communities, and shaped how people understood who they were in the world. Bread was never only about hunger, it was about belonging. To eat a certain loaf, baked in a certain way, was to declare who you were, where you came from, and which community you called your own. In the medieval world, bread was identity baked into crust and crumb, a daily reminder that people were bound not only by language or law, but by the loaves that filled their tables. To break bread in one village was not quite the same as breaking it in another. Each loaf carried a cultural fingerprint, and those fingerprints defined boundaries of kinship, region, and faith. Regional differences in bread were striking. In Northern Europe, where rye thrived, dark, dense loaves became the staple of peasants, while in the Mediterranean, wheat dominated, giving rise to lighter, whiter breads. To chew a black crust was to be northern, to eat a pale manchet was to be southern. These differences were not just agricultural, they became cultural markers. Travelers were often mocked for their strange bread, and chroniclers noted the shock of nobles who moved from one region to another, finding their familiar loaves replaced with alien textures. Bread defined home so powerfully that to eat another region's loaf was to feel disoriented, even estranged. Communities also embedded meaning into the shapes and rituals of bread. Round loaves signified wholeness and eternity, while braided loaves marked weddings and celebrations. Some villages stamped their loaves with distinctive symbols before baking, turning them into edible emblems of identity. To carry such a loaf to market was to carry one's village pride, proof that your oven produced bread unlike any other. Loaves became cultural signatures, instantly recognizable to neighbors and strangers alike. Bread even distinguished faiths. Christians, Jews, and Muslims all treated bread as sacred, but in different ways, and these differences set communities apart. Jewish households baked challah for the Sabbath, braided and blessed before meals. Muslims prepared flatbreads to accompany feasts and prayers, linking daily bread to the rhythm of devotion. Christians sanctified the host in the Eucharist, turning bread into the body of Christ. Each tradition gave bread distinct ritual weight, shaping identity through practice as much as through flavor. To eat one bread was to belong to one faith, to refuse it was to stand outside. Language preserved these identities as well. Entire cultures described themselves through bread. In France, the phrase, "to earn one's bread," became shorthand for survival, while in England, breadwinner emerged as a marker of duty and responsibility. In Slavic regions, the word for hospitality was tied to bread and salt, the first gifts offered to guests. Even in insult and praise, bread carried identity. To call someone a good bread was to honor them, while to call them stale bread was to dismiss them as useless. Words themselves were leavened by loaves. There's a certain humor in how fiercely people clung to their bread identities. Chronicles tell of soldiers refusing foreign bread during campaigns, preferring hunger over the humiliation of eating the wrong loaf. Merchants traveling across Europe sometimes packed loaves from home, unwilling to abandon the taste of their own ovens. One tale even tells of a nobleman who blamed his illness not on bad water or poor air, but on being forced to eat rye bread instead of wheat. To him, bread was not only food, it was self, but identity through bread was not only about pride, it was also about exclusion. To deny someone bread was to deny them belonging. Foreigners who brought unfamiliar loaves were sometimes treated with suspicion, their bread seen as impure or even dangerous. Sharing bread meant trust, but refusing to share meant rejection. The stranger who could not eat your bread was a stranger still, no matter what words they spoke. In this way, bread drew invisible lines around communities, keeping insiders fed and outsiders at arm's length. Festivals highlighted this power even more strongly. Villages baked special loaves only for their own, passing them out at communal feasts, but never selling them to outsiders. These loaves were edible passports, proving who belonged at the table. To eat the bread of your people was to affirm your place among them. To be denied it was exile, sharper than hunger itself. And yet, bread could also bridge differences, turning strangers into kin. Travelers who shared loaves with hosts often found themselves welcomed more warmly, the act of eating together, erasing suspicion. Marriages between villages or regions were celebrated by baking hybrid loaves that combined ingredients or shapes from both traditions, symbolizing unity through bread. In this sense, bread was both barrier and bridge, capable of dividing and uniting with equal power. The irony, of course, is that bread, for all its local differences, was universal. Everyone needed it, everyone baked it, everyone built their lives around it. Yet within that universality lay the sharpest distinctions, proof that identity is often forged from the most common things. Bread was both the great unifier and the great divider, shaping how people saw themselves and others. And this is perhaps why bread still carries such symbolic weight today. To speak of breaking bread together still means friendship. To speak of our daily bread still means survival. The medieval world carved identity into loaves, and those meanings have never fully left us. Bread reminds us of who we are, who we were, and who we hope to be. But beyond identity, bread's legacy carried forward into revolutions, reformations, and modernity itself. For when bread failed, when it grew scarce, overpriced, or corrupted, it was never just a food crisis. It was an identity crisis, a political crisis, and a spark for change that reshaped entire nations.